What if Alara's flames challenge the vampire kings? Alara, a fearless fire-wielding human, disrupts a tense standoff between the Cullens and the Volturi while trying to lure a newborn vampire army for a fight. Unfazed by the danger, her irreverent attitude and sarcastic quips turn a deadly encounter into an amusing clash of power and chaos. Moving to the video. The snowy field was thick with tension, each side bristling with readiness. The Volturi, led by Aro, faced the Cullen family with icy resolve. The muted sound of the snow under their feet was the only thing that disturbed the silence until, suddenly, a haunting melody began to echo across the field. A young woman emerged from the tree line to the left of the Volturi coven, her long dark brunette hair flowing in the breeze. Her confident steps were at odds with the tension in the air, as if she were on a casual stroll. Alara, completely oblivious to the dangerous situation she was walking into, sang with an ethereal quality that seemed to fill the clearing, as if speakers had been set up for a concert. Her voice rose above the soft crunch of snow, a sound both captivating and eerie, too powerful for any average human. The tension in the air hung heavily, yet Alara seemed unaffected by the weight of it all. Her song continued to flow effortlessly, sending shivers down the spines of both covens, her presence commanding in its strange, otherworldly way. Both sides stood transfixed, unsure whether to view her as a threat or something entirely beyond their understanding. As the two covens watched in surprise, Alara nonchalantly wandered across the field, completely oblivious to the tension between them. The fire simmering beneath her skin kept her warm against the chill, her casual demeanor at odds with the gravity of the situation. Without realizing it, she drifted closer to the Volturi side, her steps lazy and unhurried, as if she were on a leisurely stroll instead of standing in the middle of a looming confrontation. "I gotta limber up," she muttered, stopping just shy of the Volturi ranks. Alara began making exaggerated stretches, as if preparing for a morning jog rather than a potential fight. She twisted her torso dramatically, reaching for her toes and humming to herself, utterly unconcerned with the powerful vampires mere steps away. The Cullens exchanged confused, worried glances. Edward's brow furrowed as he glanced at Bella, while Alice tilted her head in disbelief at the scene unfolding. Even Emmett, who was rarely unsettled, looked unsure of how to respond to this bizarre display. To them, it seemed like a human had unknowingly wandered into the lion's den, sealing her fate with each carefree move. "This isn't good," Edward muttered, his voice low as his eyes darted between Alara and the Volturi. "She has no idea what she's just walked into." Bella's gaze stayed fixed on Alara, concerned and unsure of how the Volturi would react. "She's going to get herself killed," she whispered, tension tightening her voice. "What do we do, Edward?" Bella whispered, her voice tied with worry, her eyes flicking between her husband and Alara, who continued her stretches without a care in the world. Edward shook his head, his jaw clenched. "There's nothing we can do for her," he said, his voice filled with frustration and helplessness. "She's already in the Volturi's grasp, whether she knows it or not." Bella's heart sank at his words, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Desperate, she turned her pleading eyes towards Carlyle, the calm, steady matriarch of their family. "Carlyle, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There must be something." Carlyle's expression was grave, his golden eyes fixed on Alara. He shook his head slowly, a mixture of sorrow and caution in his gaze. "We can't interfere," he said softly, his voice filled with the heavy weight of experience. "Not without risking a confrontation ourselves. She's on her own." Bella swallowed hard, her UN beating heart metaphorically pounding as she watched Alara, utterly unaware of the danger that circled around her. The Volturi, usually calm and unreadable, looked equally perplexed as they eyed this intruder. Alara's voice trailed off into a hum as she touched her toes, bending low with a casualness that didn't suit the gravity of the scene. Her movements were dramatic and entirely focused on herself, her obliviousness to the two vampire covens was almost theatrical. Bella looked to Alice, hoping for some reassurance, but instead, Alice only smirked, her eyes twinkling with amusement as she watched Alara's carefree antics. Bella's brow furrowed in confusion. "Alice," Bella whispered, her voice edged with concern, "what is it? Why are you smiling?" Alice's smirk widened as she met Bella's gaze, her tone light but cryptic. "Oh, don't worry about her, Bella. She's not as helpless as she looks." Bella blinked in surprise, still not understanding. "What do you mean?" Alice glanced back towards Alara, who was now humming a tune, completely unconcerned with the brewing storm around her. "Let's just say," Alice continued with a knowing glint in her eyes, "I've seen enough to know she's different." Edward, overhearing the exchange, shot Alice a questioning look. "Different how?" Alice's smirk didn't fade as she kept her eyes on Alara. "You'll see." Emmett let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Different, huh? Well, she's got guts, I'll give her that," he muttered, clearly entertained by the chaotic spectacle Alara was creating. "But she's also delusional if she thinks she's gonna walk away from this." He leaned over towards Rosalie, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "What do you think?" $50 says she doesn't last 10 minutes. Rosalie rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed by Alara's antics. I'm not betting on a suicide mission, Emmett, she replied coldly, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her gaze flicked towards Alara, who was still stretching, and she sighed. She's either brave or stupid, maybe both. Whatever it is, it won't matter if the Volturi decide she's crossed the line. Standing nearby, Esme couldn't help the worry that shadowed her face. Poor girl, she whispered, her hands nervously wringing together. She doesn't even realize how much danger she's in. This doesn't feel right. Ahmed's grin faded slightly, glancing towards Esme. Yeah, I get it, Esme. But you heard Alice, she's different. Esme's gaze shifted to Alice, who still stood with that playful, knowing smirk. It did little to soothe Esme's concern. I just hope whatever it is, it's enough to protect her, she said softly, glancing back at Alara. On the Volturi side, Felix furrowed his brow, clearly puzzled by the strange scene unfolding before him. His large frame tensed, ready for combat, but something about Alara's carefree demeanor threw him off balance. Her behavior was surreal, almost taunting, but she didn't seem to take anything seriously. It kept Felix rooted in place, his fists clenched, but his instinct to charge restrained by sheer confusion. Demetri eyed Alara more carefully, his calculating gaze moving over her as if trying to decide whether she was a genuine threat or merely a distraction. He leaned slightly towards Aro, seeking a signal, but Aro's subtle gesture held him back. The tension in Demetri's jaw tightened, but he obeyed, his sharp eyes continuing to study Alara, awaiting any hint of true danger. The petite but deadly Volturi guard, Jane, narrowed her crimson eyes at Alara, her lips pressed into a thin line of irritation. The lack of seriousness from this intruder gnawed at her. Jane's power relied on control, and Alara's behavior seemed to challenge it effortlessly. Her fingers twitched at her sides, eager to bring pain, but Aro's amused restraint only heightened her frustration. Standing just behind Jane was Alec, looking equally perplexed, though his reaction was more measured. He observed his sister's growing irritation but kept his focus on the intruder. Even he could sense that this woman wasn't as simple as she appeared, but what Alara was hiding remained an enigma. And then there was Caius. His icy stare fixed on Alara with burning frustration, his patience nearly gone. His hands flexed, his knuckles white with the effort of holding back his rage. This is a distraction, he hissed, his voice thick with venom, his eyes darting suspiciously between Alara and the Cullens. His mind raced with accusations, suspicion blooming into certainty. A ploy, no doubt, orchestrated by them to delay us, he spat, his gaze snapping towards Edward and then back to Alara. His words were filled with accusation, and he glanced towards Aro for confirmation, his distrust of the Cullens poisoning his every thought. She's here to divert our attention. He snarled, barely able to control his disdain. He watched Alara with growing fury, fully convinced that the Cullens had sent her to undermine them. Do not let her foolishness deceive you, Caius continued, his voice dripping with disgust as he glared at Alara, seething. This is nothing more than a cheap trick. Felix let out a low, rumbling chuckle, breaking the tense silence. I didn't think the Cullens had it in them, he muttered, his voice dark with amusement. His eyes glinted with something almost like admiration as he glanced at Edward. To use a human like this? Send her to her death for a mere distraction. That's cold. Even for you. His words dripped with sarcasm, but the undertone of disbelief was unmistakable. Felix clearly found the idea both unsettling and oddly impressive. The Cullens, known for their rigid moral code, using a human as a pawn in their game. It was unthinkable. Edward's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. We didn't send her, he growled, his voice sharp. She's not ours. But Aro's response was very different. His smile grew as his interest in Alara only deepened. Patience, Caius, he murmured, eyes gleaming with intrigue. Let's see how this plays out. I find her fascinating. Aro's calmness infuriated Caius further, but there was no arguing with the leader's judgment. Marcus, standing silently beside Aro, had been watching everything with a quiet, thoughtful intensity. Unlike his brothers, his focus wasn't on Alara's eccentric behavior. Instead, his dark eyes followed her movements with a distant sort of understanding, as though he could see something deeper within her, something the others could not. As his gaze lingered on her longer than anyone else, a flicker of interest crossed his normally impassive face, subtle but unmistakable. Without intending to, Marcus slipped into his bond sight, the ability he rarely used of his own accord anymore. The familiar web of emotional ties appeared around him, connecting everyone in the clearing with intricate, glowing strands. Bonds of love, loyalty, hatred, and fear weaved together into a tapestry only he could see. And then he saw something shocking. Before Marcus could analyze the bond in further detail, his thoughts were interrupted by Aro. Something about her has caught your attention, brother? Aro's voice was barely above a whisper, but his curiosity was palpable. He had noticed the flicker of interest in Marcus, something so rare it demanded his immediate attention. Marcus hesitated, his eyes still lingering on Alara, the web of bonds he had just glimpsed in his mind still fresh, confusing. He wasn't quite sure how to respond, how to explain the unexpected connection he'd seen, especially when he himself wasn't fully certain of its meaning. His expression remained unreadable, carefully controlled. I'm not sure, Marcus finally replied, his voice low and distant, deliberately vague. He glanced briefly at Aro, then turned his gaze back to Alara, as if avoiding further questioning. Aro raised an eyebrow at Marcus's uncharacteristic dodge, though he didn't press further yet. He could sense that whatever Marcus had seen or felt, it had been enough to stir something within him, and that alone intrigued Aro more than anything else. Aro mused softly, still watching Marcus closely. I see. Though Marcus hadn't given a full answer, the fact that something had shifted was enough for now. Aro's curiosity deepened, but he allowed Marcus his silence for the moment. Aro shifted his attention back to Alara, and always one to appreciate an enigma, stepped forward from the Volturi ranks, his black cloak flowing like a shadow behind him. His voice was a smooth blend of curiosity and intrigue as he spoke. Perhaps you are lost, my dear. Alara, still in mid-stretch, straightened up, blinking as if she had just noticed the large gathering around her. She gave Aro a quizzical look, her eyes flicking from him to those behind him and back to him again. Oh sorry, she said, her tone genuinely apologetic but her face betraying no real concern. Didn't see you there. The air around her seemed to shimmer slightly, warmth radiating from her as if the snow refused to touch her. Lost? Nah, I'm right where I need to be. Aro raised an eyebrow, amused by her nonchalance. And why, may I ask, are you here? Alara cracked her neck and resumed her odd stretches, shrugging lightly. Preparing for a fight. They should be here any minute now. A flicker of confusion crossed Caius's face, his eyes narrowing. You are not with the Cullens? He spat the name with disdain. Alara cocked her head, staring at Caius with an arched brow. The who now? Edward let out a quiet sigh from the other side of the field, while Alice smirked. The Cullens knew better than to interrupt, intrigued by this odd twist in their standoff. Alara finally stopped stretching, her hands resting on her hips as she glanced around the field, seeming to only now realize she was standing between two groups in some kind of standoff. Wait, what's going on here? She gestured vaguely between the two groups. Why are you here? Before anyone could answer, she took a closer, squinted look at Aro and she gasped theatrically, her eyes widening in exaggerated realization as she pointed at him. Oh, you have red eyes. You must be vampires. She exclaimed with a grin, as if she'd just solved a great mystery. Nailed it. Aro's eyebrows arched in amusement and he stepped forward with his usual grace. You know vampires? Yeah. Why do you think I'm here? Alara rolled her eyes and checked her watch, though there was no real reason to, and then glanced back at Aro. Well, since I've got a little time to kill, we might as well get to know each other. The Cullens exchanged glances, struggling to suppress their growing smirks, while the Volturi remained still, their eyes locked on this strange woman who wandered so carelessly into the heart of a high-stakes confrontation. But just as she seemed ready to continue her banter with Aro, Alara suddenly froze, her eyes landing on something across the field. Her gaze settled on the massive wolves standing with the Cullens, and her expression instantly shifted from casual confidence to pure delight. Her voice shot up an octave. Oh my god, giant puppies. She squealed, completely sidetracked. Look at the big puppers. She clapped her hands together, her eyes practically sparkling as she took in the sight of the wolf pack, their massive forms towering over the vampires. They're so cute. Both covens stared in disbelief, unsure of how to respond to Alara's outburst, while the wolves, who were anything but puppies, shifted uncomfortably under her delighted gaze. Even Aro, who had maintained his composed, calculated demeanor throughout the entire encounter, faltered, blinking in surprise at her sudden, childlike enthusiasm. And then, to everyone's astonishment, a low rumble came from the wolves. Not a growl, but a sound resembling a deep wolfish chuckle. The pack, amused by the absurdity of the situation, seemed to collectively let out a huffing laughter, their large bodies shaking slightly. Alara's eyes lit up even more. Oh my god, they laugh. She squealed, practically bouncing on the balls of her feet. This is the best day ever. She looked over at Aro, completely oblivious to the gravity of the standoff. See? Even they think I'm funny. Aro, now thoroughly entertained by the unexpected turn of events, allowed himself a bemused smile, while Caius looked even more exasperated, his skull deepening. Alara, however, was completely oblivious to the tension she'd just shattered. Can I pet one? She asked, her eyes never leaving the wolves, her voice still high-pitched with excitement. I'm afraid that's why we're here, my dear, he said smoothly, gesturing toward the wolves. They are not mere pets, they are werewolves and quite dangerous. Alara barely missed a beat, her eyes still fixed on the massive wolves. Yeah, well, she replied with a shrug, her voice nonchalant. If I die petting something cute, I figure that's a pretty good way to go. She gave the wolves one last admiring look before snapping her attention back to Aro with a grin. But let's try not to make that happen today. Aro's smile grew wider, clearly amused by her nonchalance. Your priorities are certainly unique. Alara squinted at him, tilting her head slightly as if studying his face for the first time. With all this back and forth, I just realized I don't even know your name. What do they call you? She asked, her tone still casual, as though they were meeting at a casual event rather than standing in the middle of a vampire standoff. Aro smiled indulgently. I am Aro. Mom, Alara said, tapping her chin thoughtfully. Aro, where do I know that name? She tilted her head as if rummaging through her memory. I'm sure I've heard it somewhere before. Aro's smile grew wider. You've heard of me? Oh. Alara snapped her fingers, grinning. I remember. You were the Volturi. So you have heard of us, Aro replied, clearly pleased. And may I in turn ask your name? Alara, she replied, meeting his gaze with a steady look, her voice full of quiet confidence. Alara glanced at the coven behind him, her expression suddenly lighting up in a way that made everyone pause. I love your little vampire outfits, she said, gesturing broadly to the Volturi's elegant, dark cloaks. Very fancy. She turned her attention back to Aro, eyes scanning his form. And you, she continued with a mischievous smirk, very My Chemical Romance meets Volturi collab. Love what you've got going on here. The Cullens looked like they were doing their best to hold back laughter, while the Volturi were caught between confusion and mild offense. Caius, in particular, looked like he was moments away from snapping, his red eyes narrowing as he glared at her. Aro, however, let out a rich, genuine laugh, clearly entertained by her comment. My Chemical Romance, you say? He mused, amused by the comparison. I must confess that is not a collaboration I have ever considered, but perhaps not an entirely inaccurate observation. Alara gave him a cheeky grin. Oh, totally. You've got that whole Yule comb to the Black Parati vibe, but with more murder-y undertones. She mimed a swooping gesture with her hand, as if to demonstrate the dramatic flair of their cloaks. All you need is some emo eyeliner and you'd be set. Caius, who had been silent through most of this exchange, clenched his jaw. We do not dress like this for your amusement, girl, he hissed, clearly irritated by her nonchalance. Alara turned to Caius, unfazed by his harsh tone. Hey, relax, Count Blondie, she said with a shrug. I'm just appreciating the effort. Not every day you see vampires with such a solid fashion sense. Aro chuckled once again, delighted by the entire exchange. Marcus, watching from the side, actually looked somewhat intrigued by Alara's boldness, though his expression remained unreadable. Very few speak to us with such candor, Aro remarked, his eyes never leaving her. You are quite unlike anyone we have encountered. Alara grinned again, tossing a mock salute in his direction. Yeah, I get that a lot. Her grin faded slightly as she glanced around, her tone becoming more casual, almost thoughtful. Yeah, thing is, turns out a lot of vampires out there don't really like you guys. She gave a small shrug, her voice quieter but still unfazed. Just thought I'd mention it. Aro's smile never faltered, although he now looked more curious than offended. Is that so? Yup, Alara replied nonchalantly, stretching her arms over her head again. But hey, I don't really care. I don't know you. You do you, boo. She gave a dismissive shrug, completely unbothered by the weight of her words. She gestured lazily towards the Cullens. You handle whatever that is, she said, waving a hand vaguely in their direction, and I'll just take care of my side of things when they show up. Everybody wins. Aro's intrigue deepened, his eyes narrowing slightly. Who exactly are you here to fight? Alara blinked at him, as if the answer should have been obvious. The newborn army? She raised her eyebrows, waiting for him to catch up. The one I've been dodging for weeks. Surely you know about them? She squinted at Aro and the rest of the Volturi, her brow furrowed in mild confusion. Aren't you like the vampire police or something? Shouldn't you already be on top of this? A murmur ran through the Volturi ranks, whispers of confusion rippling through their otherwise stoic formation. Even the typically unshakable Caius glanced briefly at Aro, his sharp eyes narrowing in disbelief. This situation was far more bizarre than he had anticipated, and the presence of this strange woman threw everything into question. On the other side of the field, the Cullens exchanged equally bewildered glances, whispering quietly among themselves. Edward's brow furrowed as he leaned slightly towards Bella, his voice low. So that's where the newborns went? He muttered, barely hiding his surprise. After her. Bella's eyes widened in realization, her gaze shifting to Alara. She's been fighting them off this whole time. She whispered back. A low, disbelieving chuckle escaped Emmett. No way. That's wild. How is she even standing right now? He looked over at Alara with newfound respect, though a part of him was still incredulous. With her arms crossed, Rosalie raised an eyebrow. She's either incredibly lucky or completely reckless. Probably both, she said, her voice laced with skepticism. Alice, watching Alara with a quiet intensity, gave a slow nod. She's more than we thought. I didn't see this coming, but it all makes sense now, she mused, the pieces falling into place in her mind. Though he remained composed, the faintest glimmer of amusement played at the edges of Aro's lips. The newborn army? He echoed softly, his tone measured. It seems we have not been fully informed of this situation. Caius, less composed, took a step forward, his voice laced with irritation. We came here based on rumors of the Cullen Coven's liaisons with werewolves, he spat, his icy gaze shifting briefly to the Cullens before returning to Alara. His frustration was palpable, his tone dripping with disdain. No mention of a newborn army reached us. Completely unfazed by his clear displeasure, Alara raised an eyebrow. Huh. Well, that's awkward, she said with a smirk. Looks like someone's slacking on the intel. Caius's scowl deepened, his temper clearly flaring as he shot her a withering look. We are not in the habit of missing crucial information. Sure seems like it this time. Alara shrugged, her expression almost playful. She glanced at Aro, her tone light but with a teasing edge. Maybe you guys need to hire better spies. Aro let out a soft chuckle, clearly amused by Alara's irreverence, though his eyes gleamed with curiosity. It appears, my dear, that you have stumbled upon something most intriguing. Newborn armies rarely form without intent. Who exactly is behind this? His voice was gentle, but there was an undercurrent of serious interest. Alara blinked at Aro, then shifted her gaze to the rest of the Volturi, her expression filled with genuine surprise. Seriously? You guys didn't know? She waved a hand dismissively, as though this was a minor oversight. I mean, newborn armies are kinda your thing, right? Cleanup duty? Doesn't seem like something you'd miss. She let out a frustrated sigh. I don't know who's behind it. All I know is they're big, angry, all teeth and no brains. I've been running them around for a few weeks and honestly, it was fun at first, but now I'm getting a little tired of it. Alara cracked her neck and rolled her shoulders, her tone completely casual and unconcerned, as if she were talking about nothing more than a mild inconvenience rather than a deadly army. Aro glanced towards the Cullens, then back at Alara, clearly entertained by her audacity. And you believe they will show up here in this very spot? Alara checked her watch again, pointlessly, and shrugged. Yeah, that's why I was singing, she replied casually, as if it should have been obvious. They hear it and come running. They're not far away. A ripple of surprise passed through both the Volturi and the Cullens. Aro's smile deepened, a mix of curiosity and amusement. How fascinating. She gave him a nonchalant grin, entirely oblivious to the tension she was stirring between the Covens. Yep. Any minute now. But hey, while I'm waiting, this little chat's been fun. She stretched again, completely at ease, as if she wasn't standing in the middle of a standoff between two vampire Covens. And do you always use such unconventional methods to summon your foes? He asked, amusement flickering in his eyes. She shrugged again, unconcerned. Pretty much. I mean, what's the fun if they don't know where to find me? Gotta make it interesting, right? She waved her hand dismissively as if this was common knowledge. Plus, it saves me time. They come running, I deal with them, everybody's happy. Caius, who had been silently seething at her casual disregard for the gravity of the situation, finally spoke up, his tone sharp. Do you even realize where you are, girl? You walk into a confrontation between two Covens and prattle on about newborns as if they are some trivial matter. Alara gave Caius a sidelong glance, completely unimpressed by his sternness. Oh, I realize where I am, Blondie, she shot back, her tone dripping with sarcasm. You've got your big, bad vampire showdown, and I've got a bunch of newborns on my tail. Trust me, I know how serious it is. But here's the thing, just because you're all worked up doesn't mean I have to be. She smirked, folding her arms across her chest. Besides, what's life without a little fun, right? She paused, her smirk growing wider. But hey, I get it. You're used to being the scariest thing in the room. Must be tough when someone else shows up who doesn't bow and scrape. Caius's eyes flared with anger, his cold expression hardening even more. His lip curled as he regarded Alara with utter contempt. You will learn respect, girl, he spat, his voice low and venomous. Alara's smirk didn't falter, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Respect? She echoed, her voice filled with mock surprise. I'm not part of your world, your rules, or whatever little laws you think matter here. She shrugged casually, completely unbothered. You're just another person to me in a sea of people, maybe a little more bitey than usual, sure, but still, just people. She tilted her head, grinning. You're mad because I don't follow your script. I'm not scared of you, and I'm definitely not going to bow down just because you say so. Caius's lip curled in disdain, his voice sharp and cutting as he shot back, "You insolent child. You mock things far beyond your understanding. Your arrogance will be your undoing." Without waiting for a response, Caius stormed forward, his fury barely contained as he closed the distance between them. His icy gaze burned with rage, the air thickening with tension. But Alara stood her ground, completely unbothered by his advance. A mocking grin spread across her face as she shot back, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Arrogance? Or maybe it's just that I don't take orders from a guy who looks like he woke up on the wrong side of the 18th century." Her eyes flickered with mischief, utterly unafraid of Caius's anger. Before Caius could lay a hand on her, Aro stepped between them, hands raised, signaling for him to pause. His smile remained, though there was a sharper edge to his amusement now. "Caius, temper your ire," Aro said smoothly, his tone light but firm. "Our guest may have a unique outlook on danger, but let us not rush to judgment." Felix had instinctively followed Caius as he advanced towards Alara, his towering frame shadowing the smaller, enraged figure. But as Caius bit back his fury and reluctantly stepped back, Felix's amusement only grew, the tension too entertaining for him to ignore. A low, rumbling laugh escaped his chest, unable to be suppressed. "I like her," Felix muttered under his breath, a grin playing on his lips as he watched the scene unfold. Demetri, standing nearby, shot Felix a disapproving sideways glance but said nothing, his expression more restrained. Caius, however, was far less composed. His head snapped toward Felix, eyes blazing with fury. "Silence!" he snarled, his voice sharp and venomous. "This is no time for your childish amusement." Felix straightened but didn't lose the grin, though he held his tongue. He could sense Caius's simmering anger, but that only added to his enjoyment of the situation. Still, he respected the boundaries for now, knowing when to fall back. Jane's crimson eyes burned with icy fury as she took slow, deliberate steps toward Alara, her lips curling into a cold smile. "You speak as though you were untouchable," she said, her voice soft but laced with venom. "I wonder how long your fun would last under true pain." Her steps, however, were not as bold as they could have been. Alex still held her hand, his grip firm, subtly trying to temper her anger. He knew all too well the consequences of Jane's wrath when left unchecked, and now was not the time to unleash it. Alara's grin only grew as she watched Jane's simmering frustration, clearly enjoying the tension. She took a step closer, her voice low but dripping with playful confidence. "Whatever you do to me, sweetheart," she said, her tone daring, "just know I can do it back 10 times worse." Jane's eyes flared with barely contained rage, her fingers twitching in Alex's grip, but his hold remained firm, preventing her from acting on her impulse. "So go ahead, Jane. Try me. Let's see who walks away from this." The challenge was clear, her fearlessness undeniable, and it only pushed Jane further to the edge, her desire for retaliation burning in her blood. But Alex's restraint kept the situation from escalating for now. As Alara spoke, her pupils began to dance with literal flames, flickering like embers behind her irises. The fire reflected her boldness, a testament to her power, and the air around her seemed to hum with heat. The Volturi's collective response was instant, a ripple of shock passing through them. Even Jane visibly faltered, her eyes narrowing in disbelief, before quickly composing herself. Felix and Demetri stiffened, exchanging wary glances, while Caius's sneer faded momentarily, replaced by a flash of stunned surprise. Aro tilted his head slightly, his gaze locked on Alara's burning eyes. His amusement deepened, but now there was a clear hint of fascination. "How extraordinary," he murmured, barely concealing his awe. Alara's grin widened, the flames in her pupils flaring brilliantly for a brief moment before dimming again. "But hey," she added casually, her tone light and teasing. "I'm always up for a challenge." With that, Alara held her hands out wide, palms facing Jane in a gesture of mock invitation. "Go ahead," she taunted, her voice playful but edged with daring. "Take your best shot." The entire clearing seemed to hold its breath, the tension thickening as Alara's audacity pushed the limits of Jane's patience. Jane's eyes darkened, her fists clenched at her sides, but Alex's firm hold on her wrist prevented her from moving any closer. Alara stood there, fearless, daring Jane to act, the fire in her eyes dancing with mischief and something far more dangerous beneath the surface. Jane's jaw clenched, but she remained still, waiting for Aro's command. Aro, however, merely chuckled, his laughter breaking the tension that had begun to coil around the field. The rich sound echoed across the snow, as though he were truly enjoying himself. "Ah, you are indeed a rare find," Aro said, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. "I believe this meeting has become far more interesting than I anticipated." Alara folded her arms, cocking her head at him with a playful grin. "Well, I am to entertain." Marcus, who had been watching silently, finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "And yet it is not her bravery that surprises me," he murmured, his dark eyes lingering on Alara. "It is her indifference to us that is most curious." Alara shrugged, clearly unfazed by the scrutiny. Like I said, I've got my own problems to deal with. You guys just happened to be in the way. Caius's scowl deepened, but he remained silent, clearly irritated by Aro's amusement and Marcus's calm observations. He wasn't used to being so blatantly disregarded, and it was clear he didn't appreciate Alara's lack of fear. Aro's amusement deepened as he studied her, as though she were a puzzle he was eager to solve. Tell me, Alara, he said smoothly, his curiosity palpable. What compels you to walk into such danger with no fear? You face the Volturi and yet you seem completely at ease. Are you truly so confident? Alara shrugged casually. Confident? Sure, let's call it that. I just don't see the point in stressing over things. You guys are impressive, sure, but you're not the scariest thing I've ever come across. Aro's eyes sparkled with intrigue, but Caius's scowl deepened once again, his patience fraying. Your arrogance knows no bounds, he hissed, barely able to contain his frustration. You walk a dangerous line, girl. Alara shot him a sidelong glance, her smirk unfazed. Arrogance? Nah, she said with a casual shrug. I just don't do the whole kneel and grovel routine. It's exhausting, really. You guys are powerful, sure, but I'm not here to stroke your egos. If I'm still standing, maybe that should tell you something. Her eyes gleamed with defiance as she added, I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. She gave Caius a pointed look, her voice dripping with irreverence. So if you think I'm going to bow down, you've got the wrong girl. Felix's low chuckle rumbled through the air, though Jane remained icy, her fists clenched at her sides, clearly bristling at Alara's disrespect. Ara, on the other hand, appeared thoroughly amused, his smile widening with every word she said, his fascination with her growing stronger. Caius's mouth twisted into a snarl, preparing to unleash another venomous retort, but before he could speak, Marcus spoke, directing the conversation in a new direction, his voice quiet but with a steady gravity that drew all attention toward him. You fight them alone? Marcus's quiet, thoughtful gaze remained fixed on Alara, his question hanging in the air. His sudden involvement drew curious glances, especially from Aro, who raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Marcus's unusual interest. Normally, Marcus stayed in the background, detached from the conversations, but now his focus on Alara was undeniable. Alara turned her attention to Marcus, slightly taken aback by his sudden question. She blinked before responding, her tone still light. Yeah. I mean, who else is gonna do it? Clearly not you guys, seeing as you didn't even know about the army. Not like I'm asking for help or anything. She looked at him curiously, as if sizing him up for the first time. Why are you offering? Marcus regarded her with his usual detached demeanor, though there was something different in his gaze, something that suggested he saw more than what Alara was letting on. It is rare to find one who faces such odds without fear. Alara's smirk softened into a more genuine grin. Well, I'm not most people, she replied, her voice quieter for a moment before her cockiness returned. Besides, fear's not really my thing. Fire and bats? Now that's more my speed. Aro chuckled softly at this. You are a most intriguing individual. Fearless yet so casual about the dangers you face. A rare combination indeed. Alara gave him a mock bow. Why, thank you, good sir. Then she straightened up, her grin widening. Look, you've got your drama, I've got mine. Let's just stay out of each other's way and we'll all go home happy, yeah. Caius sneered but remained silent, clearly displeased with how lightly she was treating the entire situation. Marcus, however, continued to study her with an intensity that made even Aro glance at him curiously. Tell me, Marcus said slowly, his voice barely more than a whisper yet filled with quiet intensity. What compels you to fight alone? Marcus regarded her with the same steady gaze, his expression unreadable. He wasn't just asking about her physical fight with the newborns, he was asking something more personal, though she might not realize it. Alara shrugged again, though this time there was a flicker of something deeper in her expression, a hint of weariness beneath her usual bravado. It's just how it's always been, she said, her tone almost absent-minded. I can handle it. Besides, less people to worry about if I mess things up. She paused, clearly deflecting the weight of the conversation, and added with a sly grin, and it's not like I provoked them into targeting me, well, not initially. She waved a hand, as if brushing off the thought. Yet know how it is, you come across them, they want to eat you, you don't want to get eaten, blah blah. So you run, and of course, they see it as a challenge. She let out a small, mischievous laugh. Then I might have taunted them a bit, just to keep things interesting. Her grin widened as she gestured to the field. And now, here we are. Marcus watched her closely, something unreadable in his stoic gaze, while Aro's eyes gleamed with amusement at her flippant retelling of the events. Alara glanced down at her watch again. Welp, time's ticking. Newborns should be here any second now. You guys can hang around if you want, but just don't get in the way, yeah? She flashed a cheeky grin at Aro. Wouldn't want any of your fancy robes to catch fire. Aro chuckled, clearly entertained by her audacity. Caius, on the other hand, scowled even more, his distaste for the entire situation palpable. Marcus, however, gave the slightest of nods, as if acknowledging something only he could sense in her. Fire, you say? Aro repeated, his curiosity piqued even further, eyes gleaming as they rested on her. Any relation to those extraordinary eyes we saw earlier? Alara grinned, her eyes flickering with fire. Oh, you'll see soon enough. She clapped her hands together as if warming up for a sports event and winked. It's all part of the package, fire, a little showmanship, and maybe even some bats if you're lucky. She winked playfully. Gotta get my head in the game though. Stretch, sing, and make sure not to burn the wrong people. The Cullens stood rooted in place, utterly perplexed by the scene unfolding before them. Edward exchanged a glance with Bella, his expression somewhere between bewilderment and frustration. His sharp mind tried to unravel the enigma that was Alara, but even he seemed at a loss. Is she serious? Bella murmured under her breath, her eyes wide as she watched Alara, who appeared completely unfazed by the tension surrounding her. Emmett, usually the first to jump into any situation, chuckled softly, clearly entertained. Serious or not, this is definitely different, he said, grinning as he glanced at Rosalie, who remained stone-faced, arms crossed. Rosalie rolled her eyes, unimpressed but keeping a sharp gaze on the situation. She's reckless, no doubt about that, she muttered, her tone skeptical. But I've got to admit, she's got their attention, and for now, that's keeping the heat off of us. Her words carried a wary undertone, though she couldn't completely dismiss the usefulness of the distraction Alara was creating. Silent for a moment, Carlosol's brow furrowed as he observed the scene unfold. The confusion was evident in his expression. It's dangerous, he finally said, his tone cautious, to provoke the Volturi like this. She's playing a dangerous game. Across the field, Jane's lips thinned into a sharp line, her crimson eyes narrowing as Alara's playful display continued. She doesn't know who she's dealing with, came the hiss, her fists clenched in barely restrained irritation. Alec, sensing his sister's rising fury, gripped her hand tighter, his presence calm and steady. Not yet, he whispered, his voice low and soothing. Let's see where this goes. Jane's jaw tightened, but she didn't pull away from Alec's touch. The tension in her body remained, her crimson eyes still locked on Alara, but Alec's presence held her in check, if only for the moment. Meanwhile, Caius's patience snapped. His seething fury, unable to be directed at Alara just yet, turned sharply towards Aro. This mockery has gone on long enough, Aro, he snarled, his voice filled with contempt. You indulge her insolence like it's a game. We should be putting an end to this, not watching like it's some spectacle. Aro, still captivated by Alara's audacity, barely glanced at his brother, his smile unfazed. Oh, Caius, he replied softly, his tone laced with amusement, there is no harm in watching a bit longer. She is, after all, quite entertaining. Well, don't let me keep you, Alara said, completely dismissing the significance of the tense confrontation around her. She waved her hand casually between the two groups she was standing between, the Volturi on one side, the Cullens on the other, like they were just two parties at a gathering. I'm sure whatever vampire politics you've got going on is super important. With that, she turned and began making her way towards the center of the field, her steps deliberate, her presence commanding in its casualness. As she moved, an ethereal, orchestral, and choral-based song flowed from her lips, the sound so hauntingly beautiful that it sent shivers down the spines of both covens. The song was otherworldly, its haunting notes filling the air as if carried by the wind itself, yet there were no visible instruments, no source for the background music that swelled around her. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, enveloping the snow-covered clearing. It was impossible not to be captivated by it, each note resonated deep within, both beautiful and unsettling, a chilling melody that seemed to echo from the very earth. As Alara reached the center of the field, her haunting melody crescendoed, filling the clearing with a palpable energy. The two covens, once poised for battle, stood frozen, transfixed by the ethereal sound that seemed to seep into their very souls. The sky above darkened, as if responding to the weight of her voice. Shadows began to stretch ominously across the snow-covered ground, but it wasn't the clouds that blocked out the sun. No, it was something far more unsettling. The darkening sky churned as thousands of bats swarmed above, their wings beating in unison, turning day into night. The once clear sky became a seething Massachusetts of movement, the bats so thick they blotted out the light, casting the entire field in a suffocating darkness. Their screeches blended with the fading echoes of Alara's melody, creating a surreal and terrifying symphony that rippled across the landscape. Both covens stared upward in disbelief, the tension thickening as the sky boiled with life. The bats spiraled in a wild dance, responding to Alara's presence, drawn to her as though she commanded them with nothing more than her will. Her eyes gleamed as she looked upward, clearly enjoying the chaos she'd summoned. She continued to hum softly, completely at ease, as though she weren't standing in the midst of one of the most dangerous standoffs in vampire history. Chapter Summary. Amid a tense confrontation, Alara's eerie song and display of fiery power capture the Volturi's attention. Aro is intrigued, Caius is furious, and Marcus seems unusually drawn to her. With an offer on the table and tensions high, Alara faces a choice that could alter her fate and the Volturi's plans forever. The air had thickened with an unholy tension, drawn tight by Alara's haunting melody and the bats circling above like a storm come to life. She stood at the center of the field, eyes closed, a serene expression on her face as if she had found calm amidst the chaos. Her voice echoed in the cold, sending shivers down the spines of both covens. It was a song that should not have existed, each note curling into the air with an eerie, childlike innocence. Her voice softened, drifting into a lilting, almost playful tune, a twisted nursery rhyme carried on the icy breeze. When the darkness comes, and there's nowhere you can run, if the midnight strikes, and you lose your only son, when the darkness comes, la 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 la, will you come undone? The eerie melody of her voice floated through the air, each word laced with a haunting sweetness that chilled those who heard it. It danced like shadows creeping in the corners, echoing the dark undertones of the rhyme. The playful tune belied the unsettling message hidden within, as though the very sound could draw one closer to unraveling in the depths of night. A perfect balance of innocence and menace, her words seemed to weave an invisible web, wrapping around any listener with an almost hypnotic pull. It was a dangerous song, for anyone who heard it might not realize how close they were to the edge until they, too, came undone. Alara's eyes glinted with wicked anticipation under the darkened sky of bats she had summoned, nay, a ray of sunshine piercing their foreboding colony. The air was thick with the sound of thousands of leathery wings beating as one. She stood at the heart of the chaos, a twisted smile playing on her lips, her voice lilting once again, her song carrying on the wind towards the approaching army. When the day turns black, and there's no turning back, when the shadows rise, and the sky begins to crack, will you stand and fight, or fade into the night? La 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 la, will you meet your end, before the dawn's first light? Her lips curled into a soft smile, though her eyes remained closed. The field was no longer just a battleground, it was her domain, and her song was a warning, as much as it was a spell. Unseen by those around her, her mind slipped from the present, delving into the consciousness of the bats scattered throughout the forest and sky above. In a split second, Alara leaped from one bat's mind to the next, weaving through their collective consciousness in a rapid-fire blur. Each bat became her scout, feeding their senses directly into hers, creating a web of interconnected awareness that extended for miles. Through the bat's heightened senses, Alara saw the forest in fragments, each tree and shadow illuminated in sharper detail, as though the night itself breathed with life. The rhythm of wings filled her awareness, blending with the rustle of leaves as creatures darted through the underbrush, and the faintest whispers of the evening breeze brushed against the forest canopy. The bats moved like shadows in the twilight, their bodies flickering in and out of view as they navigated through branches, alert and loyal to her presence. Suddenly her focus sharpened, drawn to a disturbance on the forest floor, a barely audible crack of a branch breaking underfoot. She drifted her consciousness towards it, slipping into the mind of a bat perched on a low branch nearby. Through its small, keen eyes, she saw them. There, moving silently and with deadly purpose, were the vampires. They wove through the dense underbrush with calculated grace, swift and predatory, their eyes gleaming crimson against the twilight shadows. Alara counted them effortlessly, 19 in total. At the front was a tall, muscular vampire, strikingly handsome with blonde hair that gleamed even in the dim light. His steely expression and commanding stride immediately marked him as the leader, or so Alara assumed. His gaze was fixed on the clearing ahead with fierce intensity, his every movement exuding a sense of authority, as though he could already see her waiting for him in the distance. Alara's consciousness darted from one bat to another, each switch a precise jump that gave her a different angle on the approaching vampires. With every switch, she saw more, a flash of fangs, the way their movements remained silent, almost synchronized, like hunters on the verge of a kill. Some hung back, surveying the path while others scanned the trees, their alertness betraying an awareness of her power, or at least of the danger ahead. Are you sure she's even here? One of the newborns muttered under his breath, casting a glance ahead with visible impatience. I can smell her, she's close. The scent of her blood's on the breeze. Another one muttered, his nostrils flaring as he took a deep inhale. Let me go on ahead. I'll drag her back myself. The leader raised a hand sharply, silencing him with a harsh glare. Stay in line, he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper, yet laced with authority. We're not taking any chances. She's slipped away from us once already. Another vampire, smaller but with a nervous energy that made him twitch with every step, leaned forward eagerly. But she's just a human, right? She can't be that hard to. Quiet, the leader snapped, his eyes flashing with irritation. Underestimating her is what got us in this mess to begin with. Just follow orders and she won't escape this time. One of the younger vampires let out a low, frustrated growl, his hands clenching at his sides. But I can smell her so clearly, he muttered, inhaling deeply as though the scent alone was too tantalizing to resist. She's right there, we should just charge. The leader shot him a cold look, his tone dripping with barely contained anger.
If you want to go ahead, be my guest, he said, his voice low and dangerous.
But if you ruin this hunt by acting like a reckless fool, I'll make sure your end is far worse than hers. The young vampire immediately backed down, muttering curses under his breath but staying in line. Alara watched with interest, a small smile playing on her lips. Another vampire, a woman with wild, matted hair, shifted closer to the leader. She shot him an annoyed look, her voice tight with tension. Riley, what's so special about this one anyway? We're wasting time sneaking around like cowards when we could have had her already. Riley's gaze darkened, his jaw clenched tight as he glared back at her.
You didn't see what she did, he said, his voice barely above a growl, but dripping with restrained fury.
She took Victoria down without a second thought, burned her to ash in seconds.
If any of you want to end up like that, by all means, run ahead and make it easy for her.
His glare swept over the group, his expression a mix of rage and pain. But if you want to stay alive, you'll follow my lead. At the mention of Victoria, Alara's sly smile grew wider. Victoria?
She racked her memory for a moment but came up blank, probably one of the first ones she'd taken out, she figured, along with the few others who had dared to lunge at her when this whole mess started.
Clearly though, this one had mattered to him. Her smile turned almost sympathetic in mock understanding as she realized his fury had a personal edge, a vendetta. Ooh, so it's personal, isn't it, Riley? The group fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in, though a few of them exchanged uneasy glances. Alara could sense their impatience, the simmering desire for blood just beneath the surface. She could practically feel their thirst, their instincts driving them to tear into her.
They were so close now, close enough that she, too, could catch their scent on the breeze, tinged with the metallic tang of desperation.
A sly smile spread across her face. They wanted to be cautious, did they? Thought they could corner her like some hunted animal. Oh, how they'd underestimated her. Remember, he murmured, his voice carrying an edge of warning, the moment she so much as moves, we strike. Do not let her get away. The song grew clearer, the words laced with a sinister sweetness. When the shadows crawl and your hunger swells, will you hear the call of the hunt, of the kill? If you fight, you'll fall and lose it all, la 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 la, will you beg for light, before the night takes all?
The vampire's steps faltered, their senses sharpening as the melody wrapped around them, coaxing their instincts to the surface.
Riley's jaw clenched as he listened, his eyes narrowing with renewed fury. The song seemed to beckon him forward, her voice full of dark amusement that only heightened his rage. One of the newborns shifted uneasily, glancing around as if expecting to see her materialize from the shadows. She's close, he whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with anticipation. Alara's smile deepened, a thrill coursing through her as she continued to sing, her voice soft but carrying a dark, taunting lilt. She knew they could hear it now, drifting lazily through the trees. Oh, I'm right here, she whispered to herself, her words carried only by the bats around her. Come and get me if you can. Riley shot him a warning glare, his voice tense. Hold your ground. She's not getting away this time. But the song continued, floating closer, twisting through the night like a ghostly reminder of the power she held over them. Alara's voice softened, teasing, luring them in as her melody danced through the trees. Her voice faded to a soft hum, yet her mind stayed sharp, tracking the vampires as they crept closer. They thought they could catch her off guard, that she was oblivious to their approach. How wrong they were.
With each silent step they took, Alara moved from one bat's mind to the next, her awareness stretching, mapping out each flicker of movement through the forest.
They inched closer, confidence pulsing through their steps, but she could feel their wariness, the caution laced in every careful advance. They were eager to strike, yet hesitant, their arrogance clouding their instincts. To them, she was just some human meddling in matters far beyond her grasp, a mere obstacle to remove. Their fatal misjudgment only made her smile grow as she watched them stalk nearer. Just a little closer, she thought, the thrill of the hunt thrumming through her veins. As the vampires crept closer to the edge of the clearing, Riley's gaze locked onto her, standing calmly in the open field. His anger simmered hotter with each step, his gaze fixed on her still figure. Alara stood there, completely relaxed, a slight smile curling at her lips, her face unbothered, calm as if she hadn't a care in the world. At this moment any sense of strategy evaporated. Without a second thought, he burst from the edge of the forest and sprinted towards her, his focus razor-sharp on his prey.
So intent was Riley on Alara that he missed the tense standoff stretched across the clearing, two covens positioned wide on either side of her, their faces grim, bodies poised for battle. Their silent, wary gazes tracked his movement, but Riley saw none of it, his mind consumed by rage and his vision tunneled on the woman who had taken Victoria from him. With a feral snarl, Riley lunged forward, covering the distance between them in a single heartbeat. His hands clamped down on her arms, every muscle in his body taut with fury, ready to tear her to shreds or toss her across the clearing.
But the instant his grip closed around her, something went terribly, horribly wrong. A strange paralysis crept through his limbs, locking his muscles in place. He tried to move, to hurl her aside, but his body wouldn't respond. Panic flickered across his face, his once confident snarl faltering.
His fierce momentum, his violent rage, it all came to a screeching halt as if he'd been encased in stone.
Alara's eyes slid open slowly, and she met his terrified gaze with calm and blinking certainty. Her expression was devoid of fear, almost curious, and her lips twitched with the faintest trace of a smirk. For Riley, the horror began to sink in, each second stretching unbearably long as he realized he was at her mercy. A searing heat suddenly blossomed in his palms, a faint warmth that quickly turned blistering. His fingers, still gripping her arms, began to sting as though they were pressed against red-hot metal. The burn spread swiftly, radiating up his arms, blazing with an intensity that felt unnatural, alive. He tried to pull away, but his body remained frozen, unable to release her. The heat intensified, turning into a violent inferno that surged through his veins like molten lava. Riley's eyes widened, wild with agony, as the fire swept up his arms and across his shoulders.
The flames were inside him now, burning him from within, spreading through his body with relentless purpose.
Alara watched, her expression unchanged as he struggled against the invisible chains binding him. He could see the faint flicker of amusement in her gaze, a chilling acknowledgement of the power she held over him. The flames reached his core, searing through his chest, then twisted down his spine, igniting every fiber of his being. He could do nothing but endure the relentless agony as his body began to glow, his veins illuminating like rivers of fire beneath his marble skin. A strangled, tortured scream escaped his lips, the only sound he could manage as his body lit up from within, each cell erupting in uncontainable heat. He felt himself disintegrating, piece by agonizing piece, the fire consuming him from the inside out.
His vision blurred, the clearing spinning around him as he caught sight of his fellow newborns, who had just emerged from the tree line, their faces a mixture of confusion and horror. With his last ounce of strength, Riley managed to turn his head towards them, his voice nothing more than a hoarse, agonized rasp.
"Run, it's a trap?" He choked out, but before the final word left his lips, his entire body ignited, the flames consuming him fully. In a matter of seconds, Riley's form collapsed into ash, scattering in the slight breeze, leaving nothing but a faint glow on the grass beneath him. Alara straightened, brushing a small fleck of ash from her arm, her gaze now turning slowly towards the stunned vampires at the edge of the clearing. The smile on her lips returned, sharper and more dangerous, as she took a single, deliberate step towards them. The newborns, frozen in shock as Riley's molten body crumbled to ash at Alara's feet, hesitated for only a moment. Their instincts soon took over, the scent of fresh human blood filling their senses, driving them into a frenzy. Despite the burning horror that had befallen their leader, the hunger that roared inside them was far more powerful than any fear. They lunged forward, eyes glowing with thirst and desperation, their teeth bared, eager to rip Alara apart. But Alara didn't flinch. Instead, she cracked her neck from side to side, her body loosening up as though she were merely preparing for a morning workout. Her shoulders rolled back in a casual stretch, and with a slow, deliberate flourish, her hands ignited with vibrant flames. The fire crawled up her arms, casting her in a fierce, glowing light that reflected in the eyes of the oncoming newborns. "Let's get this over with," she muttered, her voice calm yet laced with dark amusement. The fire within her surged, and with a sudden burst of energy, she raised her arms to the sky. In an instant, the darkened heavens above ignited.
Balls of fire materialized in the sky, growing larger and brighter with each passing second until they resembled meteors, burning with an unholy intensity.
And then, with a roar of unleashed power, Alara unleashed her hellstorm. The sky erupted as the fiery meteors came crashing down, each one pummeling the earth with devastating force. The ground shook under the impact, craters forming where the fireballs struck, sending chunks of rock and snow flying in every direction. The newborns, their speed no match for the rain of fire, were caught in the devastating onslaught. Flames engulfed them, searing their flesh, leaving nothing but ash in their wake. They screamed and thrashed, their bodies set alight, but there was no escape. Alara's firestorm consumed everything it touched, reducing the once frenzied newborns to smoldering cinders. The newborns that had been swift enough to dodge the hellballs charged ahead, their hunger overriding any sense of self-preservation. As they neared Alara, she flicked her hand and several fireballs appeared around her, floating in a tight orbit like a protective shield. The flames glowed brighter as the first vampire reached her, his hands outstretched to attack.
But before he could make contact, one of the fireballs shot forward, blazing through the darkened sky as though it had a mind of its own.
It struck him square in the chest, and within a heartbeat his entire body ignited, the flames engulfing him from head to toe. With a shriek, he broke into a frenzied sprint, staggering across the field as his body burned like a living torch. The fiery blaze streaked through the darkness, leaving a brilliant trail of red-orange light in his wake, illuminating the field as he ran, unable to escape the inferno devouring him from within. his agonized screams echoing in the clearing as his flesh sizzled and cracked, burning to cinders with each step. Finally, with a shudder, he collapsed, his form disintegrating into ash, leaving only a faint glow on the ground and a wisp of smoke curling into the cold air. Alara's eyes sparkled with a mischievous glint as the next vampire lunged towards her. She felt like playing.
Just as he reached for her, her form dissolved into a swarm of midnight black bats, scattering into the sky and soaring through the smoke and chaos. The newborn skidded to a halt, eyes wide with confusion as he scanned the clearing, searching for her. The bats flew further away, settling in a nearby clearing, and with a gentle flutter they coalesced back into Alara's solid form. She smirked, catching the vampire's gaze as he locked onto her once more. He charged again, fury blazing in his eyes, but just as he reached her, she vanished into a swirl of wings, only to reappear on the opposite side of the battlefield. The newborn let out a frustrated growl, lunging after her, but again, Alara dissolved into a colony of bats, disappearing into the air. She reappeared yet again in another part of the clearing, letting the vampire chase her in futile circles, his rage building with every failed attempt. Aro watched this display from afar, his crimson eyes widening with wonder and fascination. In all his 3,000 years, he had seen countless feats of power, each ability more terrifying and awe-inspiring than the last, but nothing like this. His gaze followed her movements, transfixed, as if watching a masterful dance of chaos and control, her form vanishing and reappearing with a grace and fluidity that defied even his imagination. The vampire grew wilder, lunging with frenzied desperation, his bloodlust overriding any sense of caution as he reached for her once more. She played this game several times, the newborn chasing her futilely in circles, growing more enraged with every attempt. Finally, Alara decided it was time to show off. This time, Alara reappeared squarely beside Aro, standing next to him with a confidence that made his heart, a heart that had long forgotten wonder, race with excitement. Aro's gaze flickered over Alara, his expression one of absolute awe, his eyes gleaming with something far beyond mere approval. His voice, low and reverent, cut through the thick silence, almost a whisper. Fascinating, he murmured, his words barely containing his disbelief and sheer admiration. I have seen centuries pass, power rise and fall, but this Alara, I am beyond impressed. The depth of his gaze was unguarded, showing a rare glint of wonder that had not crossed his features in centuries. He looked at her not just as a Volturi leader observing potential but as someone genuinely captivated, his mind racing at the possibilities her unique power presented. The newborn vampire skidded to a halt, his wild eyes widening as he took in the scene around him. For the first time, he seemed to notice the figures gathered along the edge of the clearing, their gazes fixed on him, their postures tense. His bloodlust had blinded him until now, his sole focus on Alara, but in this moment of stillness, he became acutely aware of the others, as if he were only now realizing they were not alone. His gaze flicked from Alara to the strangers, confusion flashing across his face. He didn't recognize any of them, nor the silent power and authority they exuded. A slight frown creased his brow as he hesitated, torn between his frenzied hunger and the sudden, unsettling awareness that he was outnumbered. Then his eyes locked on Aro, the tall, imposing figure standing beside Alara, exuding a calm that was almost eerie. Aro's gaze remained steady, his expression inscrutable, watching the newborn with a mixture of detached curiosity and amusement. But his hesitation was short-lived. The hunger burning inside him overtook the momentary fear, and with a snarl, he lunged forward once more, seeing them as only another obstacle standing between him and his prey. The newborn's lips pulled back in a snarl as he made a blind, reckless move to shove past Aro and seize Alara. But before he could reach her, Aro's hand flicked out with a speed that defied the vampire's senses, catching him by the throat. The newborn stilled, his eyes widening in confusion and outrage as he struggled against Aro's iron grip, realizing too late that he had no control. Aro's gaze never wavered from Alara, his eyes alight with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. His voice was smooth, edged with a thrill he hadn't felt in centuries. Your games are exquisite, Alara, he murmured, as if the newborn writhing in his grasp were nothing more than a minor distraction. I could watch this artistry for an eternity. Ahem, Alara interrupted, her voice cool, one brow arched in mild amusement as she tilted her head. He's mine. Aro's fingers loosened ever so slightly, the corner of his mouth lifted in a subtle smile, and he inclined his head, releasing the newborn to her with an almost theatrical flourish, as if gifting her the grandest prize. Of course, he said, his tone carrying a faint note of deference that was rarely heard from the Volturi leader. Do enjoy, my dear. She raised her hand and flames coiled around the newborn's body, wrapping around him like fiery chains. The vampire screamed, his body lifted off the ground as the flames constricted tighter and tighter. With a dramatic flourish, Alara snapped her hand downward. The vampire's body slammed into the ground with a deafening crack, sending molten fractures racing across his marble skin. He lay there, groaning in pain, his body broken but not yet destroyed. Alara's gaze never left Aro's as she slowly extended both hands towards the vampire on the ground. Without breaking eye contact with the Volturi leader, a torrent of flames erupted from her palms, engulfing the vampire in a roaring inferno.
His screams were drowned out by the sound of the flames, and in seconds, he was reduced to nothing but ash. As the fire died down, Alara stood tall, her expression calm and composed, her eyes still locked with Aro's. A playful smirk tugged at her lips as she arched an eyebrow. "What, no round of applause?" she teased, her tone dripping with mock disappointment. Aro's eyes gleamed with amusement, and without missing a beat, he raised his hands and offered a series of delicate, enthusiastic claps, each one sharp in the quiet air. His smile was wide, clearly delighting in her boldness. "Marvelous," he murmured, his voice smooth with admiration. "Absolutely marvelous." Alara took off again, her body dissolving into a flurry of bats, soaring across the battlefield with eerie grace. This time she reappeared on the opposite side of the clearing, closer to the Cullens.
As her form solidified, her eyes locked onto another newborn charging towards her, desperate to feed. With a flick of her wrist, she ignited him in a flash of fire, his body consumed before he could even scream. And in the same breath she vanished once more, her silhouette evaporating into a swarm of bats, scattering into the darkened sky. She danced across the battlefield, reappearing only to deliver swift and precise devastation. Each time she landed, it was with dramatic flair, her hands slicing through the air, flames bursting from her fingertips with pinpoint control. She moved as though conducting an orchestra of destruction, the fire obeying her every command. Newborns lunged at her, only to be met with blazing, meteoric fireballs that followed her gestures like loyal soldiers. She spun, and a wave of flame rippled outward, incinerating two vampires that had attempted to flank her. Another dramatic sweep of her hand sent a blazing arc of fire across the ground, cutting off a group of newborns in mid-charge. Alara's power was raw and unrelenting, yet controlled with such precision that each fiery strike landed exactly where she intended. She moved across the battlefield like a deadly flame herself, hopping from one spot to another in a swirl of bats, her every appearance accompanied by explosions of fire and ash. Her laughter echoed hauntingly through the clearing, the caius bending to her will as she unleashed her fury upon the newborns. To the Cullens it was both terrifying and mesmerizing to watch, a powerful display of control and destruction. Alara was not just fighting, she was showing the battlefield who was truly in command, her flames dancing in perfect harmony with her movements. And all the while the snow melted beneath her feet, the fire bending to her every whim, leaving nothing but devastation in her wake. Some of the newborns, their instincts finally overtaking their blind hunger, realized the futility of their attack. Their eyes widened with fear, and several of them turned, attempting to flee into the forest. They sprinted towards the edge of the clearing, desperation in their every movement. But just as they neared the trees, an enormous wall of flame erupted around the battlefield, encircling the entire space in a towering inferno. The fire rose high into the sky, its heat unbearable, the roar of the flames deafening. The newborns skidded to a halt, their path to freedom blocked by a searing barrier of molten fire. The flames crackled and hissed, the heat warping the air around them, creating a shimmering, deadly curtain of flame that trapped every vampire inside. Alara stood at the center of the chaos, her hands raised as she controlled the fiery prison. Her gaze was cold, her voice carrying a deadly finality as she surveyed the newborns who now cowered at the edges of the field. "No one leaves alive," she whispered, her words echoing across the battlefield. The newborns, realizing there was no escape, let out panicked shrieks, but it was too late. The wall of flame had closed them in, and the only way out was through her, an impossibility. Alara's eyes burned as brightly as the flames around her. She stepped forward, her hand raised in a casual, almost mocking gesture. The fire rippled in response, and as she moved, the flames tightened their grip on the battlefield, sealing the newborn's fate. One by one, they tried to make a break for it, charging towards the flame barrier, hoping to break through, but every attempt ended in failure. The fire engulfed them instantly, reducing them to ashes before they could even scream. Alara watched with cold satisfaction as the last of the newborns fell, her flames consuming them until there was nothing left. The clearing, once a chaotic battleground, now lay eerily still. Only the crackling of the towering wall of fire remained, the flames dancing and hissing like a living entity, casting flickering shadows across the field. The faint sounds of bodies shattering under the oppressive heat echoed around her, their marble skin breaking apart as the fire continued to consume them. Some of the corpses still smoldered, the flames stubbornly clinging to their remains, crackling in the dead silence that had overtaken the battlefield. Ash drifted lazily through the air, carried on the last remnants of the newborn's final moments. Alara stood at the heart of it all, her eyes glowing with the residual power of her flames. Her breath steady, her face emotionless, she surveyed the scorched earth beneath her feet. Around her, bodies continued to crumble into ash, the heat warping the air and distorting the landscape into a scene of absolute destruction. The towering wall of flame remained, sealing the clearing as if marking her territory, a symbol of her dominance over life and death. The flames licked the sky, their deadly beauty the only movement in an otherwise silent world.
She stood at the center, completely unfazed by the inferno she had unleashed. With a slight wave of her hand, the towering inferno that had once encircled the battlefield was now reduced to faint, glowing coals, crackling softly in the oppressive quiet. The bodies of the newborns, now nothing more than ash and smoldering remnants, were scattered across the scorched earth. The snow, once pristine and untouched, had melted away, leaving behind a charred, steaming wasteland in its place. The silence was palpable, pressing down on both sides like a weight. The Volturi guard stood motionless, their disciplined composure momentarily shaken as they took in the destruction before them. The Cullens, too, were transfixed, faces reflecting a mixture of awe and caution as they glanced between the smoldering remains and Alara, whose expression was calm, almost nonchalant. Alara turned her gaze from the scorched ground to meet Aro's, her eyes gleaming with a glint of irreverent amusement, as though the devastation she'd caused was no more than a bit of theater. The oppressive quiet stretched on, broken only by the occasional crackle of cooling embers, the once frenzied battlefield now still and eerily subdued. Marcus stood motionless, his dark eyes fixed on Alara as she stood amidst the ruins, her figure silhouetted against the fading embers. His expression remained impassive, but beneath the mask of stoicism, his mind stirred with something deeper, something far beyond curiosity. He'd witnessed countless battles before, wars and destructions beyond measure, but this was different. It wasn't merely the scale of devastation that struck him, nor even the sheer force of Alara's power. No, what unnerved him was something far more profound. Almost instinctively, he slipped into his bond's side, guided by a force he couldn't quite name, as if something unseen was urging him to see her as she truly was. What he found startled him, a single thread of light, unlike any bond he had ever encountered. It connected Alara back to herself, looping endlessly, both the origin and destination of her own existence. It was delicate yet resolute, pulsing with a quiet energy, as though her very life was woven into a bond of solitude. This was no ordinary bond, it was a connection of immense strength, a self-contained resilience that reflected both the tragic isolation she carried and the formidable power she held. Marcus watched, transfixed, as he realized that Alara's strength came not from any bond to others but from an unbreakable tie to herself. Marcus's expression remained stoic, yet within him, a storm of emotions churned. How can someone so powerful carry such emptiness? He thought, the question cutting deeper than he expected. The realization stirred something long buried inside him, a faint resonance, a connection that defied centuries of detachment. What drives her to fight so fiercely yet remain untethered to anything, anyone? And then, a thought struck him with unexpected force. How can anyone be so strong for themselves alone? Then, with a jolt, he noticed it. A faint thread, barely perceptible even to his heightened senses, stretched from her. Its ashen color looked faded, worn and fragile, almost ghostly in appearance. He traced the trail of ash it left, following its path until he saw where it led, disappearing right into his own heart. Marcus's ancient heart tensed, an unfamiliar tightness spreading through him as the truth settled in. This was real. He wasn't imagining it. A part of him knew, had known from the first moment he looked at her bonds, but he struggled to accept it, to truly believe what he was seeing. This was a soul bond, a connection that surpassed even his vast understanding. Yet he had never seen one in such a state. Not even the darkest souls who had crossed his path bore bonds that looked so fragile, so worn, so sad. How can someone so powerful be so utterly alone? Beside him, Aro's voice sliced through the heavy silence, breaking Marcus's introspection. Fascinating, isn't she? Aro murmured, his voice laced with both admiration and simmering intrigue. His dark eyes gleamed with a predatory curiosity as he studied Alara, his fascination unmistakable. Such raw, untamed potential. It's rare to find someone who wields such power so boldly, without hesitation, without a care for consequence. Imagine what she could become if guided properly. Aro's gaze lingered on Alara, his words carrying a subtle weight as if he could already see the possibilities unfolding. The idea of shaping, refining such a force clearly thrilled him, and his smile deepened, hinting at the schemes already forming in his mind. And how exactly do you intend to mold someone so clearly carefree, arrogant, and utterly disrespectful? Caius' voice dripped with contempt, his body tense with barely contained aggression. His fingers twitched, eager for something violent, something cruel. His mouth twisted into a sinister grin, eyes gleaming with malice as he continued. You really believe she can be turned into a loyal guard? Disciplined, obedient, under control? His words were spat with venom, sharp gaze flicking back to Alara as though her very presence insulted him. No, Aro. Someone like her requires a different kind of molding. Caius's grin widened, his eyes turning feral as he let his sadistic imagination take hold. I could break her, tear that rebellious nature apart piece by piece. Strip her down until there's nothing left but obedience. I'd enjoy watching the fire in her eyes flicker out, snuffing out every last bit of that insolence. He let the words hang, savoring the thought. I'd relish the process, make her beg for mercy, show her pain she's never imagined. By the time I'm done, she'll be a shadow of herself, eager to follow orders, desperate to avoid my wrath. The cruelty in Caius's tone was palpable, his desire to dominate and break Alara radiating from every word. His vicious nature, always lurking beneath the surface, not shown through as he visualized reducing her to nothing more than a tool for the Volturi's power. Aro's fingers tapped lightly together, his expression calm but almost amused by the intensity of Caius's rage. The way Aro regarded such dark ideas, with a casual thoughtfulness, made the moment all the more unsettling. "Ah yes," Aro murmured, his voice soft but laced with a quiet excitement. "The Romanians, those tiresome relics we've despised for so long." He allowed the thought to settle, a faint smile playing on his lips, his eyes glinting with predatory intent.
Imagine it, Caius, Alara's power, controlled, honed, wielded to wipe them from existence.
She could be the weapon we've long needed to finally rid ourselves of their tiresome resistance. Her strength is undeniable. If properly harnessed, she could become a force beyond anything we've seen. The Romanians wouldn't stand a chance against her, their time would come to an end at last. Aro's gaze drifted back to Alara, who stood at the center of the field, still oblivious to their schemes. His tone was almost whimsical, as though discussing an insignificant inconvenience rather than centuries of rivalry and bloodshed. His gaze darkened, already envisioning the long-awaited downfall of their ancient enemies. With her as our ultimate weapon, we could finally reshape the Volturi's power, and after the Romanians, who knows what we might achieve with her at our side. "Yes, Aro, yes," he hissed, his voice thick with dark anticipation, his cruel grin widened, his mind racing with possibilities. "We've tolerated them far too long. Alara could be the key to erasing them for good." His gaze shifted back to Alara, cold and hungry. "But first, she needs to understand her place. There's no room for rebellion, no tolerance for defiance within the Volturi. I'll see to that myself." Aro hummed, his smile deepening, though something darker glinted in his eyes. "Oh, I've no doubt you would, brother. But let us be patient. Power like hers shouldn't be broken too harshly, nor too quickly. She needs to be guided and tempered." Caius's cruel grin faltered, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Aro's approach. "Tempered?" he repeated, skeptical. "You think the girl would respond too delicate?" Aro's smile was slow, calculated. "Not delicate in the usual sense, dear Caius. But if we cannot force her hand, perhaps we can extend it instead. Introduce her to our world properly, offer her the knowledge and power she craves. Make her feel she belongs with us. We offer her everything she wishes to know about the vampire world, show her the strength we possess, and we gain her trust. You think knowledge will sway her?" Caius folded his arms, still unconvinced but intrigued nonetheless. Aro's smile deepened, his tone shifting to one of quiet conspiracy. "Not knowledge alone, brother. We must extend her hospitality, make her feel welcome, comfortable even. Once she sees we are more than mere enforcers of law but an empire of possibility, she might be inclined to consider our offer." Caius raised an eyebrow. "And when she inevitably questions why we're being so accommodating?" "Simple," Aro replied smoothly. "We tell her the truth, mostly. We offer her a place among us, let her taste the benefits of being aligned with the Volturi. And once she's comfortable in our world, Chelsea and Corin will take care of the rest. Her loyalty will be cemented before she even realizes it." At the mention of Chelsea and Corin, Caius's expression darkened, a new understanding settling over him. "Ah," he murmured. "You plan to tie her to us, emotionally?" Aro nodded, his gaze turning sharp and predatory. "Precisely. Chelsea will reinforce her bonds to us, and Corin will make her crave our company, our presence. Once they work their talents, Alara will no longer be a threat but a dedicated member of our coven." Caius let out a low chuckle, though there was a darker edge to it. "Clever, brother." Aro's smile lingered, his eyes gleaming with calculated intent. "Precisely. We make her trust us, draw her into our fold, and she becomes ours in every sense. No force, no violence, just persuasion." The two shared a look, understanding that this plan, subtle, manipulative, carefully orchestrated, was far more likely to succeed than brute force. Alara, with her immense power and fierce independence, was a prize too valuable to mishandle. As their conversation unfolded, Marcus stood silently beside them, his gaze fixed on Alara. She remained oblivious, surrounded by the ashes of her firestorm, unaware of the plans forming around her. Yes, she was a force of destruction, he thought, his expression still unreadable, but what would become of her once that fire had burned everything in her path? The words of his brothers unsettled him deeply, despite his calm exterior.
He could see the fierce hunger for control in Caius's eyes, and Marcus knew all too well that once his brother set his mind on something, there would be no stopping him. Aura's manipulated threads were already weaving around Alara, but the thought of using her, of reducing her to a mere instrument of destruction, sent a sharp pang through Marcus's chest. The notion stirred something within him, something protective, unfamiliar and unsettling.
After centuries of detachment, indifferent to the schemes of his brothers, he now felt compelled to act. As he listened to them discuss Alara as if she were a pawn, Marcus's resolve solidified. He could not remain silent.
A part of him hesitated, reluctant to admit what he knew deep down to be true, but this talk of using her, of treating her as nothing more than a weapon, made his decision for him.
It was time for Aro to know. Taking a deliberate step forward, Marcus reached out and lightly touched Aro's arm. The subtle gesture, one he rarely initiated, caught Aro's attention immediately. He turned, eyebrows raised in mild surprise. Interruptions from Marcus were rare, especially during discussions like these, and the shift in Aro's expression from amusement to seriousness revealed his intrigue. Marcus. Aro, Marcus said, voice steady but edged with urgency. There is something you need to see. Aro's curiosity flickered. He allowed Marcus to grasp his hand, and in an instant, a torrent of perception flowed between them. The vision was clear, Alara's unique bond, a self-contained loop of solitude and strength. But beyond that was the delicate thread connecting her back to Marcus himself, a soul bond, frayed and weak yet undeniably real. The realization struck, undeniable yet difficult for Marcus to accept. He had struggled since first glimpsing it. But the bond was unmistakable. A soul bond, rare and significant, especially for Marcus, who had not known such a connection since losing Didyme, his beloved, though not his mate. Alara, however, was his mate. As the implications sank in, Aro's calculating gaze flicked between Marcus and Alara, his mind racing to absorb the significance of this revelation. Everything had changed.
Alara was no mere weapon to bend, nor just another powerful being to be added to their ranks. She was bound to Marcus, and the bond meant she could only stand among them as an equal, Marcus's mate, and soon enough, his sister by alliance.
Aro couldn't ignore it, nor could he afford to take it lightly. It appears Alara is far more than we initially thought, he said carefully, his smooth voice now carrying a weight Caius couldn't yet grasp. The situation is more complex than we anticipated. A deepening frown sparked irritation in Caius's crimson eyes. More complex? He echoed sharply, his voice rising with frustration. He took a step forward, his posture stiff, radiating impatience. Explain, Aro. A chuckle slipped from Aro's lips, subdued by the complexity already weighing on his mind. His intellect was adapting quickly to this new reality, recalculating strategy. There are connections at play, he began, voice threaded with intrigue. Connections we must tread carefully around. Alara is not simply a force to be shaped or broken, as we thought. No, there is more to her, much more to consider. A scowl darkened Caius's expression, his frustration sharp as he raked a hand through his pale hair. Connections? You're speaking in riddles, Aro, he snapped. If she's to be part of the Volturi, she must follow our rule. There's no room for rebellion, no tolerance for defiance. If you've got some new plan, then speak plainly. But before Aro could answer, Marcus, who had stayed silent through most of the conversation, spoke unexpectedly. Perhaps, he began, his voice carrying a quiet strength, there are some bonds that can't be controlled through force alone. The words hung in the air, surprising even Caius, who shot his brother a sharp look. This wasn't like Marcus, not to involve himself in such matters, and his sudden interest in Alara left Caius bewildered. His gaze narrowed, unsure why Marcus seemed so invested. And why would you care about her bonds? He asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. She's dangerous, this girl. What's to stop her from turning against us if we don't control her properly? Marcus's gaze held steady, fixed on Alara. Some forces, he replied quietly, are better understood than dominated. Simple words, yet with layers of meaning lost on everyone but Aro. A sidelong glance from Aro held an unspoken agreement to keep the truth between them, for now. Too many years were around, the Cullens, the Denali, the Wolves. This was no time to reveal the depth of Alara's connection to Marcus or the ramifications for the Volturi. Choosing his words carefully, Aro kept Caius's curiosity at bay without divulging too much. Trust me, dear brother, he said, tone smooth but evasive, I understand your concerns, but rest assured, there is a plan. One that will ensure her loyalty, her place among us. We simply need to approach her with more subtlety. And patience. A flicker of unease crossed Caius's eyes as he glanced between them. Though reluctant, he seemed unwilling to push further, irritation simmering beneath the surface. Very well, he growled, suspicion lingering in his expression. But I hope this subtlety of yours doesn't cost us our advantage. She's not one to be trifled with. Nor should she be, Marcus's quiet comment broke through again, soft but firm. Caius turned sharply, eyes narrowing at Marcus, the uncharacteristic engagement confusing him. You seem unusually interested in this girl, Marcus, he remarked, his tone laced with skepticism. I wonder why that is. Remaining stoic, Marcus's gaze locked on Alara, a rare intensity in his normally detached demeanor. There is more to consider, he said softly, words echoing Aro's with a weight only Aro could fully understand. Caius scowled, bewildered by his brother's involvement, but Aro's voice broke through, his tone calm yet authoritative. Let us proceed carefully, Caius, he said. The situation is more intricate than we first imagined. Patience is key. Marcus fell silent, but his presence was enough to carry his point. Alara's fate within the Volturi would not be decided hastily, not if he had any say. And though Caius might not understand why, Aro now knew the truth. Alara was Marcus's mate, and the bond, however fragile, placed her beyond mere servitude. The last of the bodies had finally burned out, and an uneasy stillness fell over the clearing. The Denali Coven, passive until now, stood frozen, their golden eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Tanya cast a worried glance towards her Coven mates who looked equally rattled. The raw power Alara had just displayed left them deeply unsettled. Kate couldn't hide the faint tremor in her hands as she clenched her fists, and Carmen's usually composed face was pale, her lips parted in stunned silence. She did that on her own. Tanya whispered, barely audible, more to herself than anyone else. The ashen remains of the newborn stretched across the clearing like the remnants of an apocalyptic storm. Carmen managed only a slow, silent nod, not trusting herself to speak. Kate finally found her voice, though it trembled with awe and a hint of fear. I've never seen anything like it, she muttered, her gaze fixed on Alara as if truly seeing her for the first time. That power, it's terrifying. Exchanging a look with Tanya, they both acknowledged in silence the danger Alara represented, not just to their enemies but to anyone who might cross her. The Cullens were equally stunned, though their reactions varied.
Edward stood next to Bella, his usually composed expression twisted with disbelief, shaking his head slightly as if trying to make sense of what had just happened.
A whisper escaped Bella's lips, her eyes wide as she took in the devastation. How is that even possible? Softly, Edward's reply carried a mix of awe and unease. I don't know. She's something else. No one should have that much power. His gaze shifted to Carlyle, seeking some reassurance or understanding in his father's grim, thoughtful expression. So much destruction, as murmured, her hand covering her mouth, golden eyes wide with a mixture of horror and sorrow.
The ache in her heart was clear. Though they were newborns, there was something deeply unsettling about the raw power that had reduced them to mere ashen moments.
Amit let out a low chuckle, unable to hide the flicker of excitement in his eyes. That was wild, he muttered, though even he, normally fearless, had a new note of caution in his tone. Wouldn't want to get on her bad side. He shot a glance at Rosalie, who pressed her lips into a thin line, her gaze weary as she took in the aftermath. Whatever her opinions of Alara before, this level of power had altered the game entirely. Jacob, standing at the front of the wolf pack, held an expression that was equal parts shock and respect. His massive form tensed, hackles raised, his amber eyes narrowed as he watched Alara with a new wariness. The pack, usually unflinching in the face of vampires, shifted uneasily behind him, instincts honed to detect danger now on high alert. That's not normal, he growled under his breath, struggling to comprehend how one human could so easily wipe out an entire army of newborns. Sam, standing in beside him, lowered his head in silent agreement, acknowledging the danger in his own way. No kidding. She just turned this place into hell on earth and barely blinked. Lee's normally sharp tongue was subdued, even she knew better than to challenge what they had seen. Meanwhile, desperation overwhelmed Bella as pleaded with Edward, please, tell us what she's thinking. A flicker of frustration crossed his face as he strained to delve into Alara's mind, grappling with the torrent of images and thoughts. I'm not sure, he murmured, brows furrowed. What do you mean you're not sure? Bella pressed, anxiety evident in her voice. There's too much. Thousands of images, thoughts, they're everywhere, overlapping.
Just as he was ready to pull away from the overwhelming chaos, a moment of clarity appeared, a view of the clearing from above, seen through countless, scattered perspectives. Shock lit up Edward's face as he broke through the mental noise. Holy fuck, he breathed, disbelief mingling with awe. A raised eyebrow from Esme conveyed her gentle disapproval. Edward, watch your language. Eager for an answer, Bella leaned closer. What? What is it? Instead of responding, he pointed upwards, his expression still stunned. The others followed his gaze, and there, swirling against the darkening sky, was the massive cloud of bats, their shapes blotting out the sky like an ominous storm. Bella, still struggling to piece together the meaning of Edward's reaction, furrowed her brows and leaned closer. Wait, what does that mean? What are you seeing? Edward's gaze remained fixed on the dark sky, his expression still one of awe and disbelief. It's her mind. Alara's thoughts are scattered, fragmented across all those bats, he explained, almost to himself, still processing the sight. It's as if each one is carrying a part of her, like thousands of pieces of a single mind. Confusion flickered across Bella's face as she tried to grasp what he was saying. You mean she's thinking through them? All of them? A solemn nod confirmed it. Every one of those bats is connected to her somehow, Edward replied, his voice quiet, as if the sheer scale of her ability had left him speechless.
She's seeing us from their eyes, thinking through each of them simultaneously. He shook his head, still in awe. I've never seen anything like it. Carlyle, his expression thoughtful yet tinged with concern, finally spoke up. This kind of power is beyond what any of us can comprehend. Edward's brow furrowed deeper, his frustration evident as he struggled to make sense of the chaotic tapestry in Alara's mind. I can't pinpoint a single thought, he admitted, his voice tense with both awe and discomfort. It's impossible to separate them. They're her thoughts, but each bat has its own instincts, its own fleeting sensations. Everything's mixed together, like a symphony of voices all speaking at once. Bella's grip on his hand tightened, sensing his strain. So you can't understand what she's thinking at all? He shook his head slowly. Not in any coherent way. I get flashes, images, feelings, but they're disjointed. It's as if her consciousness is diffused through every one of them, each holding a piece, but none of them complete. A faint shiver ran through him, the sheer strangeness of it unsettling even him. Carlyle took a step closer, his tone steady but laced with curiosity. She's transcending what we know of thought and connection. She's not just seeing or controlling them, she is them. A chill swept over Bella as she glanced back up at the swirling cloud of bats, now understanding the scope of what Edward was describing. So, Alara's both here and everywhere else, she murmured, barely able to believe it. The Volturi guard, disciplined and vigilant as ever, exchanged low murmurs that betrayed their surprise. Standing tall and poised, Felix allowed himself a low whistle before quickly masking his expression. She's got more fire than I expected, he muttered under his breath, casting a sidelong glance at Dmitri. Dmitri gave a subtle nod, his sharp gaze remaining fixed on Alara, eyes narrowing as he evaluated the threat. Alex's brow furrowed, his voice soft but edged with tension. Impressive, he murmured, his gaze unwavering on Alara. Though he tried to keep his tone even, there was no mistaking the respect underlying it. Beside him, Jane's lips twitched with irritation. She was not accustomed to anyone wielding more power than her, and Alara's casual display had struck a nerve. She's reckless, Jane whispered sharply, though her eyes held a reluctant admiration as they traced the destruction across the clearing. Her fingers twitched at her sides, itching to act, but even she felt a strange discomfort at the thought of provoking this girl without direct orders. I don't like it, she hissed under her breath, eyes darting towards Aro. Shifting uncomfortably, Felix's gaze flickered between Alara and the kings. Are we engaging her, then? He muttered low to Dmitri, though his eyes remained fixed on Caius, waiting for a signal. Dimitri's gaze flickered uncertainly towards Marcus, a hint of confusion slipping into his usually calm expression. I believe it's complicated, he murmured, nodding subtly in Marcus's direction, as if the answer to this unusual restraint lay there. His sharp eyes darted back to Alara, though his head shook slightly, still trying to piece together what had shifted. Master Caius doesn't seem too thrilled about it either. In a sharp whisper, Jane turned her frustration towards Aro. Master Aro, what is our move? Her tone was respectful, but impatience slipped through, her gaze flicking between her master and the scene before them. She can't just walk away after that, she added, her voice taut with barely contained irritation. Still cool and contemplative, Aro held up a slender hand, signaling patience. This situation, he replied softly, his voice layered with a weight that only he and Marcus fully understood, is far more delicate than it appears, my dear Jane. We shall not act rashly. Beside him, Caius's jaw tightened, suspicion flickering across his face. Felix caught Caius's look, seeing the desire to act clashing with Aro's insistent calm. What's with all this subtlety? Felix muttered, his voice barely audible. Since when do we hold back? Jane's frustration finally boiled over. She took a bold step forward, her defiance visible in her eyes. Master Aro, with all due respect, her voice cut through the uneasy silence, but she didn't get far. Marcus, usually the most reserved of them all, turned to her with an expression so dark, so unyielding, that she froze. His voice, though soft, sliced through the tension like a blade. Stand down, Jane. His tone carried a command that was absolute, and something fierce lingered in his gaze, an emotion that sent a shock through the ranks, before turning his attention back to Alara. Jane recoiled, blinking in stunned silence, her mouth snapping shut as she took an instinctive step back. She glanced quickly at Alec, who was just as taken aback, wide-eyed as he stared at his sister and then at Marcus, uncharacteristically speechless. The rest of the guard exchanged uneasy looks, surprised by the force in Marcus's words. Felix shifted, his usual confidence faltering as he tried to reconcile the calm Marcus he knew with the commanding presence now standing before them. My apologies, Master Marcus, Jane said quietly, swallowing her earlier defiance and lowering her head slightly. I did not mean to overstep. Marcus's gaze softened marginally, the fierce protectiveness that had briefly flared now fading back into his usual calm. With a slight nod of acknowledgement, he accepted her apology without further reprimand, though the memory of his unexpected intensity lingered in Jane's mind, leaving her both chastened and wary. Jane moved back beside Alec, who raised his brow, his expression a blend of surprise and newfound understanding. She returned his look with a slight nod, her gaze cast downward, the unusual apology marking a subtle shift among them. Even as they resumed their disciplined stance, the guards exchanged brief, silent glances, each more acutely aware of the charged balance now hanging over the field. Caius's glare sharpened as he eyed Marcus with open suspicion.
"And since when," he hissed, his voice barely concealing his irritation, "do you concern yourself with such matters, Marcus?"
His lips twisted in a sneer, though he kept his voice low, wary of pushing Marcus too far. "This girl, she's dangerous. What's to stop her from turning against us?" Without looking away from Alara, Marcus replied, his tone calm but laced with meaning. "Some forces," he said quietly, "are better understood, rather than dominated." "Indeed, brother," Aro murmured, casting a glance at Caius that held both amusement and subtle warning. "There are connections at play here that require a certain delicacy." His scowl deepened, his arms crossing in irritation. "Delicacy?" Caius muttered under his breath. "She reduced an entire army to ash. And we're meant to tread lightly?"
He stood rigid, fuming silently, his narrowed eyes fixed on Alara with a simmering intensity. Though Aro placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, his touch carrying both reassurance and a quiet command, Caius remained visibly unyielding, his jaw clenched in defiance.
"Trust me, Caius," Aro's voice was calm, yet there was a firmness beneath the gentle tone. "The complexities of this bond, they will benefit us all, but only if handled with care." A reluctant nod was all Caius gave, though his expression held none of Aro's reassurance. His gaze flicked sharply to Marcus, his eyes probing and mistrustful, clearly unsettled by his brother's apparent acceptance of Alara's presence and the interest it stirred. Outwardly the Volturi stood unchanged, but within their ranks the memory of Marcus's words lingered, a potent reminder that Alara was not just another threat or ally. The kings had drawn a line around her, and Marcus, typically so reserved, had revealed the depth of his resolve to keep it. As the oppressive silence thickened across the battlefield, the tension between the two covens and the wolves grew almost unbearable. Every eye remained fixed on Alara, waiting for her next move, their wariness palpable. The scorched earth beneath her feet still crackled softly, the final remnants of her hellstorm smoldering in the air. Then, Alara broke the tension with a sudden, exaggerated grin that spread across her face. She clapped her hands together loudly, the sound startling those closest to her. "Well?" she exclaimed, her voice light and casual, as if she hadn't just wiped out an entire army of newborns. "All this arse-kicking has made me so tired." She stretched her arms above her head dramatically. "Probably time for a nap." The sheer absurdity of her words in the face of the destruction she'd just caused left everyone momentarily dumbfounded. The contrast between her casual tone and the battlefield that lay in ruins behind her was almost surreal. Did she just say she's tired?
Jacob muttered, his voice a blend of disbelief and humor as he glanced at Sam, who simply shook his head, a low, reluctant huff escaping his throat.
Leah, normally quick with a retort, stood silently beside them, her eyes wide as she took in Alara's scorched handiwork. Ahmed's booming laugh shattered the silence on the Cullen side, his grin as wide as Alara's. "I like her," he declared, slapping Edward on the back hard enough to make him stumble slightly. "Girl knows how to keep things interesting." He leaned closer to Edward, his voice dropping to a playful murmur, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Honestly, she's insane," Emmett added with a smirk, eyes fixed on Alara. "And somehow that just makes her even hotter." His chuckle rumbled through the quiet, clearly entertained by the chaos she'd left in her wake. Rosalie's exasperated scoff followed as she punched Emmett lightly on the arm. "Seriously, Emmett?" Her face, however, betrayed her own intrigue at Alara's display.
"Crazy is what she is," Edward replied under his breath, though a faint, incredulous smile tugged at his lips as he glanced at Bella, who seemed just as stunned. Bella could only shake her head, glancing between the destruction and Alara, as if still piecing together how it was possible. Amusement colored Aro's voice as he spoke, his gaze alight with fascination. She does indeed have a flair for theatrics," he remarked softly, clearly entertained. "Quite refreshing, wouldn't you say, Caius?" "This is no time for jokes," Caius snapped, his patience wearing thin. His icy gaze locked onto Alara, his voice carrying a sharp edge of irritation. "The girl is nothing but a threat. If you're finished admiring her, perhaps we should remind her of where she stands." Before Caius could continue, Aro raised a hand, gesturing lightly for Alara to approach. The sudden shift in the atmosphere caught Alara's attention, and she looked over, making eye contact with him. Amusement sparkled in her eyes, but she held her ground for a moment, surveying the field around her with a lazy, almost theatrical yawn, as though the weight of the Volturi's gaze was nothing but a casual nuisance. With a casual shrug, she walked over, each step deliberate, her posture radiating calm confidence as she finally came to a stop before Aro. She raised an eyebrow, hands resting on her hips, a smirk playing on her lips.
Well, here I am, she said, glancing between him and Caius, who watched her with thinly veiled distaste. Indeed, Aro's smile widened, his tone a smooth purr of intrigue as he took her in. Strength with such levity is rare. You've certainly made an impression, my dear. Alara's grin was all cheek. Good to know, she replied breezily. Not that I came here to impress anyone. Her gaze shifted to Marcus, drawn by the calm, steady presence he exuded. Something about him felt strangely grounding, and her eyes lingered a fraction longer on him than she intended. For a moment the guard seemed caught in the unusual exchange, watching as Alara shrugged nonchalantly. Well, she glanced at her watch with a casual grin, I better get going. I'll see you around, yeah?
With a playful wave to the entire coven, she turned as if to stroll away, but Aro stepped forward, his smile widening as he watched her.
Stay a moment longer, Alara, he murmured, his voice smooth and almost fatherly. The Volturi rarely encounter individuals quite like you. Perhaps we could find a more beneficial arrangement. Yeah, nah, she replied, dismissing the idea with a casual wave of her hand. Not one for arrangements, especially with a bunch of vampires. Her expression was defiant, utterly unbothered by Aro's calculated charm. Beside him, Caius's scowl deepened. If you're not one for coven politics, perhaps you'd prefer the consequences that come with ignoring them, he said coldly, clearly irritated by her dismissal. Oh, I've heard about your consequences, Alara shot back, her tone dripping with sarcasm. But if I were actually a threat, I doubt we'd still be talking. She met Marcus's gaze briefly, feeling an odd sense of reassurance as he gave her the faintest nod. Aro chuckled, amusement softening his features. You see, Alara, this something you've done demands our attention, he replied smoothly. He cast a sidelong glance at Caius as if encouraging restraint, silently urging patience. She tilted her head, a bemused smirk on her face as she took in Aro's words. Your attention, huh? She replied, her voice light but edged with a hint of mockery. I didn't realize you lot would be so easily impressed. She shrugged, glancing at the lingering remnants of ash and charred earth around them. It's hardly my most notable work. She glanced down at her watch with an exaggerated sigh, tapping the glass as though bored with the entire exchange. Time flies when you're having fun, huh? She muttered under her breath, barely masking the sarcasm. Caius's eyes narrowed, his lip curling into a disdainful sneer. Somewhere better to be. He drawled, his tone dripping with contempt. Without missing a beat, Alara shot him a sharp grin. As a matter of fact, yeah. I have a date with literally anywhere that isn't surrounded by a bunch of self-important vampires. She raised an eyebrow at Caius, her smirk widening. Though clearly, some of you are having a harder time saying goodbye than others. Her words hung in the air, defiant and daring, as if challenging Caius to react. Caius's face twisted in fury, his eyes blazing as he took a sharp step forward, his fists clenched tightly. Your disrespect is insufferable, human, he spat, his voice low and dripping with disdain. You stand in the presence of the Volturi, yet you carry on with insolence as though we're mere playthings. Alara merely rolled her eyes, an amused smirk tugging at her lips. That? Oh, that wasn't disrespect. This is. With a flick of her wrist, a glowing fireball erupted from her hand and shot directly towards Caius. He barely had time to react before it struck him square in the chest, the force of the impact sending him sprawling backwards and landing hard on the ground. The instant Caius hit the earth, the entire Volturi guard surged into action. Snarls and growls tore through the clearing as they surrounded Alara in a flash, their stances tense, fangs bared, ready to strike.
Felix and Demetri edged closer, their eyes fierce with hostility, while Jane's face twisted with a dark, eager smile, clearly relishing the chance for retribution.
The guard closed in, a wall of unwavering loyalty and deadly intent, each of them poised to defend their king.
Before any of them could advance further, Marcus moved in a blur, lunging in front of Alara with startling speed, his back to her as he faced down his own coven. His normally calm expression had hardened, his voice cutting through the tension with a firm, commanding edge. Enough of this, he said, his tone carrying a weight of authority that even the guard couldn't ignore. For a moment the guards hesitated, each glance shifting from Marcus to Aro to Caius, waiting for a cue. Aro, meanwhile, appeared utterly delighted, his face lit with pure, unrestrained amusement. Clasping his hands together, he let out a soft, mirthful chuckle, clearly relishing the unfolding drama. Oh, how splendidly refreshing, he murmured, his gaze darting between Alara and the disgruntled Caius, who was now on his feet, still smoldering and glaring daggers at her. Our dear Alara has certainly brought a new spark to the evening, hasn't she? Alara's lips quirked, watching with a hint of satisfaction as Marcus remained protectively before her, his stance unyielding against his own family. The tension in the air lingered, taut and electric, until Aro gave a subtle tilt of his head, a silent command to the guard to stand down. Reluctantly, the guards eased back, their snarls fading, though hostility still lingered in their eyes.
With the guard's attention diverted, Aro turned his focus fully to Alara, his smile smooth as silk. With a faint wave, he gestured for Marcus to step aside, his gaze settling on her with an intensity that hinted at both curiosity and delight. "Please do consider joining us, Alara," he said, his voice a soothing blend of charm and allure. "You possess a strength and flair that would be of great value to the Volturi." From behind him, Caius seethed with barely contained rage, his face twisted in fury at the humiliating memory of being knocked to the ground in front of his own guard. His fists clenched tightly at his sides, his eyes narrowed into a murderous glare fixed solely on Alara. The insult she'd dealt him, the sheer audacity of putting him on his back in front of the entire coven, simmered within him like a slow-acting poison. Sensing the imminent eruption, Aro gave a nearly imperceptible nod to the guard, a silent order to keep Caius restrained.
Felix and Demetri responded immediately, shifting subtly yet firmly, their presence a quiet reminder that any sudden moves would be intercepted. Though Caius's rage didn't subside, the guard's vigilance forced him to hold his ground, his seething anger restrained, at least for the moment, by Aro's quiet command.
Alara tilted her head, giving Aro a look of mock consideration before flashing a wry grin. "Oh, tempting, really," she replied, her voice thick with sarcasm. "But I'm not much for a loyal subject material. You know, bit of a yield card, as I'm sure you've noticed. But that is precisely what makes you so fascinating, my dear." He cast a sidelong glance at Caius, whose barely restrained anger only seemed to amuse him further. "In fact, I think a touch of unpredictability might be just what we need." "Yeah, nah," she replied, dismissing the idea with a wave. "I'm good. Cults aren't really my thing, no. They seem a bit too clingy." She gave Aro an exaggerated shrug, as if brushing off his interest entirely. He hadn't anticipated her complete dismissal, and it only heightened his interest.
Yet, as she turned slightly to leave, Alara's gaze caught Marcus, just for a moment, then lingering longer than intended.
A strange feeling tugged at her, faint yet impossible to ignore. Something about him felt different. Odd. She struggled to place it, a sensation unsettling enough to make her frown slightly, her eyes narrowing in confusion. Even when she looked away, her gaze seemed to drift back to him, as though drawn by some unseen force. An unfamiliar warmth coiled at the edges of her awareness, a quiet pull that left her disoriented, wanting to look at him again. Marcus, feeling her gaze, remained as still as marble, but a subtle softness flickered in his eyes, as though he, too, felt something shifting within. He didn't look away, instead he held her gaze, a rare intensity and quiet understanding reflected in his dark eyes. Aro noticed the brief yet potent exchange, his eyes darting between them with a knowing glint. But he kept his thoughts to himself, allowing the moment to pass unspoken. Beside him, Caius's scowl only deepened, oblivious to the subtleties but irritated by Alara's continued resistance. Alara forced herself to break the gaze, instead sweeping over the group with casual disinterest before landing on Aro with a playful smirk. "Well, this has been thrilling, really," she drawled, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "But I best be off. You know, things to do, people to antagonize." She gave a small, dismissive shrug. With that, she spun on her heel, making a move to leave the chart clearing without a second glance. From the Denali side, a voice broke through the tension, Tanya, her frustration bubbling over as she stepped forward. "How are you letting her just walk away?" she demanded, her voice laced with indignation. "Isn't she breaking every rule you enforce?" Alara's gaze drifted to Marcus, lingering on his tall, silent presence beside Aro and Caius. She tilted her head, a spark of curiosity in her eyes as she took him in. There was something about his quiet authority, the way he'd stepped in and held back his own coven on her behalf, that felt almost intriguing. She allowed herself a small, genuine smile as she studied him, interest flickering beneath her usual nonchalance. "Who exactly are you?" she asked, her voice more inquisitive than before, her sarcasm slipping as she let her guard down slightly. "And what do you think of all this? Me breaking your precious vampire laws and all?" He held her gaze for a moment, his usual detachment softened. "I am Marcus," he replied, his voice low and calm, each word carrying a weight that felt timeless. "One of the three who oversee the Volturi Coven." His eyes flickered with a subtle intensity as he studied her, as though seeing something beyond her defiance and bravado. "As for what I think," he continued, his tone thoughtful, almost gentle, "I believe not all transgressions are equal. Some things lie beyond the boundaries of our laws." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, his gaze holding hers steadily. "And you, Alara, may very well be one of those things." Aro's eyes gleamed with intrigue at Marcus's response, clearly picking up on the unspoken depth in his brother's words. Caius, however, looked less than pleased, his irritation barely concealed as he observed the exchange. But Marcus's quiet authority held, and even Caius refrained from interrupting. Alara's mouth quirked into a faint smirk as she regarded Marcus, feeling that same strange pull, her curiosity piqued. Well, Marcus, she replied, voice still edged with humor but lacking her usual flippancy. Guess it's good to know I'm a special case. She paused, glancing between Marcus and Aro. But I'm not one for coven politics. So if this means you're letting me walk away, I'll take it. She kept her gaze on Marcus a beat longer, the question lingering in her eyes. The Volturi have laws for a reason, Aro. How can you allow this human, someone who knows our secrets, to simply walk away? Tanya's voice rose, each word sharpened by frustration. Her gaze darted between Aro, Caius and Marcus, her anger building. You'd punish anyone else without hesitation. Why is she the exception? Oh, spare me. As if I'm the world's biggest threat. Got bigger things to worry about than outing your vampire society, she rolled her eyes with exaggerated impatience. Unfazed by Tanya's fury, Aro raised a hand to settle her, his voice calm and measured. Tanya, our laws are vital and we've upheld them for centuries. But sometimes there are situations that require a more nuanced approach. He gestured towards Alara, his serene expression never wavering. Caius looked as if he'd bitten into something sour, clearly despising this delicate approach. He glared between Alara and Aro, the wheels turning in his mind as he grudgingly realized there must be something about her that warranted such restraint, a fact he couldn't ignore after Marcus had shielded her and Aro practically begged her to stay. Nuance. Tanya's voice cracked with frustration, her tone sharp. This isn't about nuance, Aro. She knows too much, and you're just going to let her walk away. You risking exposure for all of us. Carmen stepped in, her tone frosty. Tanya's right. These laws weren't made for show, and they protect every one of us. But this human. She walks away. With the faintest gesture, Aro motioned for calm. Tanya, Carmen, I truly understand your concerns. Yet Alara poses no immediate threat. The disbelief in Tanya's voice sliced through the clearing. No threat? Did you not see her single-handedly take out an entire newborn army? Or were you too busy drooling over your new pet human to notice? With a lazy smile, Alara leaned back, arms crossed. Oh, don't blame him if you're feeling ignored, she replied, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. I get that it's hard when someone else steals the spotlight. Tanya, Aro began, his tone as smooth as ever, our laws have always required discretion. Alara's unique abilities make her a valuable exception, one we will consider carefully. Nothing more. She glared between Aro and Alara, her fury simmering, clearly unimpressed with his attempt to soothe her. Unique abilities or not, she's a threat to everything we protect, she snapped. And I, for one, won't stand by and watch her walk away without consequence. Alara let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes. Listen, if I'd wanted to expose your little vampire society, I'd have done it ages ago. But here I am, enduring this lovely conversation instead. She shot Tanya a pointed look. Believe me, this special treatment wasn't on my wish list either. Aro's hand rose again, his tone commanding. Alara will be given 1 year, he announced smoothly, his words punctuating the tension. She will either join us by then or face consequences. An option? Tanya's mouth dropped open, her contempt aimed squarely at Alara. So she's free to just wander around with all of our secrets because of annuancy. With a shrug and a deadpan look, Alara fired back, oh, trust me, having you all breathing down my neck isn't exactly a stroll in the park. Hardly the free pass you seem to think. Tanya's gaze narrowed, a sneer twisting her features. Easy to claim you don't care. But who knows how long it'll be before your indifferency becomes a problem. From the sidelines, Bella's voice cut through, a calm reminder that unsettled the Denalists. I was given a year too. She looked towards Tanya and Tanya, who visibly faltered at the unexpected reminder. I had a choice, just like Alara. Aro's tone was rich with satisfaction as he addressed Bella. Precisely. We've granted time before, and in Alara's case, she too deserves that courtesy. But Bella, you didn't take the full year, Tanya countered, her frustration bubbling over as she searched for a rebuttal. This isn't the same. I fell ill. I turned sooner because I had no other choice, it wasn't planned. Her words seemed to hit home, and the Denali sisters exchanged a look, the fire in their eyes dimming slightly. Sensing the shift, Aro seized the moment, his tone silkier than ever. Exactly. And as with Bella, we will give Alara the time to decide. We expect the same respect for her decision as we did with Bella. Tanya's shoulders sagged, though her stare was still fixed warily on Alara. Fine, she muttered. But don't think this is some kind of free pass, she warned, her tone cold. Noted, Alara replied dryly. Believe me, this is hardly the gift you seem to think it is. Alara's face twisted in disbelief, her eyes widening as she stared at Aro, incredulous, taking full stock of what he had actually said. Wait, what? She shot him a look, incredulous. You think I'm about to join you? Immortal? Are you completely out of your mind? Aro's smile remained unfazed, calm and collected as he met her gaze. It is a solution, dear Alara. One that would ensure peace of mind for everyone involved. She huffed, folding her arms tightly. I don't even like living out a human lifespan, and you think I'd be thrilled with eternity. Her tone was thick with sarcasm, a thread of genuine irritation threading through. Living forever sounds like a nightmare, not some gift. A. Beside Aro, Caius's gaze darkened, his lips curving into a cruel smile as he looked at Alara with a glint of sadistic amusement.
Oh, you might come to find that eternity has certain unforgettable qualities, he murmured coldly, his tone dripping with menace.
Imagine all the endless years to reflect on past mistakes and the consequences they bring. Immortality isn't just a gift, it's a lesson, one that can be quite unforgiving.
Ignoring Caius's calculating smirk, Alara zeroed back in on Aro, her voice dripping with disdain.
This solution of yours sounds more like a threat. Aro chuckled, smooth and unaffected, though his eyes gleamed with something sharper. It needn't be that way, Alara, he replied, his voice light. Merely an invitation to explore possibilities. She shook her head but let her attention flick to Marcus, disbelief and frustration shining in her eyes. And you? She asked, her tone edged with genuine curiosity. Do you actually agree with this solution? Marcus's steady gaze held hers, his expression unreadable, though a depth lingered in his eyes, a quiet contemplation that seemed to reveal more than words. His silence lingered, creating its own tension as Aro, noticing the exchange, let the moment stretch, his brother's perspective held back for now. Aro sensed Marcus's restraint, and he filled the silence with measured words.
It is essential, he began, his voice smooth and diplomatic, to uphold the expectations of our laws and the stability they provide.
At his side, Marcus gave a subtle nod, echoing Aro's thoughts, though both remained acutely aware of the watchful eyes around them. Edward's silent, wary gaze in particular demanded they keep the discussion as neutral as possible. Arms crossed, Alara shot Aro a challenging look. And if I refuse? What then? She glanced pointedly towards Felix, who smirked in return. Gonna send your brutes after me? Aro merely chuckled, a sound as soft as it was indulgent. Nothing so theatrical, he replied smoothly. But I would advise you to weigh your choices carefully. Not everything requires force, but every decision does carry consequences. Her eyes narrowed, defiance flashing in her gaze. And those consequences would be? She pressed, her tone hard, challenging, taking a step towards him. If force isn't involved, then enlighten me, Aro. Though his calm expression didn't falter, there was a hint of subtle restraint in Aro's gaze. He was careful not to reveal his true intentions, his usual charm softened out of respect for Marcus and the bond he now knew tied Alara to his brother. Alara, he said gently, his voice like silk, the choice is entirely yours. All I offer is a perspective, an opportunity for you to consider. Her wary gaze didn't soften, though she studied him, searching for any hint of deception. An opportunity? She echoed, sarcasm lining her words. Sounds a lot like bait to me. Aro's chuckle remained light, non-threatening. Not at all. Think of it as a door, one you alone have the choice to open or not. No strings, no force. He gave Marcus a respectful nod, recognizing the bond that added a layer of complexity far beyond any Volturi command. Marcus continued to observe in silence, his expression unreadable, yet the quiet understanding in his eyes was unmistakable, a reassurance that Aro's words held true. Drawn by something unspoken, Alara shifted her gaze back to Marcus. And what would you want me to choose? Her voice was quieter, an edge of genuine interest breaking through. Meeting her eyes, Marcus's gaze softened, a rare warmth breaking through. I would want you to choose freely, he answered, his voice low and steady, carrying a weight that spoke of respect and a bond he hadn't fully voiced. It lingered between them, an unspoken promise. Aro allowed the moment to settle, his usual persuasion dialed back, letting her make her own decision without further interference. An arched brow and a skeptical glance conveyed Alara's challenge. Right. So, where exactly do these consequences come in if, as you say, I have a caius and I am free to choose, without strings or force? Because this alara consequences ultimatum doesn't exactly scream of freedom. Her gaze shifted to Marcus, curiosity mixed with challenge. And you, Marcus, if you want me to choose freely, how does that work with Aro here putting me on a timer? His gaze softened, though his expression remained contemplative. The freedom is yours, Alara, he replied, his voice steady, with a hint of something sincere beneath the surface. And my hope is that you decide as you truly wish, without any obligation. Aro's eyes gleamed as he allowed Marcus's words to settle. The year is not a restriction, Alara, but an allowance. Time to consider, explore, and understand. No force, only the possibility for something more. His words were smooth, yet held the unmistakable undertone that the Volturi were seldom truly hands-off. With a growing smirk, Alara scoffed lightly. Possibility, huh? Her words dripped with sarcasm. I'll be sure to think on it, a possibility alongside these strings you swear aren't there. Her smirk widened as she turned toward Caius, catching the flicker of anger that simmered in his eyes. Are you sure he's on board with this grand invitation? The mock innocence in her tone was unmistakable, her amusement barely contained. I'd hate to join a team where not everyone's thrilled about it. A low, delighted laugh punctuated the silence. And well, he's looking a bit singed. A dark line settled over Caius's mouth, his fury barely restrained. The memory of being tossed to the ground in front of his guard, by a human no less, stung his pride sharply. Each word she spoke was like another flame igniting his already burning anger, but he steadied himself, determined not to let her flippancy pull him further. It would do you well, he hissed in a low, venomous tone, to understand that respect is not optional here. Feigning thoughtful consideration, Alara let out a bemused chuckle. Right, respect. Noted. And you think throwing fire at people might be, what, a little disrespectful? Aro's eyes glinted with delight, clearly savoring the exchange. Dear Caius, he purred, clasping his hands behind his back with a slight, indulgent smile. Surely we can appreciate Alara's spirited nature. It's what makes her such an intriguing candidate for us. Caius's patience thinned visibly, the slight jab from Aro only adding to his frustration. His lip curled, fingers twitching as he struggled to contain the surge of irritation. Aro, he replied, voice as sharp as eyes, we should remember that a line must be drawn. A human with this much defiance, undisciplined, unrepentant, his gaze fell back to Alara, satisfaction curling his lips into a faint smirk. May soon regret such insolence. Is that a promise? She quipped, undeterred. Because it sounds an awful lot like you're just mad I put you on your arse. Folding her arms, she glanced between Aro and Marcus with amusement. Besides, it's not like I came in here throwing rose petals. Let's not get melodramatic. The thrill in Aro's expression only deepened as Caius bristled beside him. Now, Caius, he murmured, his tone smooth but edged with faint mockery, surely we can find a use for Alara's enthusiasm. Directed properly, it could serve us well. A flicker of dark satisfaction passed over Caius's face. The insult of Aro's patience with her dug deep, and he savored the thought of her arrogance being swiftly put in check. Perhaps we should find a way to temper that defiance lest it lead her down a regrettable path, he replied coldly, his gaze fixed on her with unmistakable menace. Ah, consequences again, Alara replied lightly, eyes narrowing just enough to make her point clear. I keep hearing about these, but all I see are invitations. She glanced at Aro, feigning curiosity. Unless you've got something else in mind that doesn't involve joining your little club. Aro's voice stayed smooth, every word measured. Oh, Alara, you misunderstand. We simply want you to consider all options, including the stability, the power, and yes, even the immortality that comes with our coven. Caius observed the exchange with mounting irritation, his disdain for Alara's defiance as clear as his frustration with Aro's indulgent patience. Surely, Marcus, you see the risk. She's undisciplined, she disrespects our very order. Do you really think she belongs here? A quiet resolve softened Marcus's gaze as he watched Alara. Perhaps there is more here than you were willing to see, Caius. His voice was calm, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. Sometimes respect is earned, not forced. The subtle, understanding warmth in his eyes cut through Alara's flippancy, her smirk faltering briefly as she met his steady gaze. A scoff escaped Caius, tension tightening in his posture as he shifted his glare from Alara to his brother. And what would you suggest? Let her wander freely, challenging every rule and tossing fire at whomever she pleases. His voice dripped with sarcasm, though a flicker of uncertainty crept in as he noticed Marcus's unwavering resolve. With a shift in his expression, Aro's gaze danced between his two brothers, a spark of intrigue lighting his features. Perhaps we should simply let Alara consider our offer rather than press the matter prematurely, he said smoothly, his tone diplomatic. His gaze slid to Alara, his expression as inviting as it was cunning. After all, the choice to join us must be freely made, mustn't it? Displeasure etched itself into Caius's face, his eyes fixed on Alara as if weighing every threat she posed. The idea of her choice gnawed at him, each second she remained untethered to their rule felt like an affront. A flicker of uncertainty tightened Alara's posture, her eyes darting between the three ancient leaders before her. The freedom they were offering seemed more like a carefully laid trap. She had heard stories of the Volturi and knew well enough they weren't a coven anyone escaped from unscathed. The longer she stood in their presence, the heavier the invisible target on her back felt. But instead of letting her own unease show, she turned the tables. Wait a minute, she said, her voice laced with deliberate nonchalance, aren't you all here to deal with them? She gestured broadly to the Cullens and the wolves behind her. Aro's expression shifted, a spark of amusement mingling with intrigue as he glanced from Alara to the others. Ah, he mused, the realization seemingly dawning on him with a certain delight. In my excitement over our new guest, I almost forgot the reason we came here in the first place. His eyes, still bright with fascination, turned to the Cullens, his usual predatory politeness slipping back into place. With a raised eyebrow, Alara folded her arms and nodded toward the Cullen side. Perhaps it's time to get on with that then. I'd hate to take up any more of your precious time. Besides, I'd best be off. She shot a wry smile at Caius, whose scowl only deepened, though his sharp gaze never left her. Oh, but no, please, do stay, Aro replied smoothly, his voice almost too inviting, as if genuinely thrilled by the idea. I would so greatly appreciate your insightful humor during the proceedings. He offered a slight, theatrical bow, his tone straddling the line between sincerity and mockery, impossible to ignore. Alara exhaled, her expression dripping with feigned patience. Aro, I've told you before, she began, glancing at him with a smirk, I don't play politics. I don't care what strategic posturing or shows you have going on here. Aro's smile only widened, his eyes gleaming. But you misunderstand me, dear Alara, he said, his tone silky. This isn't about politics, it's about presence. Yours has a way of elevating any gathering, don't you think? Oh, I'm sure it does, Alara shot back, her voice laced with sarcasm. But let's not pretend I am here to elevate anything. You and I both know that whatever this is, it's about control. And as I've said, I don't play that game. Aro's expression softened, though his gaze remained cunning. Then think of it as simply staying among friends, he suggested, his words like honey. We're all friends here, are we not? Friends? Alara's laughter was dry, almost mocking. Last I checked, friends don't make invitations that sound suspiciously like ultimatums. She glanced at her watch, heaving an exaggerated sigh. Fine, Aro. I'll stay. But only because I don't want to miss whatever circus this is about to turn into. A flash of amusement passed over Aro's face, and he gave a small, approving nod. Marvelous. And perhaps you'll see, Alara, that even those who don't play politics often find themselves part of the game. The clearing was a delicate powder keg, every exchange and movement crackling with electric tension. The Cullens stood with resolute unity, an unspoken shield between themselves and the Volturi, their gazes unwavering as the mighty vampires before them formed a semicircle of looming menace. The Volturi's crimson eyes gleamed like coals in the dimming light, their expressions unreadable but full of silent judgment, waiting for some signal to strike. The air felt dense with anticipation, as though the very atmosphere might snap under the pressure. Alara, at the outer edges of this standoff, seemed as unbothered as if she were watching a particularly dull play unfold, her posture relaxed, almost lazy. She leaned against a tree, her fingers idly twirling a loose thread from her sleeve, eyes narrowing only slightly, the faintest glint of amusement dancing in them. To her, this was nothing more than another boring spectacle, a tug-of-war between egos she didn't care to partake in. Aro broke the silence, stepping forward with his usual deliberate grace, his dark cloak billowing slightly in the breeze. His voice, rich and velvety, cut through the air like a blade. Now, where shall we begin? He mused, a glint of theatrical disapproval in his eyes. Oh, yes. I have been hearing troubling reports. His tone dropped, faint disappointment coloring his words. Consorting with werewolves. Children of the moon? Really, Carlyle, I expected better. A matter of grave concern, as I'm sure you understand. He tilted his head slightly, his expression expectant, as though waiting for a confession. Carlyle's calm and composed voice followed, unshaken by the weight of Aro's accusation. Aro, I assure you, these are not werewolves. They bear no connection to the true children of the moon. Aro raised an eyebrow, his intrigue carefully disguised beneath a veneer of politeness. Oh. And what, then, would you call these creatures you have so graciously allowed into your company? The Cullens bristled slightly, but Carlyle remained steady. Before he could answer, a low, exaggerated sigh broke the charged silence. Before Carlyle could respond, Alara let out a low, exaggerated sigh from her spot by the sidelines. Here we go, she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, her arms folded across her chest as she watched Aro with a look of pure, unfiltered boredom. Aro's gaze shifted to her, amusement flickering in his eyes. Something to add, dear Alara? Oh, just wondering how long it's going to take before you realize they're not even real werewolves, she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she arched an eyebrow. Maybe crack open a biology book sometime. A ripple of shock spread through the Volturi guard, their scarlet gazes darting toward Aro for his reaction. Instead, he only smiled, his amusement growing as he humored her interruption. Enlighten us then, if you would be so kind. Alara pushed herself off the tree with exaggerated slowness, her movements unhurried as if the entire matter bored her. Shapeshifters, Aro, she began, her voice as casual as if she were explaining a weather report. Not children of the moon. They don't change under the full moon, they can shift at will, and they're tied to a spirit lineage or whatever mystic mumbo-jumbo they've got going on. In short, wrong species. He arched an eyebrow, his amusement growing. And you're certain of this? Oh, please, she scoffed, rolling her eyes. If they were real werewolves, you'd have smelled them a mile away. Their stench doesn't exactly blend in. She delivered the line with a faint smirk, her tone so blunt it teetered on the edge of disrespect. And you know this because. Caius' glare was murderous, his lips curled back in a sneer. Alara didn't even flinch. Instead, she shrugged as if the question wasn't worth the effort it took to answer. Because I actually pay attention. Unlike some people, I don't need everything spoon-fed to me. She shot him a pointed look. Carlyle stepped in quickly, his voice calm but firm, hoping to diffuse the tension. Alara is right, Aro. These shapeshifters are not children of the moon. They pose no threat to us or to our laws. Aro raised a single brow, the faintest glimmer of amusement lighting his otherwise inscrutable expression. A fascinating distinction, Carlyle. But one must wonder if they walk, howl, and hunt like wolves, what difference does it truly make? Unable to help herself, Alara let out a soft snort, drawing Aro's attention. Well, Aro, she interjected with a smirk, it's like saying a house cat and a lion are the same because they both purr and have tails. Slightly different threat levels, don't you think? Aro's gaze flicked to her, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes, though he maintained his formal posture. Ah, Alara, he replied, his voice mild. Though your point does seem beside the larger issue. Oh no, please continue, she said, gesturing with a mocking flourish. I'm all ears. Can't wait to hear more about how terrifying these oversized puppies are. You find this amusing? Our very laws are being threatened by their mere existence, and yet you would jest. Caius's mouth twisted into a sneer, his gaze cutting toward her. Alara shrugged, crossing her arms with a nonchalant smile. I mean, a little. You're talking about laws like they're carved in stone. Maybe they could use a bit of revising. Her eyes sparkled with humor as she looked back at Aro. Besides, it's not like these puppies are lining up to tear down the Volturi throne. Aro's expression remained serene, though his tone carried a subtle, almost parental reproach. Laws, dear Alara, exist to ensure the survival and harmony of our kind. They are not the sort of thing one adjusts on a whim. Oh sure, Alara responded, waving a hand dismissively. Of course, you're only protecting everyone's best interests. Her voice dripped with sarcasm as she looked at the Cullens. But hey, let's not let pesky little details like, facts get in the way. Amit snickered softly, his broad grin betraying his amusement, while Edward's sharp warning glance was aimed directly at Alara. His expression clearly conveyed his unease, but she simply winked at him, unfazed and entirely unapologetic. Perhaps you'd like to run the Volturi yourself, Alara? Caius' voice was biting, his irritation barely restrained. Oh darling, I'd rather swallow broken glass, she replied, giving him an exaggeratedly sweet smile. I'm just here for the entertainment, not the politics. But if you're also worried about these shapeshifters, maybe a bit of actual research would do you good. Aro, watching her with a mixture of amusement and exasperation, shook his head slightly, a faint smile lingering. Thank you, Alara. Your unique perspective is always a breath of fresh air. With a mock salute, Alara leaned back against a nearby tree, folding her arms. Happy to help, boss, she replied with a smirk. Can't wait to see how you try to spin this one. Aro's gaze lingered on Alara, his curiosity piqued as he tilted his head slightly, a playful spark in his eyes. You've mentioned, dear Alara, that you despise politics. Yet, you seem remarkably invested in this particular discussion. One might think you enjoy sparring with us over our interpretations of the law. Alara rolled her eyes, folding her arms with a lazy smile. Oh, please. I'm not here for the politics, she shot back. I just can't stand listening to incompetence. Watching you lot try to figure out the difference between shapeshifters and werewolves is like watching someone fail to open a door clearly marked at push. Caius' face contorted in fury, his lips curling as he stepped forward. Incompetence? He sneered, his tone venomous. Mind your tongue, girl. You tread dangerously close to insubordination. Alara is simply direct, Caius. Perhaps we could focus on the matter at hand. Carlyle interjected, attempting to smooth over the building tension. But Alara wasn't done. Exactly. Incompetence. She chimed in, ignoring Carlyle's attempt to de-escalate. If the Volturi want to play judge, jury and executioner, the least you could do is be competent about it. Your lack of restraint is refreshing, Alara, even if your views are somewhat unorthodox. Aro chuckled, clearly entertained by the fiery exchange. A tense silence hung in the air after Alara's sharp retort, with Caius fuming visibly, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were nearly white. The Volturi guard shifted uneasily, caught between their loyalty to the Aro and Marcus, and the barely restrained hostility radiating from Caius. Alara met Caius' glare with a smug, unapologetic smile, clearly enjoying the tension her words had stirred. Aro, however, was thoroughly entertained, his eyes gleaming with amusement as he watched the interplay. Now, he said smoothly, stepping slightly between Caius and Alara, a slight smile gracing his lips. I believe we are veering off course, are we not? Our dear Alara's forthrightness is simply a testament to her passion for clarity. Passion for clarity? Caius spat, unable to contain himself any longer. This insolence is no passion for truth, it's sheer disrespect. Oh, Caius, lighten up, Alara drawled, raising her brows. If you're that insecure about a few honest observations, maybe you should rethink your job. A flash of rage crossed Caius's face, but Aro's hand on his shoulder held him back. Aro's voice remained calm, though a hint of steel crept in. Enough, Caius. He murmured, his tone a quiet warning. Alara's presence here serves a purpose, even if her methods are unconventional. He turned to Alara, his gaze intent. And you, dear Alara, might remember that with purpose comes a certain decorum. Alara rolled her eyes but shrugged nonchalantly, as if the entire interaction was a mild inconvenience. Fine. I'll play niece for now. But let's not pretend we're all here to play niece. Isn't there a bigger issue at hand? Carlyle inclined his head, maintaining his calm demeanor. I understand your caution, Aro, but I would urge you to consider the evidence at hand. The shapeshifters have never acted without provocation. If we continue down this path of suspicion, we risk turning a neutral party into an adversary. Surely that is not in anyone's interest. Aro steepled his fingers, considering Carlyle's words. And yet their numbers are growing, are they not? He inquired, his tone deceptively mild. Surely you understand why the Volturi might find such growth concerning. Carlyle nodded slowly, his expression calm but resolute. That is true, Aro. Their ability to shift is triggered by the presence of vampires. However, it's important to recognize that this is a defense mechanism, not an act of aggression. Their powers only come to fruition when vampires are in close proximity, which is why our presence in Forks has allowed the newer generation to shift. It's a reaction to what they perceive as a threat. Without us or any other vampires near their territory, they would remain dormant, living as humans. The increase in their numbers directly correlates to our presence, not to any agenda of expansion or hostility. Edward added. But the unknown always harbor potential danger, does it not? Would it not be prudent to err on the side of caution? Aro's lips curved into a polite smile. His gaze shifted to Alice, his polite smile remaining in place, though his tone carried a subtle edge. My dear Alice, surely you've seen their movements? Their intentions? He extended his hand toward her, his pale fingers beckoning with a deliberate slowness. Come now, what secrets have your visions revealed? Alice hesitated, her golden eyes flickering to Edward briefly before returning to Aro. Her posture stiffened and her usual confidence seemed to falter. Their intentions remain the same. They wish only to protect their own. She said cautiously, her voice quieter than usual. Aro's brow arched, his smile sharpening into something more predatory. Is that so? Then why the hesitation, dear? Surely there is no need for uncertainty. He took a measured step closer, his hand still outstretched. Something wrong, Alice? Edward stepped protectively closer to his sister. Aro, she's answered your question. There's no need for further prodding. Aro's gaze flicked to Edward, the smile never leaving his face. But my curiosity remains unsatisfied, Edward. Surely you understand my desire to see things as she does. His eyes returned to Alice, now gleaming with a quiet intensity. Or perhaps there is something you wish to keep hidden from me. Alice's shoulders stiffened under Aro's probing gaze, and her golden eyes darted briefly to Edward again before lowering. She shifted uncomfortably, her voice quieter than usual. I can't see their future. The clearing fell silent, the weight of her admission hanging heavily in the air. Aro's smile faltered for the briefest of moments before returning, though his expression now carried a touch of intrigue. You cannot see their future? He repeated, his tone deceptively light. How curious. Caius' voice broke the silence, laced with suspicion. Convenient, isn't it? The one creature we cannot fully understand just so happens to be shielded from the most reliable gift among you. Alice bristled but kept her composure as she responded, it's not a matter of convenience, Caius. Their nature, whatever it is, simply doesn't allow me to see their paths. I've tried countless times. It's like they're outside the scope of my gift. Aro stepped closer, his hands clasped behind his back now, his voice soft yet pointed. And when, may I ask, did you first discover this limitation? Was it recently or has it always been so? She hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly toward Carlyle before she answered. From the beginning. I've never been able to see their future. It's not new and it hasn't changed. Their kind is different. Edward interjected. Aro, you must understand this isn't a deliberate omission or a fault of Alice's gift. The shapeshifters exist outside her visions. Their actions are unpredictable to us, but that doesn't make them a threat. Unpredictable is precisely what makes them a threat. Caius scoffed, his lip curling. Tanya, her expression hardening, stepped forward. or it makes them free from manipulation. She countered sharply. Something your kind has grown too accustomed to. Otto raised a hand, silencing Caius before he could retort. His gaze remained fixed on Alice, though his tone softened. No need for such hostility, my dear ones. I merely seek to understand. After all, knowledge is our greatest ally and ignorance, our greatest weakness. She straightened, her confidence returning in the face of Otto's calculated charm. If I could see their future, I would share it, Otto. But I can't. All I can tell you is that their actions have always been defensive, not aggressive. Beyond that, you'll have to rely on your own judgment. Otto inclined his head slightly as if accepting her words, though his expression remained thoughtful. Then it would seem, dear Alice, that the unknown once again presents us with an opportunity for discovery. How delightful. His polite smile sharpened, a flicker of amusement dancing in his crimson eyes. I suppose it is in my best interest to see if you are telling the truth about this, he said, his hand still extended toward Alice as he took a measured step forward. The subtle movement rippled through the Volturi, their coven instinctively mirroring his advance. Caius's lips twitched into a predatory smirk, while Jane and Alec exchanged a brief glance, their expressions unreadable. Felix and Demetri shifted their stances, their towering forms imposing as they loomed just behind their masters. Alice remained still, her gaze steady despite the faint tightening of her jaw. She glanced quickly to Carlyle, her confidence flickering. I have no reason to lie to you, Otto. Everything I've told you is true. Edward stepped closer to his sister, his body angled protectively. His voice was cool and composed, but there was a sharp edge to his words. Otto, Alice's gift doesn't function in absolutes. Her limitations with the shapeshifters are no fabrication. You were more than capable of verifying that with your unique talents. Surely, Otto, you must see that Alice has no motive to deceive you. We all stand by her words. Esm finally spoke up. Otto tilted his head, his expression softening, though his hand remained outstretched. Ah, dear Esm, I would never presume to accuse Alice of deceit. However, I am thorough, if nothing else. He turned his focus back to Alice, his tone almost fond. You understand, of course. We must leave no stone unturned in matters of such importance. Alice's shoulders stiffened, her gaze locking onto Otto's hand. She hesitated for a long moment, her breath unnecessary but caught nonetheless, before slowly extending her own hand toward him. If it will put this matter to rest, then fine. As their fingers brushed, Otto's face lit with an unsettling delight, his grip firm yet deceptively gentle as he closed the connection. His eyes fluttered shut, his expression one of absolute focus. The clearing seemed to hold its breath as the tension thickened, every gaze locked on the two of them. After a moment, Otto opened his eyes, his smile returning, though his expression was inscrutable. He released Alice's hand with a theatrical sigh. Ah, how fascinating it is to see the world through your eyes, Alice. Your truth is undeniable. The faintest trace of relief flickered across Alice's face, but Otto wasn't finished. His gaze swept back to the rest of the room, his tone deceptively light. And yet, the void where these creatures' futures should reside, it is a curious thing, is it not? One might even say unnerving. Caius sneered, stepping forward. A convenient void, I'd say. One we would do well to extinguish before it grows larger. Otto, you've confirmed what Alice has said. Surely now we can focus on ensuring peace, rather than stoking unwarranted fears. Carlyle's voice rang out, cutting through the mounting tension. Otto inclined his head slightly, his hands folding behind his back. Indeed, Carlyle. Peace is always a worthy pursuit provided it is not pursued at the expense of prudence. His smile lingered, enigmatic and unsettling, as his gaze flickered to Marcus and Caius. The tense silence was broken by a low, sarcastic chuckle. Alara, leaning casually against a tree, crossed her arms and tilted her head, her smirk impossible to miss. You know, Otto, for someone so thorough, it's impressive how much you manage to complicate a situation that doesn't need it. All eyes turned to her, the weight of the Volturi's collective gaze settling heavily on her shoulders. If she noticed or cared, she didn't show it. Alara. Carlyle murmured, his tone cautionary. But Alara wasn't about to back down. She pushed away from the tree and took a step forward, gesturing lazily toward Alice. You just heard everything Alice has to say. You've rummaged through her head like it's your favorite pastime, because let's face it, it is. And what did you find? Nothing new. Nothing dangerous. Just the same story we've all been telling you since this started. Otto's smile froze, though his eyes glinted with amusement. Ah, dear Alara, your candor is as refreshing as ever. But surely you understand. She cut him off with a raised hand, her voice dripping with mock politeness. Oh, I understand. You've got to play your little game, flex your power, make sure we all know who's in charge. But let's be honest, you're not really concerned about the shapeshifters. You're just bored. Stirring the pot because it's been a slow century. You dare? Caius's snarl was instantaneous, his voice a venomous growl. Yes, Caius, I dare, Alara interrupted, her tone sweet as sugar. She turned to him with a grin that could rival Jane's malice. If anyone knows how to make a mountain out of a molehill, it's you. Alara. Edward said sharply, his voice laced with warning, but she held up a finger, silencing him. I mean, really, she continued, turning her attention back to Aro. If this is how you plan to spend eternity, endlessly poking and prodding over things that don't even matter, then I feel sorry for you. Must be exhausting, trying to find monsters in every shadow. A chuckle escaped Emmett, who quickly stifled it under a stern look from Esme. Caius, meanwhile, looked ready to lunge, but Aro, his amusement now tempered with an edge, kept his composure. Alara. He said softly, his tone both amused and vaguely warning, if you find yourself so captivated by our pursuits, perhaps you might find a more permanent place among us. Alara scoffed, unperturbed. Oh, you'd love that, wouldn't you? She gestured grandly, mimicking Aro's deliberate theatrics with an exaggerated flourish of her own. Another addition to your collection. How quaint. Her eyes darted to the group of vampires gathered behind Aro, standing silently like statues, their gazes locked on her. Her lips twitched with amusement as she leaned slightly to peer over his shoulder. Though, she added, her tone dripping with mock sincerity, it seems your display is looking quite full already. Do you even have room for me? Maybe you'll have to build an annex. A snort of laughter escaped her as she straightened up, arms still crossed. The corner of Aro's mouth twitched, his amusement deepening despite himself. I assure you, Karamia, space is of no concern. For you, we would make ample accommodations. Of course you would. Alara quipped, a teasing lilt to her voice. Before anyone could add to the moment, Aro smoothly redirected the conversation, his gaze turning back to the Cullens. His tone shifted, regaining its usual polished charm, as though the prior tension had evaporated entirely. Very well. He said, his hand sweeping through the air with deliberate elegance, as though dismissing any lingering discord. Consider your alliance with the shapeshifters noted, but for now tolerated. We shall watch. His lips curled faintly, with interest. Carlyle inclined his head graciously, visibly relieved. Thank you, Aro. We appreciate your understanding. Understanding? Aro repeated softly, almost to himself, his voice laced with subtle amusement. Oh, Carlyle, do not mistake tolerance for understanding. But for the sake of peace we shall allow this arrangement to stand. For now. The underlying warning in Aro's words hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable, as Alara watched the exchange with quiet intrigue. Aro turned gracefully, his movements deliberate and fluid as he addressed the Volturi with a voice that resonated through the clearing. We will not fight today, he announced, the finality in his words tempered by a subtle edge of caution. His crimson eyes swept over his coven, lingering momentarily on Caius, whose expression twisted with barely restrained disapproval. The clearing remained thick with tension, the air crackling as Aro's smooth words attempted to settle the unrest. Yet, the tension only deepened as Caius turned sharply, his fury barely restrained, and addressed the guards. Bring forth the informant. He commanded, his tone a venomous snarl. The guards moved with practiced efficiency, and within moments, Irina was dragged forward. Her ashen face darted between the Volturi and the Cullens, panic evident in her trembling form. Caius's eyes bored into her, cold and unrelenting. These wolves you saw. Caius's voice was laced with contempt, the words slicing through the clearing like a blade. Are they the children of the moon? Irina swallowed, glancing nervously from Caius to Aro and then to the Cullens. I'm not sure, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The uncertainty in her gaze was plain. Caius' lips curled into a merciless sneer. Jane. At the sound of her name, Jane's eyes lit with a cruel eagerness, and Irina gasped, the realization dawning on her like a blow. Wait. She cried out, a tremor of desperation in her voice. I was wrong. They aren't children of the moon. They're different. Oh, so now she figures it out. Alara remarked dryly from the sidelines, her arms crossed as she watched with a mix of disdain and dark amusement. Took her long enough. Caius's glare bore into Irina, his voice cold and unyielding. So you bring us false information, he sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. You drag us here with claims of children of the moon, only to reveal you have no idea what you're talking about. I thought I didn't know, Irina stammered, her words a frantic tumble as she glanced pleadingly toward the Cullens. Thought? You thought? Caius interrupted, his voice rising with disgust. Your incompetence has wasted our time and insulted our authority. Typical. Alara interjected with a scoff, rolling her eyes. One little mistake and it's torches and pitchforks. Ever heard of a slap on the wrist, Caius? Her lies brought us here under false pretenses. Were we supposed to tolerate this level of disrespect and incompetence? Caius's head snapped toward her, his expression murderous. Incompetence? Sure, she made a mistake, but last I checked, honest errors weren't a crime. Or does your precious Volturi reputation need a regular blood sacrifice to stay intact? Alara raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. A dangerous silence settled over the clearing as Caius's gaze turned lethal, his fists clenched in fury. Mind your tongue, Alara, he hissed, his voice barely controlled. Your defiance grows tiresome. Funny. Alara shot back. I thought your double standards grew tiresome ages ago. She gave a nonchalant shrug, casting a quick, unimpressed glance at Felix, who was ready to step forward on Caius' order. Alara. Aro murmured, his tone calm but edged with warning. Let us not escalate matters unnecessarily. This is neither the time nor the place. Alara sighed, waving a hand dismissively. Fine, fine. Don't let me stop you from enacting your justice. She gestured loosely toward Irina, her sarcasm biting. Caius turned back to Irina, his expression sharp with cruel satisfaction. Your reckless words have consequences, he said coldly. With a slight nod, he signaled Felix.
Felix stepped forward, his movements precise and merciless as he grabbed hold of Irina, tearing her apart in brutal efficiency.
As the flames began to rise, consuming the remains of Irina, a pained, heart-wrenching cry pierced the air. Irina?
Tanya's voice was filled with anguish, and before anyone could react, both she and Kate surged forward, fury blazing in their eyes as they charged toward the Volturi with reckless abandon.
Garrett, quick to act, grabbed hold of Kate's arm, trying to restrain her. Kate, don't. He urged, his grip firm even as she struggled against him, her rage threatening to spill over. But her eyes remained locked on the Volturi, unyielding in her anger. Tanya, Kate, stop. Edward's voice rang out with urgency, his head snapping towards Zafrina. Zafrina, no. In an instant, Zafrina's eyes darkened with concentration, her power extending over the clearing as both Kate and Tanya suddenly stumbled, their vision stolen by her gift. Blind and disoriented, they faltered, their attacks brought to an abrupt halt. What?
Tanya's hands groped blindly, her rage morphing into confusion as she struggled to orient herself, her movements hesitant as she tried to make sense of the sudden darkness.
Kate, though blinded, continued to pull against Garrett's grip, her body tense with frustration as she realized the power of Zafrina's influence. The clearing pulsed with tension as Alara observed the scene with narrowed eyes, her posture lazy but her expression dripping with thinly veiled mockery. All this pomp and posturing over a misunderstanding. She quipped, her voice slicing through the air with biting sarcasm. Is apologizing against the rules in Volturi land, or is it just not dramatic enough for you lot?
A glare, sharp as a blade, came from Caius, his fury vibrating just beneath the surface.
You tread dangerously close to insolence, he hissed, each word cold and venomous. Close. The sweetness of her tone was laced with sharp edges. Funny, I thought I'd already crossed the line. Guess I'll try harder next time. The stillness of Aro's raised hand interrupted the brewing storm. His eyes glimmered faintly with amusement, tempered by quiet authority as he stepped in to diffuse the tension. Alara. His voice, as smooth as silk, carried a calm but unyielding command. Let us not add fuel to the fire. Some matters are better left to rest. The smirk on her lips didn't waver as she tilted her head. Resting it is. She said breezily, though her tone betrayed no hint of concession. A cheeky glance at Caius ensured her final word landed before she stepped back, her stance still loose and unshaken. The air was thick with unspoken tension as Carlyle seized the moment to interject. This is unnecessary. Irina was mistaken, but this. Some mistakes. Caius interrupted, his voice icy, carry heavier consequences. Alara's exaggerated eye roll made no effort to be subtle. Well, if that isn't the Volturi motto, mistakes have consequences, blah blah. Her annoyed glance landed squarely on Caius. Tell me, Caius, does tearing people apart make you feel better about yourself, or is it just part of the job description? The sharp twist in his expression betrayed Caius's barely contained fury. Before he could respond, Aro moved between them, his hand raised in a gesture of restraint. Enough. He commanded. As his gaze shifted to Alara, it softened ever so slightly, though the edge of warning remained. Your insights are always invigorating, dear Alara. But perhaps it's time to save them for another occasion. But you're the one that invited me. She countered, her voice light and lilting, as if she were pointing out the obvious. With a casual shrug she added, guess I'll just save my applause for later. Seizing the moment, Carlyle's voice regained the room, steady but taut with the strain of diplomacy. Aro, we do not wish to escalate this further. Irina acted out of misunderstanding, not malice. Surely her punishment does not need to extend to the rest of her family. The thoughtful incline of Aro's head conveyed the weight of Carlyle's words as though he were carefully unspooling them in his mind. Rest assured, Carlyle. He replied smoothly, his ever-present smile delicate but distant, the Volturi do not seek unnecessary bloodshed. Could have fooled me. Alara muttered, her tone dry. Aro ignored the jab, turning his gaze to the Cullens and the Denalis, his tone almost gentle. Then let us put an end to this matter here. But let it be a reminder to all, misunderstandings and false accusations carry weight. Let us not allow such errors to endanger our delicate peace. Ah, yes, a delicate peace. Alara drawled. But let's be honest, this whole spectacle only sets one precedent: don't come forward with information unless you're absolutely, perfectly certain. Because, heaven forbid. She added with a mocking glance at Caius, someone makes a mistake and ends up as kindling. A flicker of unease rippled through the ranks of the Cullen clan, Denali Coven, and the Wolfpack, their expressions tense as they exchanged wary glances. The weight of Aro's words seemed to hang heavy in the air, but the tension only deepened as Caius's skull darkened further, his fury simmering just beneath the surface. Alara raises a thought-provoking point. Aro said smoothly, his tone neutral but his gaze sharper, calculating. We are indeed an authority to be trusted, not feared. And as such, we must ensure that our judgment do not discourage honesty. Honesty? Interesting choice of words, Alara remarked, her voice laced with sarcasm. I'm sure that's exactly what Irina was thinking. Iggy, I better tell the Volturi, they're so understanding. Caius' glare turned murderous as he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air like ice. You speak as though you are above judgment, Alara. Perhaps you believe yourself untouchable? Oh, I don't think I'm above it, Caius. She replied, her voice steady. I just have the guts to call out the hypocrisy. You want obedience, not honesty. The clearing fell into a tense silence, the Volturi guard bristling at her audacity. Caius' glare burned with fury, his fists clenched at his sides, but before he could retaliate, Aro's soft chuckle broke through the tension, startling everyone. Such refreshing candor. Aro murmured, his tone warm with amusement yet edged with intrigue. He nodded thoughtfully as though weighing her words. Perhaps we have indeed made our stance appear too severe. Caius turned to Aro, disbelief etched deeply into his sharp features. Severe? He repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. The tension in his stance radiated through the room, but Aro didn't so much as flinch. Instead, he ignored his brother's simmering frustration, allowing the moment to settle before addressing the gathered vampires. His faint smile returned, a calculated mixture of reassurance and unyielding authority. Let this be a lesson to us all. Aro said, his voice smooth and commanding, carrying the weight of centuries of rule. Honesty without fear should be the ideal we strive for. The Volturi exist to protect our way of life, not to punish without just cause. As the words left his lips, his gaze lingered deliberately on Alara, the pointed look unmistakable. The subtle shift in his expression, just the faintest flicker of acknowledgement, was not lost on her. Glad I could help, she quipped. She tilted her head slightly, casting one last mocking glance at Caius, who was visibly seething in silence. Just doing my part to uphold justice. The sharp intake of breath from Caius was audible, his fury palpable as his icy glare bored into her. Yet he remained silent, the restraint evident in the tense line of his shoulders and the rigid set of his jaw. Aro's gaze returned to Alara, his expression softening slightly. Beneath his composed exterior, a glimmer of what might have been admiration flickered briefly in his crimson eyes before he turned away, addressing the group once more. The silence was broken by Tanya stepping forward, her face etched with grief and fury. Her voice trembled with emotion as she addressed Aro directly. You call this justice? She demanded, her tone sharp yet heavy with heartbreak. Her golden eyes blazed with intensity as they met Aro's. Irina was our family and you destroyed her without a second thought. That wasn't justice, that was cruelty. A flicker of discomfort crossed Aro's face, quickly masked by his usual calm. Her actions, though unintended, placed many lives at risk. Such risks cannot be dismissed lightly, Tanya. You understand this, surely? His tone was soft, almost consoling, but there was no mistaking the iron beneath it. Garrett stepped up beside Tanya, his stance protective, his voice ringing out with defiance. It's easy to preach about justice when you're the one swinging the sword. But you didn't have to live with what you've taken from her family. You call it necessary, we call it barbaric. The clearing tensed, eyes flicking between the Volturi and the Denalis, the weight of Garrett's accusation hanging heavily in the air. Aro's faint smile faltered, though his voice remained composed. Strong words, young Garrett, he mused, his tone deceptively light. Yet I suspect you know little of the weight that comes with ruling. He focused his attention back on Tanya. Justice is never easy, dear Tanya, he replied, his tone gentle yet firm, every word precisely chosen. But it is necessary. Let us not forget that she endangered us all with her misinformation. Oh, sure. Alara muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Can't go risking the Volturi's delicate peace over something as trivial as honesty. Caius's glare snapped to her, his fury reignited, but before he could act, Aro raised a hand, halting him. Alara. Aro said smoothly, his voice still friendly but edged with warning. While I value your perspective, let us not forget that respect is essential to maintaining order. Respect is earned, not enforced. Alara replied, her tone flippant. And from where I'm standing, there's not a lot of earning going on here. From the Cullen side, Emmett let out a quiet snicker, which he quickly stifled when Edward shot him a warning look.
Edward's own wary glance flicked to Alara, silently urging her to back down, but she met his look with an unapologetic smirk, clearly unfazed.
Caius's restraint finally snapped, his voice slicing through the clearing like a blade. You truly believe yourself untouchable, don't you? He sneered, stepping forward, his glare icy and lethal. Perhaps you need a reminder of who commands respect here. Alara rolled her eyes, unfazed by his fury. Oh, please, Caius. You can throw all the tantrums you want, it doesn't make your logic any less flawed. This isn't about respect, it's about control, and you're just mad because you're not getting it. With a low growl, Caius moved as if to lunge, but Aro's hand shot out to his chest, halting him with surprising force. Now, Caius. Aro chided softly, amusement mingling with warning in his tone. We wouldn't want to leave a poor impression on our audience, would we? Oh, heavens, Caius. Wouldn't want to break that carefully crafted reputation, would you? Alara gave an exaggerated gasp, holding a hand to her chest.
A few of the Cullens stifled smirks, though Tanya's and Kate's faces remained hardened with grief and fury, their eyes flicking between Caius and Alara as tension simmered.
Garrett, standing close to Kate, tightened his grip on her shoulder, as if ready to jump into the fray if things escalated further. Caius turned his venomous glare toward the Cullens, his rage redirected with the precision of a blade. These pathetic alliances of yours. He spat, his tone dripping with contempt. Consorting with shapeshifters, rebelling against our laws, challenging our authority, you edge closer to ruin with every step. Edward stepped forward. If ruin is defined by standing up to hypocrisy and cruelty, then perhaps it's a risk we are willing to take. His tone was measured, but the defiance in his words struck like a spark in the volatile tension. Alara let out a soft chuckle, her grin widening. See? Even he gets it, she said, gesturing toward Edward with mock enthusiasm. And he's got that holistic uphisarceral flower vibe going on. Progress. The clearing seemed to crackle with tension as the Volturi guard bristled at the boldness emanating from the Olympic Coven side. Their postures grew stiff, crimson eyes narrowing, the air between the two groups thick with barely restrained hostility. Felix clenched his fists, the motion deliberate and menacing, his gaze locking onto Alara like a predator zeroing in on prey. His stance shifted, muscles coiling as if preparing to spring at the slightest provocation. Jane's smile twisted into something dark and gleeful, her delight at the chaos unfolding written plainly across her face. Her eyes flickered to Aro briefly, as if seeking silent permission to act, while her fingers twitched in anticipation, the threat of her power lingering unspoken but felt by all. I will not stand here and be mocked by insubordinate fools. Caius cast a venomous glance at Aro, barely containing his frustration. If we refuse to act now, we risk being seen as weak. And I, for one, refuse to let the Volturi be undermined. Aro's expression remained composed, though his faint smile carried a hint of amusement. Your passion is admirable, Caius. He said coolly, but do not mistake rashness for strength. True power lies in control, not chaos. Alara snorted, unable to hold back. Could have fooled me. Chaos seems to be the Volturi's favorite hobby. Before anyone could respond, Jane's eyes gleamed as she turned toward Alara, clearly fed up with her constant jabs. Would you like to test the limits of that attitude, Alara? She sneered, her voice soft but laced with menace. Perhaps a taste of my gift would humble you. Alara's grin widened, fearless as her gaze locked on Jane. Oh, please. I've heard all about your gift, you don't scare me. Honestly, it'd be the most interesting thing to happen all day. Emmett let out a booming laugh, unable to contain himself despite the tension in the room. I gotta admit, I'd pay to see that. Alara versus Jane, who's got the better bite? His grin stretched wide, clearly enjoying his own joke. Emmett? Esm's voice was sharp but quiet, her disapproval cutting through the charged atmosphere. She shot him a warning look, her usual gentle expression replaced with rare sternness. This is not the time for jokes. Emmett, enough. Your levity isn't helping.
Carlisle's gaze carried the weight of the seriousness the situation demanded, and though his voice remained calm, it left no room for argument.
Emmett raised his hands in mock surrender, his grin faltering slightly. All right. Just trying to lighten the mood. He glanced toward Alara with a wink. Jane's face twisted further, her crimson eyes narrowing as her fury threatened to boil over. Her fingers twitched, the promise of pain just moments from being unleashed, but before she could act, Aro's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Jane. He said, his tone soft but unyielding, carrying the quiet authority that only centuries of rule could command. His sharp gaze pinned her in place. There will be no demonstrations today. We are, after all, here to maintain peace. But she's mocking us, Master Aro, Jane hissed, her eyes blazing. Surely you see the disrespect? Alara rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, Jane. If a little sarcasm gets under your skin, maybe you should reconsider your career path. The guard tensed and Felix took a step forward, clearly itching to intervene, but Aro stepped forward before she could retort. His gaze lingered on Alara, both amused and weary. Alara, your penchant for defiance is nothing short of remarkable. And while I admire your spirit, I would remind you that even the boldest among us must respect the balance. Balance, huh? Funny word coming from someone who's just as happy tipping the scales whenever it suits him. This insolence will not be tolerated, Aro. We cannot allow her to undermine us. Caius clenched his jaw, visibly reaching the end of his patience. Oh, you think I'm the problem? Alara shot back, her voice rising. Maybe if you didn't act like tyrants, you wouldn't have people questioning your authority. Carlyle stepped forward, attempting to mediate before things spiraled further. Please, Aro, Caius, Alara, this hostility is unnecessary. We all want peace. Alara sighed dramatically, raising her hands in mock surrender. All right. I'll play niece. For now. Jane's fingers curled once more, but Aro's gaze flicked to her, and she stilled instantly, her lips pressing into a tight line. Peace, Jane, Aro said, his voice softening but retaining its authority. We must rise above such provocations. Is that not what we teach our guard? Jane nodded stiffly, though her glare remained locked on Alara. Of course, Master, she said through clenched teeth, the promise of vengeance glinting in her eyes. Aro nodded slowly, his gaze finally shifting to Carlyle with something resembling respect. Indeed, Carlyle. Perhaps cooler heads must prevail. He shot a pointed look at both Caius and Alara, who were still glaring daggers at each other. Let us end this discussion now, before any more grievances arise. With a reluctant scowl, Caius stepped back, his anger simmering just beneath the surface, though he seemed to accept Aro's decision, if only barely. Alara, on the other hand, gave a final, exaggerated sigh, crossing her arms with a defiant smirk. Guess that's a wrap then, Alara said dryly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She cast one last look at the Volturi, her expression a playful mix of challenge and amusement. Always a pleasure. Aro turned his attention to Carlyle, his polite smile firmly in place, though his crimson eyes gleamed with quiet calculation. Carlyle. He began, his tone smooth and measured, it seems our business here is concluded. You and your family are free to go along with your allies. His emphasis on the word carried a subtle edge, a reminder of his disapproval. Carlyle inclined his head respectfully, his voice calm but firm. Thank you, Aro. I trust this marks the end of any further conflict between us. Aro's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. For now, he said lightly, as if the words carried no weight. But let this serve as a reminder to all involved. Peace is a delicate thing, easily shattered by misunderstandings. I trust you will all tread carefully. As the tension in the clearing finally began to dissipate, the Cullens and their allies, including the shapeshifters, began their retreat. A wave of relief swept through the group, though it was tempered by an undercurrent of lingering unease. The wolves prowled along the edges of the group, keeping watchful eyes on the Volturi. Just as the group was about to disappear into the trees, Alara's voice rang out, cutting through the tense quiet with a mischievous edge. Hey, wait up! She called, a grin spreading across her face as she sauntered forward. Quick question, can I pet the doggos? The clearing fell into stunned silence for a beat before Emmett choked on a laugh, earning a sharp look from Rosalie. Even Aro raised an intrigued brow, his expression hovering between bemusement and disbelief. Meanwhile, Caius's scowl deepened, his icy glare fixed on Alara as though sheer willpower might silence her antics. One of the wolves, clearly unimpressed, let out a low growl, and Alara raised her hands in mock surrender, her grin unrepentant. What? It's a genuine question. She added, her tone utterly unapologetic. They look so fluffy. Oh, I have to see this. Emmett burst out laughing, clapping his hands together. Wolf Jacob turned to glare at Alara, an annoyed rumble building in his chest. But Alara didn't so much as flinch. She held her ground, one hand outstretched, her grin widening as she winked in his direction. Alara, that's not exactly wise. Edward muttered, shaking his head. Oh, come on, she shot back, eyes sparkling with mischief. They're big, fluffy protectors, I mean, if we're all supposed to get along, what's a little bonding? Jacob continued his glare, but then, to everyone's surprise, he looked over at Seth. With a short, approving nod, he signaled the young wolf, who instantly perked up, his eyes wide with excitement as he padded toward Alara, tail wagging. Alara's grin widened as Seth approached, lowering himself to make it easier for her to reach.
She laughed, dropping to a crouch and running her hand over his thick, soft fur, her eyes alight with mischief.
Well, aren't you just the sweetest giant fluffball, she cooed, but then her tone shifted as she fell into exaggerated baby talk, her voice lilting with pure amusement. Seth let out a pleased huff, practically leaning into her touch, while Jacob rolled his eyes, clearly tolerating this interaction only for Seth's sake. Who's a good boy? She crooned, scratching behind his ears with a smirk. Who's a good boy, huh? You are. Yes, you are. Seth's tail wagged furiously, a pleased huff escaping him as he practically leaned into her touch, soaking up every ounce of attention.
Jacob, watching with a mix of exasperation and reluctant amusement, rolled his eyes, his expression clearly saying, "Only for you, Seth."
Only for you. Emmett doubled over, laughing uncontrollably. I can't believe it, he choked out between laughs. The fierce, intimidating Alara, reduced to baby talk over a wolf. Alara shot him a wink, still scratching Seth's ears as he happily leaned into her hand. What can I say? She replied, still in that overly sweet, sing-song voice. I have a weakness for good boys, isn't that right? She patted Seth's head affectionately. Yes, you're such a good boy. Seth, thoroughly pleased, gave a happy bark before retreating back to Jacob's side, his tail still wagging like mad. Standing, Alara brushed off her hands with a triumphant smirk. Told you I'm a charmer, she announced with mock pride, casting a smug glance at Jacob, whose unimpressed stare screamed you're insufferable. Jacob shook his head and let out a long huffing sigh before leading the pack away, his irritation evident. The Cullens lingered for a moment, exchanging a few uneasy glances as the Volturi loomed nearby. After quick nods of farewell, they turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Alara standing in the clearing. Alara exhaled a long, heavy sigh, visibly exasperated. This day had taken a wildly unexpected turn. All she'd wanted was a lively skirmish with the newborn army, some excitement, maybe a bit of fun. Now she found herself tangled up in what could only be described as negotiations, if they could even be called that, with the most powerful vampire coven in existence. Her feet shifted, prepared for a dramatic exit, but Otto's soft laughter stopped her in her tracks. It was melodic, unnervingly calm, but carried a weight that seemed to thicken the air around them. Perhaps we could have a private conversation. She hesitated, a mischievous glint flickering to life in her eyes. There was something exhilarating about the danger surrounding her, the way the tension thickened with every look, every word. These weren't just any people, they were vampires, some of the most powerful beings in existence, and the thrill of toying with them was too delicious to resist. She turned back slowly, her gaze settling on Aro with a sly smile, the playfulness in her eyes unmistakable. Would you like to play a game, Aro? She asked, her voice lilting with a challenge, every word dripping with intrigue. Aro's eyes sparkled, his surprise quickly replaced by a look of genuine interest. A glint of intrigue sparking in his dark eyes as he watched Alara approach, every step drawing her closer with a confidence that seemed to amuse him all the more. A game, you say? He replied, his voice soft, as if savoring the idea. And what sort of game might that be? The Volturi guard tensed, their unease palpable as Alara stepped closer, closing the distance between her and the ancient vampire with a confidence that was equal parts unsettling and captivating. She ignored Aro's question, letting the silence stretch taut between them. Her eyes glimmered with mischief as she finally spoke, her voice light but brimming with challenge. We can continue this little conversation of ours, she said, her voice light and casual, if you win. Aro's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners. His mind was already whirring, assessing the nature of this unexpected challenge, but before he could respond, Alara leaned in closer. So close that her breath brushed against his skin, warm and teasing as she whispered into his ear, her voice low and intoxicating. Catch me if you can. Before anyone could react, she stepped back, her grin flashing wider for the briefest of moments. Then, with an unsettling elegance, her form dissolved into a swirling storm of dark, fluttering bats. The creatures burst outward in a chaotic frenzy, their twisting paths fracturing the clearing into jagged shadows, scattering so wildly that even Demetri's sharp gaze faltered. The clearing fell deathly silent, save for the fading rustle of wings disappearing into the distance. Aro's gaze lingered on the spot where Alara had stood, his expression unreadable. Slowly his head tilted upward, his dark eyes tracking the last ghostly trace of her escape. Demetri stepped forward, his stance tense and poised for pursuit, his sharp eyes darting toward Aro, silently awaiting the order. The Volturi guard shifted uneasily, the tension in the air crackling like a storm about to break. But Aro raised a single hand, stopping him in his tracks. His movements were slow, deliberate, as his lips curved into a faint smile. Yet this smile held none of his usual charm, it was something far darker, a glimmer of unrestrained excitement flickering in his eyes like the spark of a match. Oh, Alara, he murmured, his voice low and edged with a predatory hunger. What an exquisite challenge you've given me. The words hung heavy in the clearing, a promise more chilling than any command. And as the last of the bats vanished into the horizon, Aro's smile widened ever so slightly. He turned his head, his piercing gaze cutting through the guard, as if daring them to act without his approval. And then Aro spoke, his voice a velvet whisper that carried across the clearing, sending a ripple of unease through everyone present. Let the game begin. The world was silent here. The kind of silence that only deep wilderness could provide, no hum of electricity, no distant rumble of cars, just the whisper of wind through the leaves and the occasional rustle of an animal moving unseen below. Alara sat perched in the wooden structure she'd built high within the canopy, her legs dangling off the edge. It was crude but sturdy, something she had thrown together more for necessity than comfort. The height gave her the perfect vantage point over the endless stretch of forest, and more importantly, kept her out of reach from anything or anyone that might come looking. But no one had. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Since she had issued her challenge to Aro with a smirk and a teasing glint in her eyes. 2 weeks of nothing. No Volturi. No sign of pursuit. No game to play. And yet the knot in her chest wouldn't go away. It had started as a whisper of discomfort, something she could ignore, brush off as restlessness. But over time it had tightened, coiling deep inside her like something waiting to unravel. It made her antsy, irritable, like her skin didn't fit right. She had moved from place to place, tried running, tried distracting herself, but no matter how far she went, how deep into the wilderness she hid, it followed. She didn't know why. She didn't know what. But she felt it. A pull she couldn't place. A weight pressing against her ribs, like something was missing, something she should know but didn't. And the worst part? It was only getting worse. Alara exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the platform. Get a grip. She was fine. This was just stress. That was it. It had to be. But deep down, in the quiet corners of her mind, she wasn't so sure. Her bats had been watchful, their sharp little minds attuned to any unusual presence, but there had been no trace of the dark cloaked figures that once loomed at the edge of her world. No shifting shadows in the trees, no fleeting glimpses of crimson eyes in the night. Nothing. Alara leaned her head back against the wooden frame of her treehouse, her gaze fixed on the endless stretch of sky peeking through the canopy above. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves, but it wasn't enough to quiet her thoughts. She had sworn to never get involved in things that didn't concern her. That had been her golden rule. No attachments. No sides. No entanglements that could lead her down the same blood-stained path she had walked before. And yet, she had stood in that field. She had lured the newborns in with a song. She had shown the governing coven of vampires what she was capable of. She had felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the kind of tension that could snap and send bodies crashing into one another in a violent storm of teeth and claws. The Volturi had come expecting to pass judgment, and the Cullens had been prepared to fight for their own. And somehow, Alara had been right there in the middle of it. How the hell did I let that happen? She had always had a problem keeping her mouth shut, but this was different. She had walked into that standoff, felt the weight of the Volturi's scrutiny and provoked them. She could still hear the sharpness in her own voice, the biting edge to her words when she had mocked Aro, challenged Caius, scoffed at their authority like she had every right to do so. And when she was done with the newborns, had she taken the opportunity to slip away, to let them resolve their own issues? No. Of course not. When the dust had settled and they had invited her to stay, she had done the one thing she swore she would never do. She had accepted. Like a damn idiot. She had let herself get involved. Let herself be pulled in, tangled up despite knowing better. And before she knew it, she had done more than just stand on the sidelines. She had spoken. Mocked. Challenged. She had felt the weight of the Volturi's scrutiny press down on her, suffocating, crushing, and yet she had smiled. Alara let out a sharp breath, rubbing a hand over her face. Smiled. She had been cocky. Reckless. Reckless like before. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, willing the memories to stay buried. But they clawed at the edges of her mind, just out of reach, taunting her with ghosts of the past. There had been a time when she had been like that all the time. When she didn't care what she said or to whom, or what the consequences were. When she had thought herself untouchable, invincible, as if the world could burn around her and she would still be standing. But people had burned instead. Innocent people. And no matter how many years passed, no matter how far she ran, their screams still followed her. She exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down her face. 2 weeks ago, she had invited the Volturi to come for her. The words had left her lips before she could think better of it, before she could stop the old version of herself from roaring to the surface and taking control. Catch me if you can. The challenge had felt good at the time, the thrill of defiance making her feel like she was someone else, someone who still had the audacity to laugh in the face of power. She had said it without thinking, letting old arrogance slip past her lips like a reflex, like she was still the girl who didn't care, who didn't regret, who didn't. Alara swallowed hard, forcing the thought away. Because that girl had gotten people killed. The wind shifted. It was subtle, a barely there change in the air, but Alara felt it. The kind of shift that meant something was near watching. She froze, every sense sharpening. Her bats, usually restless in the branches above, had gone eerily still. A warning. Her first thought was the Volturi. Had they finally come for her? Had they finally tracked her down? She had half expected to hear Aro's smooth, unbothered voice drifting through the trees, or the cold bite of Caius's scorn slicing through the quiet. But no one spoke. Instead, there was only silence. A hesitation. Whoever was out there wasn't moving. Alara stayed perfectly still in her treehouse, eyes scanning the dense forest below. The foliage was thick, the trees tangled together in a way that made spotting movement difficult, but she had lived long enough to know when she wasn't alone. And right now, someone was definitely out there. She exhaled slowly.
If you're here to kill me, you're doing a shit job of it, she called out, her voice carrying through the trees.
No response. The air was thick with something skittish. Not Volturi, then. They never hesitated. Alara stood, moving to the edge of her platform, peering down into the undergrowth. The feeling of being watched hadn't faded. In fact, it had only grown stronger. And then, a flicker of movement. A shape, lingering just beyond the tree line. Small. She frowned. That wasn't right. She was miles from civilization. No one should be out here, not unless they had a death wish. And yet she could see her now. A girl.
Alara's brows knit together as the figure finally stepped forward, hesitantly, cautiously, like a wild animal unsure of whether to run or approach.
She was young, too young.
Couldn't have been more than 13 or 14, barefoot, dressed in clothes that were tattered and stained.
Her limbs were thin, her movements uncertain. But it wasn't the dirt-streaked skin or the unnatural paleness that gave her away. It was the eyes. Red. Alara felt something sink in her gut. This wasn't some lost child. This was a vampire. The girl flinched as soon as their eyes met, shrinking back slightly, torn between stepping forward and vanishing back into the trees. Her expression was fearful. Alara had met a lot of vampires in her time, but fearful wasn't usually one of their expressions. She took a slow breath, forcing her body to relax. If the girl was scared, it meant she wasn't a threat, at least, not immediately. Hey, Alara said, keeping her voice even. The girl stiffened. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her shoulders hunched inward. Alara sat down at the edge of the wooden platform. The movement made the girl flinch again, eyes darting to the side like she was preparing to bolt. Relax, Alara said, stopping in place. I'm not gonna hurt you. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe because the kid looked like she expected to be attacked. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, in a voice so quiet Alara almost didn't hear it, the girl whispered, I don't know where to go. Alara's fingers twitched. 2 weeks of solitude. 2 weeks of being left alone. And now, this. A scared, stray vampire on her doorstep. Alara studied the girl more closely. She was young, too young, her limbs thin, her movements cautious but untrained. Her clothes were torn, dirt-streaked, but something about her didn't fit the usual nomad profile. Then there was her fear. Genuine, deep, bone-deep fear. Alara had seen a lot of newborns in her time. Most of them were unstable, feral, and capable of rational thought. But this girl? This girl had been running. Alara's stomach twisted. Where from? She didn't know. Not yet. The girl stood frozen, her red eyes flicking toward the trees, as if half expecting something or someone to come lunging out of the shadows to drag her back. Her fingers twitched, her whole body wound tight, poised between flight and collapse. Alara sighed, more to herself than anything, and patted the wooden floor beside her. Come sit, she said. The girl hesitated. Of course she did. She was like a stray, uncertain if the offered hand was a trick, if the warmth was real or just a momentary kindness before the cruelty set in. Alara didn't push.
She just waited, watching as the girl's breath hitched, a reflex, useless now, but old habits died hard.
Finally, cautiously, she jumped. Bare feet scraped against the wood as she landed on the platform, settling down stiffly at Alara's side. Her hands curled around her knees, her whole frame so tense it looked like a single wrong word might send her bolting into the night. Alara didn't look at her, not directly. She let her gaze drift toward the dark stretch of forest beyond them, where the night air hummed with the distant sounds of nature. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, without turning her head, Alara murmured, Who were you running from? Because she had a feeling the answer mattered. The girl didn't answer right away. She sat stiffly, her red eyes flicking toward the forest as if expecting to see something or someone lurking in the darkness. Alara didn't rush her. She just leaned back against the wooden beams of her treehouse, letting the silence stretch between them, waiting. Finally, the girl swallowed hard and whispered, "Riley." Alara's jaw tightened. Riley. The name slithered through her mind like a phantom. It took her a second to place it, but when she did, the pieces clicked together with a quiet, dreadful certainty. Riley. One of Victoria's pets. One of the ones who had led the newborn army that Alara had burned to the ground. She turned her head slightly, finally looking at the girl beside her. "You were part of that army." It wasn't a question. The girl flinched but didn't deny it. Alara exhaled through her nose, dragging a hand down her face. Shit. She had known there was a chance some of them had run before the fight. Not all newborns were mindless enough to throw themselves into a battle they didn't understand. But she hadn't expected to meet one. Not here, not like this. And yet. She eyed the girl again. She didn't have the air of a soldier. She was too small, too hesitant, too afraid. "You ran," Alara said, not unkindly. The girl hesitated, then gave a jerky nod. Alara clicked her tongue. Smart kid. If she'd stayed, she would have been reduced to ash along with the others. She should have felt something about that. Maybe pity. Maybe guilt. Instead, all she felt was tired. She looked back out at the trees. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated again before answering. "Bree." Alara nodded slowly. "Bree. A name. A person. Not just another pile of ash left in the wake of a fight she shouldn't have been part of." For a moment she didn't know what to say. But then Bree whispered, voice barely audible, "I didn't want to fight." And Alara understood. More than she cared to admit. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Well, Bree. You picked the worst possible place to show up." The girl tensed, but Alara waved a hand lazily. "I don't mean that as a threat," she said. "Just saying you came looking for safety, and I'm probably the worst person to find it with." Bree frowned, confused, and Alara huffed out a dry laugh. "Because really? First the Volturi, now this?" She had spent weeks trying to get away from the mess, and somehow, the mess kept finding her. She should walk away. She should tell the kid she was on her own, that Alara wasn't some kind of savior, that she wasn't going to pick up another stray. Alara sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. This was getting complicated. "Well, kid," she said, voice flat, "if it makes you feel any better, Riley's dead. He was the first one I killed." Bree's breath caught. Her red eyes widened as she stiffened beside Alara. "He's actually dead?" Alara nodded. "And you killed him?" Alara glanced at her, noting the way her fingers clenched around her knees, the way her whole frame trembled, not with hunger, not with anger, but with something else. Shock. "They said you had powers," Bree continued, voice uncertain. "But they made it sound like you weren't a threat. That they were stronger. That he was stronger." Alara huffed out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well. That was their first mistake." Bree swallowed hard, still processing, her gaze flitting toward the trees again, like she half expected Riley to come storming out, furious at her betrayal. Then, barely above a whisper, Bree murmured, "Well then, if Riley is dead, why does it feel like someone is still after me?" Alara paused, the words settling deep in her mind like a stone sinking into dark water. Her gaze flickered toward the forest, scanning the tree line, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. Finally, she sighed. "Probably because someone is," she muttered. "The Volturi, maybe." Bree stiffened, panic flashing across her face. "They." "Relax," Alara said, though she didn't sound particularly reassuring. "If they were here, we'd already know it." But even as she said it, her stomach twisted with unease. Because deep down, she knew. If the Volturi had any suspicion that Bree had survived that massacre, they wouldn't just let it go. Her gaze flickered back to the girl beside her, watching the way she still clutched at her knees, tense, wary, like she expected something worse to come. Alara exhaled sharply. "You didn't watch the fight, did you?" Bree shook her head quickly. "I got near the edge of the forest. I saw you. I ran as soon as Riley attacked. I didn't want to fight, so I just ran. I kept running until I saw." She cut herself off, her whole body going rigid. Alara narrowed her eyes. "Saw what?" Bree's breathing hitched, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The fire." She shivered, as if just saying the word unsettled her. "I saw these giant fireballs falling from the sky. Everything was burning. I didn't stop running. I kept going. I didn't look back." Her fingers dug into her arms, eyes darting to Alara's face, searching for something. Maybe confirmation. Maybe reassurance. Alara just held her gaze, her expression unreadable. She remembered that night. She remembered the heat, the way the flames had swallowed the battlefield, the way the newborns had screamed. She didn't regret it. But looking at Bree now, at the raw fear in her eyes, Alara knew exactly what she had seen. She had witnessed a massacre. And she had survived it. Alara exhaled slowly, looking back out at the tree line. Yeah, she murmured. That was me too. Bree swallowed again, visibly shaken. I didn't think he would actually die, she admitted, voice small. He was so confident. Alara smirked bitterly. Confidence gets people killed. Bree didn't argue. She just sat there, staring at the trees, as if trying to comprehend everything she had once believed was true and everything that had just shattered before her. Alara let the silence settle, let Bree sit with the weight of it all. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves, but neither of them spoke.
Bree's hands were still wrapped tightly around her knees, her posture tense, like she was waiting for something, maybe for Alara to lash out, maybe for herself to wake up from whatever nightmare she thought she was trapped in.
Finally, Alara tilted her head slightly, watching the girl out of the corner of her eye.
Were you here by coincidence? She asked, voice low, steady, or did you seek me out on purpose?
Bree's fingers twitched. She hesitated. And in that hesitation, Alara knew. It hadn't been a coincidence. Bree had been running, yes, but not blindly. She had come here, to the middle of nowhere, miles from civilization, where no human would ever wander by accident. That meant she had been looking for something. Or someone. Bree swallowed hard. She stopped herself, pressing her lips together, eyes darting toward the trees again. Alara didn't push. She just waited. Bree exhaled shakily, her voice barely more than a whisper. I heard them talking before the fight. Some of them. They said, she swallowed again, her throat working around the words. They said you weren't like the others. That you were something different. Alara's brow furrowed slightly. A different how? Bree shook her head. I don't know. Just different. They didn't think you'd be a problem. Thought they were stronger. But she hesitated, then finally turned to look at Alara fully. You weren't supposed to win. Alara's lips curled into a humorless smirk. Yeah, well. I do that sometimes. Bree exhaled through her nose, something between a shaky breath and the ghost of a disbelieving laugh. Alara studied her for a moment, then asked, and that made you want to find me? Bree hesitated again before nodding. I didn't know where else to go, she admitted. And I thought, she looked away. I thought maybe if you survived, you wouldn't kill me just for leaving. Alara blinked. And there it was. Not just fear. Not just uncertainty. Desperation. This girl hadn't just run to save herself. She had run because she knew what happened to newborns who didn't obey. Because someone, probably Riley, probably Victoria, probably both, had made sure she knew what happened to deserters. Alara exhaled slowly, running her tongue over her teeth, thinking. Well, kid, she muttered, half to herself, you really are terrible at making good life choices. Bree stiffened slightly, caught between offense and wariness, but Alara wasn't looking at her. She wasn't sure what to do with this. 2 weeks of solitude. 2 weeks of finally getting away from the mess, from the politics, from the Volturi's scrutiny. And now there was a scared newborn vampire sitting beside her, looking at her like she was the only safe thing left in the world. Alara sighed, running a hand over her face before shifting her gaze back to Bree. You haven't seen any members of the Volturi recently by any chance? It was casual, too casual. Bree stiffened. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her torn clothes, and for a moment, she looked like she regretted every decision that had led her here. Alara's eyes narrowed. That was not the reaction of someone who had no idea what she was talking about. Bree hesitated, licking her lips, then shook her head a little too quickly. No, I mean, not up close. Alara's fingers twitched. Not up close. She didn't like that phrasing. You've seen them then, she said, her voice unreadable. Bree swallowed. Not them, not all of them. But I think I saw one of their guards a few days ago. Maybe longer. Alara stayed very, very still. Where? Bree hesitated again, then reluctantly admitted, a few towns over. I wasn't sure at first, but I mean, they looked like a vampire. Pale, dark cloak, didn't blink. And the way people moved around them, like they knew something was off, even if they didn't know what. Alara's jaw clenched. A Volturi guard. Near here. It didn't confirm anything, not really. The Volturi had eyes everywhere, they could have been passing through, handling something unrelated. But she didn't believe in coincidences. Alara exhaled through her nose, rubbing her temples. Right. And they didn't see you? Bree shook her head. No. I was hiding. Didn't want to take any chances. Smart kid. Alara leaned back, staring up at the canopy, mind racing. It had been 2 weeks. 2 weeks since she had challenged them to come for her. And now, a Volturi guard had been nearby but hadn't approached her. Were they still watching? Were they biding their time? Or had they just written her off completely? For some reason, that last possibility unsettled her the most. Alara let out a big, heavy sigh, throwing her hands up in exasperation, like she had just given up trying to make sense of the situation. Because, really, what the hell was she supposed to do with this kid?
2 weeks of solitude, of keeping her head down, of not getting involved, and now here she was, sitting beside a scared newborn who had sought her out like she was some kind of safe place.
And maybe, once upon a time, she would have been. Past Alara would have pulled Bree into a hug, told her everything was going to be okay, promised to do whatever she could to help. But she wasn't that person anymore. She couldn't be. Because every time she tried to help someone, every time she let herself care, it ended the same way. In fire and in blood. And the last thing she wanted was to be the reason Bree got killed. Still, when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, resigned. How can I help you, Bree? The girl blinked up at her, startled, as if she hadn't expected Alara to offer at all. For a long moment, she didn't say anything.
Then, hesitantly, like she wasn't sure if she even had the right to ask, she whispered.
Can you teach me how to survive? I'm not a vampire, Bree, Alara said flatly, shaking her head. I can't teach you that. Bree's lips parted slightly, like she wanted to argue, but she hesitated, unsure. Alara sighed, lifting her hands in front of her. The air shimmered for a moment before flames ignited at her fingertips, crackling softly in the night. Bree flinched hard, scrambling back a few inches on instinct, her red eyes going wide. Alara didn't move, just let the fire dance along her skin, illuminating the space between them with a warm, flickering glow. I had abilities you don't have, she said evenly, watching Bree's reaction. Our survival tactics are vastly different. Bree swallowed hard, eyes darting between Alara's hands and her face. You can just do that? Whenever you want. Alara flexed her fingers, letting the flames flicker and shift before extinguishing them with a slow blink. Yeah, she said simply. Bree still looked unnerved, like she was trying to make sense of everything she thought she knew. Alara studied her for a moment, then leaned forward, resting her arms on her knees. Look, kid. You want to survive. That's on you. I can't teach you how to be a vampire. But I can teach you how to think like a survivor. Bree blinked, frowning slightly. What's the difference? Alara tilted her head. One of them keeps you alive. The other gets you killed. And that's how Alara found herself flying behind Bree in the form of a bat, her wings slicing through the cool night air as she watched the newborn charge after a deer. Bree moved fast, too fast. Her steps were loud against the forest floor, crunching twigs and rustling leaves as she lunged forward, her breath sharp and uneven. Alara could already see where this was going. The deer stiffened, sensing the movement behind it, and started to bolt, but Bree was faster. With an awkward, uncoordinated leap, she tackled it to the ground, arms wrapping around its torso as she sank her teeth into its throat. The deer let out a pitiful cry before going still. Alara, still midair, gave a long, exasperated sigh before shifting back into her human form, landing on the forest floor with an effortless grace. Bree was hunched over the deer, her face twisted in mild disgust as she swallowed thickly. Alara crossed her arms, unimpressed. Bree, she said, voice flat. The girl barely looked up. Alara tilted her head. I told you, you need to be more silent. If the deer notices you, if it hears you, you've already given up your position. And if you pull something that's sloppy on a vampire. She let the words hang. Bree swallowed another mouthful and muttered, I got it, didn't I? Alara pinched the bridge of her nose. That's not the point, kid. This isn't about getting lucky. It's about not getting caught. Bree huffed, wiping her mouth with the back of her sleeve. Yeah, well. I wasn't exactly trained for stealth. Alara arched a brow. Clearly. Bree scowled but didn't argue. Alara crouched beside her, eyeing the deer before flicking her gaze back to Bree. Again. Slower this time. Stalk it, don't chase it. If it knows you're coming, you've already lost. Bree groaned, pushing herself to her feet. Fine. But if I have to eat another one of these, I'm gonna throw up. Alara smirked. Welcome to survival, kid. It sucks. She stretched lazily before tossing Bree a look over her shoulder.
Oh, and by the way, she said casually, the more you fail, the more deer you have to help me carry back.
Winter's coming and I could use a nice supply of meat. Bree froze mid-step, eyes widening. Wait, what? Alara grinned. You heard me. Bree groaned, dragging a hand down her face. You're kidding. Alara shrugged. Nope. You wanna be reckless? Fine. But every mistake comes with a price.
Bree looked down at the deer she had just killed, then back at Alara, horror dawning on her face.
You are actually making me do manual labor. Alara clapped her hands together. Yep. And you better start getting better at this real fast, or I'm gonna have enough venison to last me 3 winters. Bree groaned again, muttering under her breath as she yanked the deer onto her shoulders. Alara just chuckled, already shifting back into her bat form to scout ahead. If nothing else, at least this was entertaining. Another week went by. Alara and Bree had fallen into a nice little routine.
Wake up, hunt, practice survival skills, haul whatever they caught back to their hideout, and occasionally, argue over the best way to take down prey.
Bree still had a long way to go, but she was learning, adapting, surviving. And Alara had to admit. It was nice. Not just having someone else around, but having an extra pair of hands to do the heavy lifting. Bree wasn't nearly as strong as most vampires yet, but she was still way stronger than a human, and Alara had shamelessly taken advantage of it.
But as she lay on her makeshift bed, staring at the beams of her treehouse, something gnawed at her.
She was getting too close. Too comfortable. This wasn't supposed to happen.
She had spent years keeping to herself, cutting herself off from the world, ensuring that no one had the chance to drag her into their mess.
And now she had let a stray vampire weave her way into her life. And it needed to stop. She needed to cut ties. Fast. Because this wasn't going to end well. It never did. It never had. Everyone she had ever gotten close to had met an unfortunate end. And those who were still alive. She was dead to them. Alara closed her eyes, pressing the heels of her palms against them, trying to push the thoughts away. But the realization settled over her like a weight. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she would fix this. Tomorrow came. It was a dreary, overcast day, the kind where the sky felt heavy, pressing low against the earth. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and the distant promise of rain. As the sun rose, Alara's bats settled inside her treehouse, curling into the beams and shadows, their tiny bodies twitching as they adjusted into their rest. She reached out to the few within her grasp, running her fingers gently over their fur, pressing soft kisses to their little heads. They chittered in response, shifting but not stirring, and she let herself linger there for a moment longer than necessary. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and stepped out onto the veranda. It was one of Bree's projects, one she had convinced Alara to build so they had more space to move around outside without feeling so confined to the small platform she had hastily put together. Alara had let her do most of the work, half out of laziness and half out of curiosity to see if the kid could actually do it. She had.
And now, as Alara stood leaning against the railing, she caught sight of Bree below, standing stiffly near the base of the tree, shoulders rigid.
She was on edge. Uncomfortable. Alara narrowed her eyes. What's wrong? Bree didn't look up right away. Her gaze was locked on the forest beyond them, her fingers twitching at her sides. There's someone out there, she said. Alara stilled. The wind shifted. The world felt too quiet. Slowly she straightened, her muscles calling tight. You sure? Bree gave a jerky nod. I don't see them, but I can feel it. Alara's jaw clenched. She didn't doubt Bree's instincts.
The kid had learned a lot in the last week, how to move silently, how to hunt, how to pay attention to the things most people ignored.
And right now, Bree's instincts were screaming at her that something was very, very wrong. Alara inhaled slowly, stretching her senses outward. For a long moment there was nothing. Just the wind. Just the trees. Just the heavy, overcast sky. And then, a shift. A presence. Something lurking. Not approaching. Just watching. Alara's fingers twitched. So. The Volturi hadn't forgotten about her after all. Alara didn't waste time. Her body shrank and twisted, her limbs vanishing into a blur of dark wings as she shifted seamlessly into her bat form, letting the wind carry her down. She landed softly at the base of the tree, her small frame solidifying as she shifted back, standing beside Bree in an instant. The younger vampire barely flinched, she was getting used to it. Alara's gaze remained locked on the tree line, her senses sharpening. The presence was there. Not moving. Not revealing itself. Just watching. She exhaled slowly, crossing her arms. They're not coming closer, she murmured, half to herself. Bree shifted uncomfortably, her crimson eyes darting between the trees, fingers twitching at her sides. What do we do? Alara tilted her head slightly, considering. Whoever was out there wasn't making a move. Yet. They were waiting for something. For nightfall. For orders. For her to make the first move. Alara's lips curled into a slow, humorless smirk. Well, she said, just loud enough for the unseen presence to hear, we could sit here and pretend we don't notice them. Her eyes gleamed, something dark curling at the edges of her voice. She cracked her knuckles. We could go say hello. Alara didn't wait. She took off, her feet barely touching the earth before she launched herself into the forest, weaving between trees with effortless speed. The wind rushed past her, the dense undergrowth a blur as she followed the faint, lingering presence of whoever had been watching them. Behind her, Bree cursed under her breath but followed. Alara, this is a terrible idea. She hissed, dodging a low-hanging branch as she struggled to keep pace. What if it's them? What if they're trying to lure us out instead? Alara smirked but didn't slow down. Then we're making their job easier, aren't we? Bree groaned. Oh my god, I hate this. The feeling in the air shifted. Alara felt it, a flicker of movement just ahead. They were running. Whoever was out there, they weren't standing still anymore. Alara grinned, sharp and wild. They'd been made. And now, they were trying to get away. Gotcha, she muttered under her breath, pushing herself faster. Bree, still trailing behind, let out another strangled noise of frustration. I seriously hate this plan. But she kept running. Alara didn't hesitate. She lifted her hands and in an instant her bats erupted into existence. A flurry of dark wings and sharp, chittering cries burst into the air, spiraling forward through the trees like a living storm. They scattered, weaving through the branches, hunting, tracking. The unseen figure ahead was running. Not fast enough. Alara felt the familiar pull of her shift, her body shrinking and twisting, bones bending as she melted into her bat form. She launched into the air, following the swarm. Bree, now alone on foot, cursed again. I swear to God, Alara. But her words were lost to the wind. Alara shot forward, cutting through the air like a blade, her senses focused on the presence just ahead. The chase was on. The bats came from all directions. They flooded the trees, blotting out the light, their screeches filling the air like a deafening storm. Wings brushed against branches, sharp claws scraped against bark, their sheer numbers turning the forest into a living, moving Massachusetts of darkness. The presence ahead stumbled, their movements faltering as the bats swarmed. And then, they stopped. Alara caught up in an instant, shifting back into her human form as she parted the bats like the Red Sea, their bodies peeling away from the figure to make space for her. She sauntered forward, eyes locked on the stranger as the last of her swarm settled into the trees, leaving behind an eerie silence. And that's when she saw him. Standing perfectly still. Unbothered. Calm as can be. His gaze met hers, unreadable. Around his neck, a silver crest dangled, a symbol she recognized instantly. Volturi. Alara exhaled through her nose, tilting her head. Huh. Of course it was them. Her lips curled into something mocking, something sharp. You guys sure took your time. Alara crossed her arms, cocking her head slightly as she took another step forward, eyes locked onto the Volturi insignia hanging from his neck. Why are you running? She asked, voice laced with amusement. You were here for me, yes? The figure didn't react immediately. Didn't flinch. Didn't shift. Just stood there, hands at his sides, as if the sheer overwhelming Massachusetts of bats moments ago had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Alara studied him more closely now. Something about him itched at her memory, but she couldn't quite place it. The way he held himself calm, composed, standing like he knew he had the upper hand despite the fact that she had just cut him off. That confidence. That absolute lack of concern. It was too familiar. Still, she didn't recognize his face. At least not yet. She lifted her hand, letting flames curl around her fingers, casting flickering light onto his face. Now, are you going to answer me, or do I have to assume you were running because you didn't want to be caught? Finally, he moved. Not a flinch. Not a recoil. Just the slightest tilt of his head, his lips quirking in the faintest trace of amusement. And then he spoke. I wasn't running, he said smoothly, his voice deep, measured. I was leading you away. As the words left his lips, movement flickered in the shadows. Alara didn't even need to turn to know they were surrounded. A dozen more Volturi guards materialized from the darkness, stepping out from between the trees like they had always been there, waiting. Their crimson eyes gleamed in the dim light, their cloaks blending into the dreary forest like ink spilling into water. Bree pressed up against Alara's back, her fingers clenching into the fabric of her shirt in absolute terror. She was trembling, her instincts screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Alara just looked amused. She let out a slow, thoughtful hum, surveying the situation with a lazy smirk. Then, with a casual wave of her hand, her bats vanished into thin air, dissolving like smoke, leaving nothing but eerie silence in their wake. The Volturi didn't react. Didn't flinch. Of course not. They were used to her theatrics. Alara tilted her head, locking eyes with the figure again. So, she drawled, tapping a finger against her chin, I take it this means you've finally accepted my challenge. His lips quirked slightly. Oh, Alara, his voice was silk and steel, smooth but sharp beneath the surface, we accepted it the moment you issued it. Then, almost playfully, he added, and now, you're caught. Alara let out a low chuckle, tilting her head as she surveyed the dozen Volturi guards surrounding her. She scat, wagging a finger at him. Am I, though? She taunted, the smirk never leaving her lips. Caught? She took a slow step forward, challenging. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm looking quite free at the moment. She spread her arms out dramatically, motioning to herself, no restraints, no chains, nothing physically holding her back. You misunderstand, he said smoothly, tilting his head slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. A caught doesn't always mean trapped. It simply means we have you exactly where we want you. Oh, do you now? Alara mocked, her tone dripping with amusement. She folded her arms, cocking her head with a smirk. Please, do explain. The Volturi guards remained deathly still. Bree was practically shaking behind her, still clutching at Alara's shirt like a lifeline. Terrified. He exhaled softly, something almost resembling a laugh under his breath. Oh, Alara, he mused, stepping forward at a leisurely pace, his presence radiating control. Always so eager for answers. Always so sure of your position. He stopped just in front of her, his head tilting slightly, studying her like she was a puzzle he had already solved. But tell me, his voice was a silken thread, his red eyes gleaming with quiet confidence, if we weren't in control, why aren't you running? Alara knew his cockiness, knew he thought he had the upper hand. She let the silence stretch for a moment before letting out a mocking hum, tapping a finger against her chin. I merely wanted to see what was taking you guys so long, she said airily. So, quite the disappointment, really. She pretended to look around, hands on her hips, scanning the group before turning back to him with an exaggerated sigh. And I don't see Aro here. Her tone was bored, almost lazy. That is a bit of a problem, you see. He arched a brow, intrigued but unbothered. And how is that? Alara's smirk widened. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I did issue the challenge to Aro. Directly. The amusement in his expression didn't fade, but something shifted in his stance, subtle but telling. He knew what she was getting at. This wasn't about them. This was about Aro. And the fact that he wasn't here meant something. And who are you exactly? She asked, voice laced with casual boredom. The vampire before her inclined his head slightly, his smile polite but razor sharp. Demetri. Alara sucked in a breath, making a show of glancing around at the gathered Volturi guards, before clicking her tongue and shaking her head. Well, Demetri, seems like you were in a bit of a pickle here, she mused, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. She folded her arms, tilting her head at Demetri. See, Aro is supposed to catch me. Not you lot. Her smirk widened. Not that any of you have actually caught me yet. She gestured loosely to the space around her. Surrounding me doesn't count, I'm afraid. There was a flicker of something in Demetri's eyes, amusement, irritation, maybe a mix of both. But he didn't take the bait. Instead, he simply sighed, as if she were a particularly exhausting puzzle he had grown accustomed to dealing with. You do love technicalities, don't you? He murmured, tone edged with quiet amusement. Alara grinned. Oh, absolutely. Aro of all people should know that by now. Demetri's lips twitched. Indeed. The air hummed with tension, the Volturi guards standing still as statues, waiting, watching. Alara was enjoying every second of it. Demetri's gaze shifted, his attention drifting from Alara to the small vampire clinging to her side. And who is this? He asked, his voice smooth, calculated. Bree's grip on Alara's shirt tightened, her entire body going rigid as those sharp red eyes settled on her. Alara's playful demeanor vanished in an instant. Her smirk faded, her stance hardening as she subtly positioned herself between Bree and Demetri. She's none of your concern. Her voice wasn't taunting anymore. It wasn't teasing. It was serious. Final. Demetri noted the shift immediately. His head tilted slightly, watching her with newfound interest, his gaze flicking briefly to Bree before settling back on Alara. No. He mused. Then why do you look like you're about to bare your teeth at me? Alara didn't deny it. She just stood there, still, her expression unreadable, but her stance said everything. Bree was off limits. And Demetri? He absolutely noticed. Demetri held her gaze, unwavering, eyes sharp and assessing. The silence stretched between them, heavy, tense. Alara didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't let a single hint of weakness show. Bree clung to her tighter, but Alara didn't budge. She was a wall between them, an immovable force. Demetri's lips curled into something almost amused. Interesting. Alara's fingers twitched. Drop it. Before Dimitri could respond, a new voice cut through the air, soft, sweet, and laced with venom. But you see, stray newborns tend to attract unwanted attention. Alara clicked her tongue, tilting her head just slightly. Oh, great. The demon child is back. Her eyes flickered to Bree, who shrank back, pressing herself into Alara's side. Alara shifted forward, barely perceptible, just enough to make it clear this wasn't a discussion. And what makes you think she's a newborn? Jane's lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. Well, for one, she said, voice deceptively sweet, she's clinging to you, a human, like a lifeline.
Her gaze flickered toward Bree, calm and calculating, drinking in every detail. The way the girl pressed herself into Alara's side, fingers curled into her shirt like letting go would send her tumbling into something far worse.
Alara scoffed. Or maybe she just has good taste. A quiet, breathy laugh escaped Jane, her amusement razor sharp. Oh, we both know it's more than that. Alara didn't deny it. She's mine, she said, voice low, sharp. Dimitri arched a brow. Is that so? The other Volturi guards didn't move, but their interest sharpened. Alara could feel the weight of their attention settling on her, on Bree, on the boldness of her claim. She didn't care. She wouldn't let them take Bree. She's broken no laws, Alara continued, voice steady and yielding. Jane's smirk didn't waver, but there was something sharper in her gaze now, something pressing. Is it a mere coincidence, she mused, tilting her head slightly, that you took down a newborn army mere weeks ago and now this stray newborn shows up on your doorstep? Alara exhaled through her nose, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. Yes, actually, she said dryly. But by all means, keep reaching. Jane hummed, expression unreadable. Curious, she murmured, tapping a single finger against her chin. Because we've been hunting down the stragglers of that little army of yours. Cleaning up your mess, so to speak. Alara's eyes narrowed. Jane smiled. And imagine my surprise when I find one hiding in plain sight. Alara's eyes darkened, her stance unwavering. I don't have to prove anything to you, Jane. Jane's smirk twitched, the amusement in her gaze thinning. Oh, but you do, she murmured, tilting her head. Unless, of course, you'd rather I take the matter into my own hands. Bree pressed further into Alara's side, barely breathing. Alara let out a slow breath, clicking her tongue. You could try, she said, voice dripping with boredom. But we both know how that would end. Alara's hands ignited, flames licking up her fingers like they belonged there. The fire cast flickering shadows across her face, making the dark glint in her eyes all the more menacing. Dimitri sighed. Now, he mused, stepping forward ever so slightly. Let's not be hasty, ladies. I'd hate to see things get out of hand. His gaze flickered to Bree. Alara knew what they wanted. What they assumed. That Bree was part of Victoria's army. That she had fought with them. And that meant one thing. Jane had come to eliminate her. You won't be the first child I've killed, Jane. Her voice was steady and shaken, but there was something deeper beneath it, something raw. She wasn't lying. She had killed children before, completely by accident, but that didn't matter now. The memories clawed at the back of her mind, but she shoved them down, buried them beneath the weight of the moment. She had to stand strong in the face of the Volturi. She had to prove she wasn't to be trifled with, even if it meant making light of a past that haunted her. Jane's smirk faltered just for a fraction of a second. And that was enough. Alex stepped forward, his expression far more measured than his sister's. Now, Jane, he murmured, his voice like silk, a stark contrast to the crackling flames in Alara's hands. Let's not let this get out of hand lest we upset Master Aro. His gaze flickered to Alara, taking in the fire, the tension in her stance, the way Bree clung to her side. Unlike Jane, Alec wasn't baiting her, he was assessing, calculating. Alara let out a mock gasp, pressing a hand to her chest as if scandalized. Oh, I would hate to upset Master Aro, she drawled, stretching out his name with dramatic flair. Truly it would ruin my entire day. Alec's lips twitched, amused despite himself. Jane, however, looked 1 second away from setting something or someone on fire with her glare alone. You were insufferable, Jane seethed. Alara grinned. And yet here you were. Suffering. She whittled her flaming fingers for emphasis before casually extinguishing them with a flick of her wrist. Shame, really? Bree, still clinging to her side, made a tiny sound somewhere between terror and admiration. Alex sighed. Perhaps we can all agree that incinerating each other in the middle of the forest isn't the most productive way to spend the evening. I don't know, Alec. Sounds pretty productive to me. Alara hummed, tapping a finger against her chin. Jane's glare could have set a lesser creature aflame. Unfortunately for her, Alara had already mastered actual fire. You're testing my patience, Jane hissed. Alara gasped again, pressing a dramatic hand to her heart. Not your patience, oh no. Anything but that. She leaned in slightly, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You do realize that's not really a threat, right? It's like saying water is wet. Jane's expression twisted, but before she could speak, Alex sighed, stepping in again like the long-suffering sibling he clearly was.
As much as I love witnessing these little exchanges, he said, smooth and measured, perhaps we can redirect our focus.
The newborn. He gestured lightly toward Bree, who was still half hiding behind Alara, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Alara clicked her tongue, tilting her head. Oh, right, her. Almost forgot with all the tea tricks. She patted Bree's shoulder lightly. What do you think, kid? Wanna throw hands with the Volturi or maybe, I don't know, not die today. Not die. Bree squeaked. Alara beamed. Excellent choice. Look at you, making great life decisions. She turned back to Jane and Alec. And that settles it. I'm keeping her. Jane scowled. That's not how this works. Alara crossed her arms. Says who?
Jane opened her mouth, probably to remind her exactly who, but Alara cut her off with a breezy, oh, right, the scary vampire government.
She snapped her fingers. Well, since I don't recognize your authority, I guess that's a you problem. Jane looked 1 second away from actually trying to kill Alara. Master Ara will hear of this, Jane bit out, voice full of venom. Alara's smirk widened. Great. Tell him I said hi. Oh, and make sure to really drag out my name when you do it. He'll love that. Jane's smile was all sharp edges, her red eyes gleaming with cold amusement. You might not recognize our authority, she said smoothly, but you're a part of our world now. So it is in your best interest to follow our laws, including handing over the newborn for trial purposes. She is under our jurisdiction. Alara's smirk didn't falter. If anything, it grew. Trial purposes, huh? Wow, you almost made that sound convincing. She tapped her chin, pretending to mull it over before snapping her fingers. Oh wait, no, you didn't. Because we both know how that ends. Bree stiffened beside her, pressing in tighter, but Alara didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give an inch. Jane's expression darkened. It is the law. Alara huffed. You know what else is the law? Speed limits. And guess what? People break those all the time. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to something conspiratorial. And get this, not everyone gets caught. Alec let out a quiet laugh. Jane shot him a glare and he lifted his hands in false surrender. Alara, Jane ground out, voice laced with warning. Jane, Alara mimicked, perfectly matching her tone. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension stretched, thick and coiling, an invisible line drawn between them. Then Alara sighed, rolling her shoulders. Look, I get it. You have a job to do. Scary vampire government, laws, punishments, blah blah blah. But here's the thing, Bree isn't part of that army. She's just a scared kid who ran. Jane's expression didn't change. Then prove it. Alara barked out a laugh. Oh, there it is. The classic Volturi move, prove it or die. So predictable. She shook her head, feigning disappointment. You guys really need new material. Jane's expression remained cold, unwavering. We will take her by force if we have to. As the words left her lips, the vampires around her tensed, their movements sharp, precise, synchronized like a well-trained pack of wolves. A single step forward, deliberate and threatening. Alara let out a low whistle, unimpressed. Oh no, she deadpanned, placing a hand over her heart. A bunch of scary vampires stepping toward me all menacingly. Whatever will I do? Bree stiffened against her side, but Alara didn't move, didn't even blink. Instead, she let her smirk widen, eyes flicking between Jane and the guards. You know, she mused, cracking her knuckles lazily, for a group that prides itself on being all-knowing, you guys really need to start thinking things through. Jane's gaze sharpened. And what, exactly, does that mean? Alara tilted her head, pretending to think. Well, if you were smart, you'd realize that I don't respond well to threats. If you were smarter, you'd remember that I don't play by your rules. And she lifted a hand, flames sparking to life at her fingertips, casting eerie shadows against her smirk. If you were the smartest of all, you'd know that trying to take something from me never ends well. The fire flickered, the heat pressing against the already tense air. The guards hesitated. Alara's smirk widened. What's wrong? I thought we were stepping forward dramatically. Do keep up. Demetri stepped up to Jane, leaning in close to whisper something in her ear.
His voice was too low for Alara to catch, but the shift in Jane's expression was telling, her lips pressed into a thin line, her annoyance simmering just beneath the surface.
Alara narrowed her eyes, then turned her head slightly, whispering down to Bree. What is he saying? Bree swallowed hard, glancing between the gathered vampires. She hesitated just a second too long, long enough for Demetri and Jane to notice. Their eyes flicked toward her, but before they could say anything, Demetri stepped back from the group, expression carefully neutral. Bree took a shaky breath and finally found her voice. He said. She licked her lips, nerves clear in her tone. He's going to call Aro. And to keep things civil. And how important you are to the masters. Alara blinked. Then, slowly, a grin stretched across her face. Oh, she breathed, dragging out the sound like she'd just heard the most delicious piece of gossip. I'm important, huh? She clapped her hands together, the last remnants of fire flickering out at the motion. Well, would you look at that? Seems like you can surprise me after all. She turned her attention back to Jane, smirk as sharp as a blade. Guess that means you don't get to take the kid by force. Bummer, really. I was looking forward to seeing how that played out for you. Jane's nostrils flared, but she didn't lash out. Couldn't, really, not with Demetri's warning hanging over her head like a guillotine. Alara rocked back on her heels, arms crossed. So. What now? We all stand here awkwardly and wait for Daddy Aro to weigh in. Right on cue, Demetri returned within a minute, phone in hand, his expression unreadable. Aro is on the line, he announced smoothly. He wishes to speak with you. Alara blinked, then snorted. Oh wow. Personal call from the big boss himself. I am special. She took a dramatic breath. All right, hand it over. Demetri didn't move, simply holding the phone out expectantly. Alara raised an eyebrow. Oh, you're on speaker? Cute. Should I say ciao first, or is he already listening? A soft, airy chuckle floated through the phone. Ah, tesoro, Aro's voice came, smooth and indulgent. Of course I am listening. Alara grinned, unbothered. Figures. How do you feel knowing Jane was about to make a very dumb decision? A pause. Then another soft laugh. Now, Aro mused. Let's not be too harsh on dear Jane. She is simply carrying out her duties. Alara glanced at Jane, whose expression remained rigid, though her eyes burned with quiet fury. Sure, Alara said, dragging out the word. And I'm sure you're just dying to hear my side of things. Naturally, Aro responded, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. So, tell me, cara mia, what exactly is going on? Alara smirked, rocking back on her heels again. Oh, you know. The usual. You send your murdered toddlers to play police, they try to strong-arm me, I call their bluff, Demetri remembers I have plot armor, same old, same old. Aro chuckled again, the sound amused but patient. Ah, how delightful you are. A brief pause, then his tone light yet pointed. Now, tell me about this newborn. Alara's smirk didn't waver. She is none of your concern, Aro. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Even the guards around her seemed to stiffen, as if waiting for the inevitable weight of Aro's displeasure. Then, a soft hum crackled through the speaker. Oh, tesoro, Aro mused, voice still as smooth as silk, but there was something in it now, something sharp. You wound me again. Alara rolled her eyes. Yeah, I'm just breaking your heart left and right today. Jane's glare could have burned a hole through her skull. Demetri simply watched. Surely, Aro continued, unbothered, you of all people understand that all creatures of our world are of some concern to me. Alara let out an exaggerated sigh. Look, Aro, I get it. You like to have your fingers in everyone's business. But Bree? She's just a kid who ran from a fight. Not a threat, not a soldier, and definitely not your problem. Another pause. Then, Alara narrowed her eyes. She knew that sound. That was the sound of Aro thinking, calculating, rearranging the pieces on whatever mental chessboard he was playing. And yet Aro finally said, voice lighter, your insistence on protecting her makes me wonder. Alara's smirk faded, her expression sharpening into something unreadable. This game isn't about her, she said, voice low, steady, deadly serious. It's about me. She didn't waver, didn't blink, the weight of her words settling like a heavy stone between them. If you want this game to continue, you'll leave her out of this. A pause, deliberate. Calculated. She isn't the key to my cooperation. She let that sink in, let the silence stretch, thick with meaning. Let Aro think, let him turn it over in that mind of his, piece by piece. Then softer. Sharper. A promise. But interfering with her will be the key to your downfall. Her eyes gleamed as she smiled, slow and knowing. Choose wisely. For the first time in the conversation, there was silence. Not the usual, easy kind that stretched in Aro's favor, the one where he let his amusement linger, let the weight of his perceived authority settle over those around him. No. This silence belonged to her. Alara didn't need to see Aro's expression to know she had his attention. That single moment of quiet, the slight pause on the other end of the line, it was telling. Aro hummed, the sound light but considering. And what, pray tell, are your plans with the newborn? Alara exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders. And that's when she made her decision. One she had considered before but never fully committed to. She lifted her chin, meeting Dimitri's gaze first, then Jane's, before finally looking back at the phone in Dimitri's hand. I'm taking her to the Cullens, she said. The silence that followed was palpable. Even the wind seemed to die down, as if the entire world had paused to process her words. Then, a soft, indulgent chuckle crackled through the speaker. "Oh, how fascinating," Ara murmured. "And here I thought you had no interest in their way of life." Alara shrugged. "I don't. But lucky for me, this isn't about me." She tilted her head, eyes glinting. "And it's definitely not about you." Name, Ara mused. "An interesting move. But tell me, Tesoro, do you believe they will take her in?" Alara smirked. "I dunno, Aro. You tell me. Didn't you just say you enjoy watching things unfold?" Aro laughed, rich and knowing. "So I did." Jane, however, did not look amused. "The Cullens," she bit out, as if the name itself offended her. "You wouldn't trust a newborn to them?" Alara stretched, cracking her neck with an exaggerated sigh. "Listen, Jane, I could sit here and debate vampire morality with you, but frankly, I have better things to do. Like literally anything else." She patted Bree on the shoulder. "So if you're done throwing your little tantrum, I think we'll be on our way." Jane's eyes blazed. Alex sighed. "Very well," Aro finally said, still as smooth and unbothered as ever. "I shall not interfere for now. But do keep in mind, my dear, I always collect what is owed to me." Alara tilted her head, tapping her chin. Let me think. Is it my eternal gratitude?" No, that can't be it, you'd already have that if you weren't so insufferably nosy." She snapped her fingers. "Oh. I know. You want my autograph?" Alex stifled a laugh. Jane did not. Aro's voice remained patient, though there was an unmistakable undertone of amusement. "Your allegiance, Tesoro. Your cooperation. Those are things I am quite fond of." But yes," Alara mused, tapping her chin as if lost in deep, serious contemplation. "You won't even get close to my cooperation until you win the game." A pause. Then she gasped, eyes widening in mock realization. "Oh, wait. That means you could be at this forever. My bad. I should have put a time limit on it." She sighed, shaking her head dramatically. "I really can't let you try and fail for the rest of my life. That'd just be cruel." The line was silent for half a beat before Aro chuckled, soft and indulgent. "Oh, my dear, you do amuse me." Alara smirked. "Glad someone's entertained. But tell me," Aro continued smoothly, "if you truly believe we stand no chance, why prolong the game at all?" Alara hummed, tilting her head. "Because it's fun." Jane bristled. Alec exhaled a quiet laugh. Dimitri just raised an eyebrow, watching her like she was the most perplexing puzzle he'd ever encountered. "Amusing," Aro murmured. "But remember, Tesoro games have a way of shifting when you least expect it." Alara waggled a finger at the phone. No foreshadowing allowed unless you actually do something about it. Otherwise, you just sound like a knockoff fortune teller." Another chuckle, slow and knowing. "Then I shall bid you farewell for now." Finally, Alara muttered. "This has been the longest phone call of my life. Until next time, Alara." The line clicked dead. "Well, that was fun. Let's do it again sometime." She turned to Jane, who was fuming. "Looks like Daddy Aro chose wisely," Alara drawled, placing a hand on Bree's shoulder with exaggerated nonchalance. "Which means you get to go home empty-handed. Again. Rough day for you, huh?" Jane's fists clenched, but she said nothing. Not with Dimitri still watching, not with Aro's decision looming over her like a command carved in stone. Jane's glare could have stripped paint from walls. "You are insufferable." "And yet," Alara beamed, spinning on her heel, "you keep coming back for more, demon child." She turned to Bree. "All right, kid. Time to go meet the Cullens. Try not to spontaneously combust from all the goodness in that house." Bree swallowed. "Are they really that nice?" Alara snorted. "Nice? Apparently they're so nice it's a little unsettling. They've weaponized nice. You'll see." And with that, she walked off, Bree trailing behind her, leaving the Volturi's finest standing in the forest, watching her go. Jane, predictably, looked furious. Alex sighed. "I do enjoy her." And did.